Daichi, Asakura stroked the head of his cat. Nike, in a quiet room. He muttered that his life had been completely pointless up to that point. He remembered a future that once looked bright, before everything changed. His hand sparked with the light of his newfound trade skill. A monstrous claw tore through the air toward him. Daichi shielded Nike in his arms, screaming as the different world revealed its danger. A massive tiger lunged with bared fangs. Daichi's eyes burned with resolve as he vowed to reach the top of this new world. Elsewhere, a group of travelers moved through the forest by wagon, escorted by armored riders, unaware of what was unfolding nearby. A young woman with pale hair paused, sensing something strange. Behind her, another woman called out, addressing her as Miss Karina. Back before any of this began, Daichi lay in his apartment, grieving the grandfather who had raised him after his parents' deaths. He thought he would be alone for the rest of his life. 10 days passed in a haze after the funeral. Daichi stared blankly at his phone, hollowed out by the loss. A notification appeared on his screen from a company called Kawakado. It was a rejection letter from the job he had hoped to land. Doubt piled onto doubt in his mind. He questioned every decision he had made, wondering if he had set his expectations too high, if he should give up his scholarship, if his grandfather would still be proud of him. Nike jumped onto his chest and meowed, pulling him back from his spiraling thoughts. Daichi decided there was no point staying depressed and resolved to continue job hunting after lunch. Then he noticed something tucked beside him on the bed, a small wooden box he hadn't seen before. Inside were a few old, worn rings. Curious, he slipped one onto his finger. It fit perfectly. Nike suddenly snatched at his hand, trying to bite the ring off, startling Daichi as he pulled his hand back. A bright flash surrounded him. When it faded, he found himself standing in an open field with mountains in the distance. Nike still in his arms. Confused, he wondered if he was dreaming. The unfamiliar landscape stretched before him. He asked aloud where he was and why he had ended up there. He recalled that barely any time had passed since he was lying on his bed. Something about touching the ring must have triggered this. Panicked, he searched himself in the ground, wondering if the ring had simply fallen off. He realized it shouldn't have slipped off that easily. The ring's disappearance and his sudden transportation had to be connected somehow. Looking around at the strange world, Daichi felt a chill run through him. He wondered if this was like something out of a manga or anime, and realized, with rising unease, that he had truly been pulled into another world. Daichi felt the ground beneath his bare feet and touched his own chest. Still trying to process what had just happened. His heart pounded as the reality of the situation sank in. Desperate for an advantage, he shouted for his status to open, praying that being pulled into another world had at least granted him a cheat skill. Sitting alone on the grass, he wondered what he was supposed to do next. Nike bounced around nearby, seemingly enjoying herself despite the chaos. He turned to Nike and asked if she had somehow received the cheat skill meant for him. To his shock, Nike leapt through the air with unnatural ease, flying briefly before landing. Defeated, Daichi lay back in the grass and admitted he no longer had a reason to live, insisting there was nothing left for him to do. Then a thought struck him. If Nike had a cheat skill, there might still be hope. He decided the next step was to understand exactly how her power worked. Pulling up his own status board, he saw his name, Daichi Asakura. With no magic listed, only 2 special skills, Trader and Appraisal. He stared at the words, certain there had to be some mistake. Slowly, it registered that being able to see people's status was itself considered a classic cheat skill. He hadn't even realized what Trader meant. But there it was, his own status board, plain and undeniable. He did in fact have a cheat skill. Turning his attention to Nike, he opened her status as well. Her board listed her as Nike Asakura, with no specific attribute magic, but spirit magic across earth, fire, water, and wind. Realizing they both possessed extraordinary abilities, Daichi decided their first move would be to test their skills directly. He walked toward a dense forest, the trees towering above him. Reaching out, he used Appraisal on one, and information about the tree's age and properties appeared before his eyes. He examined the readout carefully, muttering to himself that this was exactly as he expected. Curious how far the trader skill extended, he touched the tree directly, and strange data flickered across his vision as something began to happen. Startled, he yelped as the tree suddenly vanished, absorbed by his skill. Nike jumped back in surprise, meowing in alarm, while Daichi apologized to her for the sudden commotion. He explained that this had to be the trader skill actually starting to reveal itself, and decided to test it further by trading the tree he had just stored for points. The tree disappeared from his inventory, converting into 50,000 points, exactly as he had hoped it might. Encouraged, He browsed what could be exchanged and spotted a pair of shoes available for 30,200 points. He selected them, and the trade went through successfully, the shoes materializing in his hands. Gripping the shoes tightly, Daichi realized just how incredible this ability truly was. A wide grin spread across his face as he thought that his future had suddenly turned bright again. Lightning crackled through the forest as Daichi trained his newfound trading skill, testing what he could pull and store from the world around him. His status board filled with icons as he absorbed more items. A tree and a boulder vanished nearby, swallowed instantly by his ability. He inspected the random assortment he'd gathered, realizing he still had plenty of storage capacity left. When Nike hissed to warn him, he waved it off, saying he was just hungry and would find some food. A dark shape burst from the trees, sending Nike leaping back in alarm. A massive black tiger emerged, larger and more menacing than anything Daichi had imagined possible. He stared in disbelief, thinking that this beast made even a bear look harmless by comparison. Falling backward in shock, Daichi opened his status again. Admitting he still didn't fully understand his powers, he realized his appraisal only worked on plants, since he'd failed to analyze the bugs on the tree earlier. Panic set in as he wondered whether he should try to scare the tiger off or whether he had anything on him capable of fighting it at all. Forcing himself to calm down, he told himself he still had a chance. If he was going to fight, he needed a real plan, one that would end things before the tiger could counterattack. He recalled what he'd confirmed about the trader's skill, that he could summon a stored item anywhere within a 100-meter radius, regardless of its weight or size. As the tiger charged, Daichi decided to use the ground itself as a weapon, aiming to catch it off guard. He assured himself it would work, dropping something from his inventory directly in the tiger's path. Liquid nitrogen burst out, encasing the beast completely. He declared at the end, watching as the frozen container sealed the tiger's fate. The forest shook as the trap took hold, and Daichi asked himself if it had actually worked. Catching his breath, he asked Nike how she thought his plan had gone. She seemed to agree that it had been a good one. But then, through the trees, another shape emerged, snarling. Daichi's face fell as he realized in disbelief that there was yet another tiger. He scrambled, shouting that he needed a weapon he could actually fight with. The new tiger lunged, and Daichi barely dodged as Nike hissed fiercely beside him. Something wet dripped down as the tiger crashed nearby. Daichi wondered aloud whether the water was somehow Nike's magic at work. The tiger regrouped and prepared to strike again, refusing to back down. Thinking fast, Daichi called out that anything would do, anything that could become a wall between them. He braced himself, insisting there was nowhere left to run, and that he would end this fight right here. He declared this his last chance, watching the tiger's massive jaws snap toward him. Steadying himself, he asked if he was actually staying calm, noticing that the tiger's movements seemed to be slowing. With everything he had, Daichi struck, his fist connecting as the beast let out a final roar. The tiger collapsed onto the grass, just in case. Daichi stored its body away as well, breathing hard as he confirmed to himself that he had actually won this time. Exhausted, he admitted for now that he was starving. Standing beneath the open sky, he decided it was time to find something to eat. From his inventory, he pulled out weapons, food, drinks, and other supplies he'd gathered, along with items meant to destroy any evidence of what had happened. He opened a device labeled Z-Force and called Nike over, asking her to use fast contact. On its screen, a convoy of horses and a wagon appeared, moving steadily across the land. He murmured that the trade skill really was too good, watching a drone hover above the scene. Following the signal, Daichi approached the travelers making their way through the hills. He greeted them cheerfully, waving as one of the riders turned in surprise at his sudden appearance. Holding Nike up, he explained that this was his cat and that it was just the two of them together. One of the riders asked if he was traveling alone. Daichi asked if cats were rare in this world. He introduced himself as Asakura Daichi, with his companion Nike. The rider replied that cats were common, but ones with fur as long as Nike's were unusual. The woman introduced herself as Alicia Hartland. Daichi, caught off guard by her cheerful energy, quietly admitted to himself that she reminded him of his high school days. The second woman, sterner than Alicia, apologized for her companion's carelessness and asked again whether Daichi was traveling with just his cat. He confirmed they had simply been wandering around. She noted that he seemed to be carrying quite a lot of equipment for an explorer, listing off the various items strapped to him. He pulled out a small glowing device, showing it to them. Alicia remarked that she couldn't sense any magic coming from it, despite it clearly being some kind of magical item. The sterner woman admitted she had wondered whether such devices existed, calling it unlike anything she'd seen. Daichi offered to let them try it if they wanted, Feigning nervousness, Daichi asked if he could travel with them until the next city, offering to guard their carriage in exchange. Alicia insisted he seemed trustworthy and saw no reason to turn him away. The sterner woman remained wary, noting that his hands showed he'd clearly never used a knife or an axe. She offered to lend him her own weapons since he barely used his. Daichi laughed nervously, wondering if he had been found out. Alicia, delighted, declared she would persuade the chairman to allow him to join them. Alicia said she looked forward to traveling with him. Karina explained that carrying no weapons into the forest alone would have been reckless unless he was a magician, prompting Daichi to ask if that was what she suspected. Karina confirmed she couldn't let a magician near the carriage unsupervised, and insisted he stay within 1 meter of her at all times as she guided him to the chairman's house. She noticed he had shifted his tone, remarking that he seemed to know how to handle a blade. Daichi agreed to keep the distance and shifted back to his usual casual way of speaking, reasoning that since they were close in age it should be fine. Karina asked plainly if he really looked that suspicious. He admitted he did, very much so. So she told him to speak however he liked as long as he avoided anything that looked threatening. They approached the wagon and its escorts. Daichi looked around at the group, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. A stern older man asked if he was the one requesting to travel with them until the next town. The man introduced himself as Karaus Beltaram, CEO of Beltaram Company, and the one responsible for the carriage's safety. Daichi introduced himself in turn as Daichi Asakura. Karaus asked what Daichi could offer in return for the favor. Daichi admitted he had no idea how influential Beltaram Company truly was, then held out a small pouch, offering to sell its contents for whatever price the man saw fit. Karasa's eyes widened at what he found inside, examining it carefully. He asked whether Daichi simply didn't know its worth, or whether he was being unusually generous. Daichi replied it was the former, and Karas murmured that he understood. Daichi explained that where he came from, such things lost value quickly since they were common, and their worth shifted over time and place. Karas agreed, noting he'd been taught something similar by his own grandfather. And things seemed to be going well so far. Karas lifted the pepper Daichi had given him, remarking that it held real value, and was likely worth many times more than it would sell for back in Daichi's homeland. He explained that no country on the continent could produce pepper themselves, forcing them to rely on imports from distant lands, which meant only royalty and the upper class could typically afford it. Daichi realized with a jolt that they had figured out he wasn't from around here. Karaus pointed out that he would need a permit to legally sell pepper in this country, confirming his suspicion. Karaus admitted he had first thought Daichi might be some kind of suspicious character, but was surprised to learn he had actually come from a different continent entirely, saying it would cause unnecessary trouble if word got out. Daichi asked him to keep his origins a secret. He thanked Karaus for his understanding. When asked if he wanted something other than payment, Daichi asked him to wait while he prepared to discuss the pepper's price. Daichi explained that since he planned to settle in this world, he needed information, and asked if Karaus could help him become a merchant here. Karaus grumbled that Daichi was asking a lot of him, though Alicia teased that he seemed like the type who liked helping people. Daichi asked how much more pepper Karaus would need in exchange for his help. Karaus called it fair play as several sacks were produced. Daichi grinned, impressed, saying he wanted a man like that as an ally. Daichi looked forward to traveling with his 2 new companions, his voice full of genuine excitement as the group prepared to set out together. The girl beside him returned the sentiment warmly, saying she too looked forward to the journey ahead. Another companion echoed the same words, addressing him formally as Mr. Ascara. The conversation shifted toward their destination. They were heading to meet Karina's boss, where his identity would be properly explained. One of them asked simply where they were going. Daichi cut in before things got too formal. He told them to just call him Daichi, admitting he wasn't fond of stiff polite titles between people traveling together. Attention turned to the small creature in his arms. The girl marveled at how fluffy it was. Daichi introduced the creature as his companion, Nike, and she reached out eagerly to hold him. She recoiled for a second, startled by just how cute the creature was. Hands pulling back on reflex. Daichi offered to let her hold him properly instead. Cradling Nike close, she cooed over him, telling him how adorable he was while he responded with a soft, contented sound. Introductions continued. She gave her own name while still holding the creature, and Daichi confirmed once more that the one she was holding was Nike. He watched her with a satisfied grin as she sat absorbed in the moment, cradling the small companion against her chest. Daichi asked, half teasing, whether she really intended to walk all the way to the boss house while carrying the cat the entire time. She turned away sharply in response. She tried to answer him, but her words came out muffled and unclear, something in her mouth getting in the way. Daichi admitted he couldn't make out what she'd said. She corrected herself, calling him properly by name this time. The two exchanged a tired glance, worn down by the exchange, while Nike let out a sharp, startled reaction of his own beside them. Elsewhere, within a camp lined with tents and firelight, an older man posed a question to his companion, asking what he thought of the young stranger among them. The response came thoughtfully. He guessed the boy had been raised by a wealthy family with a proper education, noting he carried himself like someone with no blood on his hands. Despite coming from a different continent, he spoke their language with surprising fluency, quick-witted and well-mannered. Another voice speculated further, suggesting he was certainly the son of a wealthy household, though possibly an ignorant one, surprised that such a person would hand over an item so casually, out of simple courtesy. They turned their focus to the quality of what he'd given them, remarking that its excellent condition meant it had almost certainly been kept inside an item's subspace. The future, one of them mused, remained impossible to predict. The nature of this rare skill was considered next, one said to be granted by the gods themselves. Only its owner could enter or exit the subspace, its capacity tied to one's magic power, and time did not pass within it at all. A different kind of storage was noted as well, magic bags that could hold more than their size allowed once enchanted, though inside them, time continued to pass normally. Suspicion lingered. They agreed they should check the true value of what was inside his bag. Still, one voice pushed back against going too far, insisting there was no need for that. They agreed instead that he should be treated with proper respect, certain he carried items unlike anything they'd seen before. The order was given clearly, that word be passed to everyone within their company, warning them that Daichi must not be disrespected under any circumstance. The camp stirred quietly as Daichi Asakura prepared for another day among the caravan, guards and helpers gathering around the tents under the morning sky. Examining a piece of glassware, he noted its craftsmanship. This world's glass matched medieval quality on Earth, a small but telling sign of how far this civilization had come. Nearby, Khalid called out to Karina, asking her to light a fire. Karina apologized, explaining she was busy guiding a client at the moment and couldn't help right away. Asakura offered to watch instead. Khalid asked if he'd mind seeing how Karina lit fires, curious why she needed Karina specifically, rather than doing it herself with magic. Karina approached and reminded Khalid that starting a fire with only a rock was difficult. With a wave of her hand, flame burst to life instantly. Asakura asked if she always helped light fires this way. Khalid confirmed it, marveling that using magic so casually in daily life still amazed her, alongside Karina's usual battle magic. Karina explained that even without fire magic, people with other attributes could use magic tools to start a flame. She added that regardless of attribute, anyone with magic could operate magic devices, but those with magic were almost always favored for jobs over those without. A rock and a piece of flint lay on the ground, plain tools for people who had no magic at all, forced to rely on manual labor to get by. Asakura's mind drifted to his old world. A rejection notice glowed on his phone. His grandfather's photo sat nearby. Karina's voice broke through his thoughts, calling him Mr. Asakura. He recalled how back home, a person's entire future had been shaped by exams and circumstance rather than fairness. Khalid noticed his expression shift and grew concerned, while Asakura caught himself, embarrassed at having drifted so openly into memory in front of her. Khalid reassured him it was fine, that thinking that way was normal. Asakura apologized quietly, walking beside her as they continued through the camp. Khalid continued, saying, kind people could still find good work without magic, but admitted only the fortunate ones actually did. Asakura realized his earlier idea to simply climb society using his cheat skill had been shallow. He wanted instead to use his strength to help others directly. A quiet resolve formed in him. He decided he would change the very structure of this country, finding the idea both reckless and exciting at once. He planned to bring tools from his original world, sneakers, flashlights, drones, teaching people how to use them, so even those without magic could thrive and become customers too. Karina and Khalid watched as he pulled out a small object. Khalid asked if it was clear and transparent like a jewel. Unaware it wasn't a magic device at all, Asakura told her to try it, calling it a lighter. Khalid hesitated, insisting she couldn't handle something that looked so expensive and refined. He assured her it wasn't costly and could be used many times over. Khalid's eyes lit up, delighted, as the small flame sparked to life in her hand. The fire crackled as Khalid knelt by the pot, tending it carefully. Karina approached, holding out fresh herbs, the dry snap of twigs mixing with the low murmur of the camp. Karina examined the lighter closely, turning it over in her hands. She remarked that the country Asakura came from must be truly incredible to produce something so refined. Colette added that he planned to spread devices like this across the country, tools anyone could use without needing magic. Karina smiled, certain he would succeed with such an item on his side. Asakura told her the lighter was hers to keep, payment for interrupting her while she worked. Karina thanked him, surprised by the gesture. As they turned to leave, Colette stopped them, insisting the item was too expensive to accept. Asakura brushed it off, saying it wasn't worth as much as she thought. A voice called out behind them. Karina turned first, asking what he was doing there. Her tone edged with wariness. A towering guard explained they had come to meet the boss. Introductions followed. He was Jeffrey, head of bodyguards, and Sakura was named as Veltorum's supplier. Jeffrey stated plainly he was responsible for Veltorum's safety. Asakura mentioned he was simply being escorted to the next town, keeping his tone light. Jeffrey explained Alicia and the others had asked him to escort them personally, expecting someone would come to check in. Asakura muttered under his breath that he'd hoped that wouldn't happen. Later, alone with her thoughts, Colette sat quietly by an empty bowl, the spoon resting beside it, her mind clearly elsewhere. Night settled over the camp. Inside his tent, Asakura lay back on his sleeping mat staring at the ceiling, surrounded by scattered gear and quiet. Dark Colette's voice broke the stillness, asking if he was awake. She admitted she might have given him too much, still fixated on how the lighter resembled a jewel more than fire itself. Checking his watch, Asakura apologized for the late hour, saying the boss wanted to speak with him. Colette answered simply that she was awake. He wondered aloud if something was wrong with the pepper's quality, bracing himself as he stepped toward the largest tent, the atmosphere around him tense. Stepping inside, he announced himself before Veltorum gestured for him to sit. Karina waited just outside, watching the tent flap sway shut behind him. Asakura asked directly if there was an issue with the pepper, offering to provide more if needed. Veltorum apologized for calling him in so late, waving off the concern. Veltorum admitted he wanted to discuss something else entirely, prompting Asakura to ask bluntly why he'd really been summoned. Veltorum assured him the pepper's quality was in fact excellent. He clarified they hadn't taken anything from Colette. Asakura confirmed it was the same lighter he'd given her as a small gift earlier. Veltorum explained she had come to them herself, confused by the object since she'd never seen anything like it before, wanting answers about what it truly was. Veltorum's expression darkened. He said Asakura clearly didn't understand just how significant this discovery truly was. His voice low and heavy with implication. Asakura admitted he had intended to sell the lighter eventually, expecting Veltorum to push him toward that decision. Instead, he was told it could be extremely expensive here, unlike back home where anyone could afford one. Veltorum explained the real issue lay with the casing itself. Though it held no magic, its craftsmanship alone made it more valuable than most magic tools on the market. He warned that if sold, the lighter would need to be priced near glass or even gemstones. Setting the price too low would only invite scammers pretending common items were rare treasures. Asakura pictured the trouble such pricing could cause and sighed under his breath. He'd promised to help sell products responsibly, and now realized he'd acted too carelessly with the gift. Valuing items in this world proved harder than expected. Frustrated, Asakura considered simply not selling it at all, admitting the decision felt impossible to make cleanly. Veltorum suggested selling it exclusively to the wealthy instead, a compromise that could avoid the risk of scams while still letting the item find its place in the market. A delicate rose sculpture sat displayed nearby, its craftsmanship catching the light, a quiet symbol of the value placed on beauty and rarity in this world. Asakura wondered aloud if he'd overdone something again. Veltorum reacted with surprise, while Karina simply admired the piece, calling it pretty without a hint of the tension around her. Suddenly, a blade flashed through the air. Karina moved fast, drawing her sword and intercepting an unseen threat before anyone could react. Her expression sharp and focused, the blade stopped short. Karina apologized for her rudeness, while Veltorum assured everyone there was no problem, insisting he was simply having a conversation with Asakura. Veltorum apologized for the commotion, blaming himself for raising his voice. Asakura brushed it off, saying he'd only been startled for a second, urging Karina to stay close. Karina admitted she'd simply reacted on instinct without time to think it through. She confessed quietly that she'd known all along Veltorum would never actually harm him. Veltorum noted she hadn't looked worried even with a blade pointed her way. If Asakura was fine with her staying nearby, then the arrangement suited him just fine too. With that settled, Karina remained by his side as the conversation resumed. the earlier tension fading into the background of the tent. Velteram confirmed once more that Karina was comfortable with the situation, making sure everyone understood the terms before continuing their discussion about the lighter's value. He pointed to a glass sculpture nearby, explaining it was an expensive piece that could rival jewels in price. A fitting comparison for what Asakura's device might be worth. Karina found it beautiful while Velteram admitted it looked nothing like any glass he'd seen before. Several lighters lay scattered on the table beside it for comparison. He noted it shone differently from ordinary glass. Asakura explained he simply wanted to earn some money and had been considering selling the glass casing separately from the lighter itself. Determined, Asakura declared he would throw in the lighter as a freebie, an idea that shifted his expression into something sharp and confident. Velteram realized the plan, selling glass to the wealthy, while including the lighter as a bonus for everyday use. Karina agreed it wasn't a bad idea, and with a firm handshake, Velteram called it the first step forward. Velteram turned to Karina, telling her she'd only done her job protecting them. He admitted the fault lay with himself, not with her, and apologized for the earlier commotion caused by raised voices. Karina lowered her head slightly, guilt still lingering despite the reassurance. Velteram agreed the fault was shared, but her expression stayed troubled beneath the surface. Alicia, the cat, meowed happily as Asakura scratched under her chin. He noted aloud how simple she was, her face flushing whenever she smiled instead of frowned. Karina watched quietly, her cheeks reddening at the scene. She murmured that this was fine, understanding without needing to say more, flustered. She told him not to say that, her face buried slightly as embarrassment crept in. Asakura teased that her shy expression was cute too, grinning at her reaction. Later, Asakura noticed people staring at him around camp, asking Karina why. She explained rumors had spread about the lighter he'd given Colette, sparking curiosity about his identity and status. Whispers claimed he was an abandoned child being hunted, or an aristocrat who'd fled to train in secret, each story wilder than the last. Others insisted he was a runaway noble searching for the love of his life, the rumors growing more dramatic with each retelling among the caravan. Karina admitted everyone simply had a wild imagination, and Asakura agreed, amused by how far the stories had spiraled from the truth. Suddenly, a group came running, apologizing frantically, saying they couldn't shake off what was chasing them.
Abrupt roar from the woods halts everyone. Giant beasts known as king apes charge toward the camp. Under those circumstances, the commanding officer shouts for the huge beast interception formation, prompting troops to rush into organized defense. At that moment, adventurers and watchmen take positions, archers lining up at the rear as melee fighters brace up front. Daichi stays at rear, assigned to guard Alicia, while the front line readies for conflict. Alicia then insists on battling, but Daichi questions her to leave defense to him. Daichi learns about non-elemental sorcery, particularly how it strengthens the physique and equipment across enhancement. As foes approach, he ponders if he can use similar methods to protect himself in conflict. In the meantime, an enormous horde of king apes rushes forward, screeching with fury as they close in on the defenses. The captain provides the signal, voice firm and loud, ordering the archers to release their volley. At that moment, arrows fly as the archers flame in unison, aiming to break the momentum of the charging beasts. Under those circumstances, Daichi then observes as the apes leap mid-air, confident they can't evade the incoming arrows. At this point, to his shock, the arrows bounce off harmlessly. At this point, the apes roar, unfazed and nevertheless charging. The captain swiftly shifts tactics, calling for immediate use of magic attacks. In the meantime, flames and elemental spells rain down, striking the apes and sending several crashing to the ground. Regardless of losses, several apes reach the guard wall, clashing violently with the frontline defenders. Daichi then observes the frontline clash unfold, worried about the fighters, but reassured by Alicia's calm response. Abrupt alert rings out further. King apes are charging in from the southern woodland. The captain summons to maintain pressure. At this point, Daichi then hesitates, wondering if he should intervene regardless of their strength holding Nike close. He silently considers using modern gear, but chooses to stay cautious for now. Under those circumstances, suspicious of the apes' peculiar aggression, they send Alicia to confirm foe presence in the south. In the meantime, Daichi then spots a novel wave of king apes flanking from the east and urgently alerts Karina to defend. At that moment, the beasts rush in at alarming speed, leaving Daichi with no period to prepare an arm. One ape lunges towards him, but Karina intercepts, striking it down without pausing at that moment. Further foes close in. Karina braces herself, while Alicia commences forming sorcery at rear her. Under those circumstances, seeing Alicia in peril, Daichi panics and shouts her name in desperation. A king ape breaks across the defenses, lunging straight towards Daichi with lethal speed. The man reacts instinctively, launching a formidable kick that dispatches the beast flying backward. In the meantime, additional ape rushes in, and Daichi meets it head, clashing fiercely at close range. Under those circumstances, regardless of the impact, Daichi throws the creature with a spinning throw, knocking it away. In the meantime, his companions watch in shock as he lands, revealing unforeseen strength under pressure. At this point, Daichi then crashes to the ground, prompting immediate concern from Alicia and Karina as they rush to check on him, wounded and surrounded. The party begins retreating, but the king apes continue their relentless pursuit. One ape shuts in, but Daichi hits back, whereas a soldier intercepts another from the side. Alicia then freezes as a king ape emerges directly at rear her without warning. Under those circumstances, the woman turns in shock face to face with a beast ready to strike. In the meantime, Daichi then shields Alicia from the beast strike, bracing himself for the impact. Karina then, and Alicia shout in panic, fearing Daichi has been gravely harmed. To everyone's surprise, Daichi remains standing, puzzled that the assault didn't hurt at all. Abrupt realization dawns his physique was reinforced by non-elemental sorcery all along. The man recalls earlier moments, noticing the slowed foes and enhanced strength were previously signs. At that moment, Daichi then grips his dagger tightly and drives it into the ape's side, confident in his control. At that moment, with enhanced strength and gear, the blade slices cleanly, surprising him with how effective it feels. The man swiftly accompanies Karina in combat, reinforcing her position and attacking with precision. Additional beast rushes him. Daichi hits again, using the enchanted blade under those circumstances, but the dagger doesn't pierce deep enough, and the beast thrashes violently in response. At that moment, Daichi then confronts the ape's open jaws, but stays calm as it lunges in close. He smirks silently, confident despite the hazard closing in. At this point, Karina then readies a counterattack. With swift movement, she slashes across the opposition with precision. At this point, following the strike, she steadily collects herself. In the meantime, Daichi, stunned, observes her with newfound admiration. Lost and reflected, Daichi's trance breaks as his companions call out, concerned he's taken a hit. Daichi checks on the girls, reassured they're unharmed, whereas they worry further about his condition. In the meantime, the party regroup near the tents. The opponents are thinning out, and the defense line grips firm. Under those circumstances, Daichi then urges Karina to support the front. At this point, the woman pauses, silently considering his determination. The opposition's flanking scheme has failed. In the meantime, their retreat commences as morale breaks. At that moment, Karina then smiles softly. Daichi then silently notes how much calmer she glances now. Daichi spots blood and attempts to check his injury, but Alicia immediately offers to help. She readies water magic to clean the injury, ignoring his protest to do it himself. Alicia insists, softly wiping his expression while Daichi permits it, flustered but thankful. As she cleans him up, he recognizes she's using liquid spirit sorcery naturally. At that moment, astonished, Alicia shyly responds, whereas Karina silently observes their growing understanding. At this point, Daichi then reflects on the difference between elemental and spirit sorcery, explaining their structure and traits. The man deduces Alicia's abilities, realizing spirit sorcery is further efficient and potent than elemental types. In the meantime, trying to avoid offense, he lightly claims he just assumed she possessed the superior type. In the meantime, Karina then and Alicia stare silently, unconvinced by his reasoning, but amused by his logic. A night close clarifies how uncommon spirit users are, shocking Daichi with the low numbers. Daichi then acknowledges his lack of knowledge and questions for guidance, prompting Alicia's teasing response. At that moment, the girls agree to help him learn. Although Karina seems slightly reluctant, Daichi then jokingly presents to honor them with a statue which both girls resolutely reject. In the meantime, with the clash finished, they consider helping the wounded and checking on the aftermath. Karina then ponders why the apes assaulted. Daichi then possesses guesses, but others may know further. Daichi reflects on the rarity of spirit sorcery and the threat of revealing his appraisal skill. Walking with his companions, he recognizes survival is difficult, even with strong abilities. At this point, Daichi then smiled assuredly, ignoring his bruises. The woman observed from beneath a blanket, puzzled by his relaxed expression. Memories of the clash came back. He had confronted the monster unarmed, steadily placing himself between her and peril. At that moment, indeed, as the creature assaulted, he smiled. The woman couldn't understand his expression in that instant. It reminded her of fairy tales' powerful, fearless protectors standing tall without pausing. In the meantime, but doubt lingered. Under those circumstances, seemed he truly that kind of person? Daichi then smiled with ease, unaware that his calm demeanor departed others speechless and puzzled. The woman sat up in bed, silently watching the glowing camp outdoors. Her thoughts tangled. Under those circumstances, the morning erupted with surprise, as she learned Daichi possessed never ridden a horse, yet accompanied the journey anyway. Indeed, whereas riding in a high-quality coach, he complained unbothered by the nobles surrounding him. In the meantime, whispers trailed him. Although treated as a guest, Daichi questioned why individuals maintained their distance. At that moment, an unusual glow from Daichi's tent caught everyone's attention. Although puzzled, he brushed it off lightly. He was advised to consult his companions before publicly revealing his peculiar tools again. Intrigued, she questioned about the device he had employed. The man teased that she was able to have just visited his tent. Embarrassed by the reflected, she panicked, insisting an evening visit might be improper. At that moment, realizing his mistake, Daichi awkwardly apologized for offending the youthful maiden. Daichi then was stunned to learn both girls were older than him regardless, of claiming to be 22. At the moment, the party teased him, amused by his reaction, and quick attempt to appear mature, flustered. He recognized they witnessed him as a younger youth, despite his protests. The man dropped the subject, admitting his mistake, and moving on, as they proceeded their journey. At this point, later, they discussed a failed expedition. Solely 5 survivors escaped the wrath of woodland beasts. Daichi then learned that baby apes seemed captured, enslaved, and employed for labor, especially in the military. He was stunned at their high market cost, with the youngest fetching the greatest gold. Though not criminals, the explorers were gripped responsible for the destruction from the recent battle. Under those circumstances, those unable to pay confronted forced servitude. At this point, Daichi then questioned the value of adventuring. Under those circumstances, a seasoned adventurer reassured him, it's not a poor job if handled wisely. Daichi paid attention as his companions explained how the failed mission lacked proper investigation. Leaving no search for survivors, trying to understand local customs, he noted how using strength, enhancing sorcery surrounding ladies might be rude. The man was praised for adapting well, although Alicia was cautioned not to coddle him too much. Under those circumstances, wanting to lighten the mood, Daichi proposed a break and reached into his bag. To everyone's surprise, he disclosed modern snacks, delighting the party with unexpected treats. Daichi presented provisions from his homeland, explaining that the Japanese flavors might be a bit unknown. At that moment, intrigued, the girls examined the snacks, whereas Daichi eagerly awaited their reactions. He unpacked more products from his item box, created accessible through a disguised sorcery bag. At this point, as they chatted, Daichi spotted something odd in their expressions, sensing a change in tone. They reached Takura settlement, ending their break as the route forward demanded their focus. Daichi then joked about how several modern products, like sandwich wrappers, weren't meant for just anyone to see. With a break forward, he suggested a walk through the outskirts of the settlement. Karina presented a better idea, explore the settlement itself after lunch, and Alicia agreed to scout first. They hoped Daichi could learn further by seeing local culture and visiting the settlement shops. At that moment, realizing his outfit stood out, Daichi consented with their scheme and appreciated their thoughtfulness. In the meantime, Alicia then expressed how much she enjoyed Daichi's honest personality, leaving him startled by her boldness. Before leaving to scout, Karina estimated a short trip, while Daichi uneasily consented to wait at rear. Settling into the coach, Daichi and Alicia were accompanied by intrigued animals from outdoors. Under those circumstances, playfully, Alicia entertained the cat, but it pounced on her anew with perfect timing. In the meantime, the game proceeded with laughter as Alicia got caught in a flurry of feline chaos. At this point, Alicia then challenged the playful cat by enhancing her movements, determined to take the game up a notch. At this point, with surprising speed, she and the cat darted surrounding the coach, leaving Daichi stunned by their energy. The man recognized indeed Nike could use enhancement, and Alicia had just uncovered it. Daichi silently questioned her to keep that secret between them, and she consented with a soft gaze. At this point, as their instant lingered, Karina came back, catching them in an unexpectedly quiet, emotional stillness. Karina came back quickly, and the party welcomed her with relief. She informed them they would remain in the settlement for 2 days, signaling that unforeseen trouble had emerged. The party receives unexpected news they must remain in the settlement for 2 days, due to damage from the previous evening's conflict with the king apes. Everyone rests whereas lodging is arranged. With spare period, the protagonist remains startled by an abrupt suggestion for lunch. In the meantime, Karina then brightly demands the sandwich he summoned, recalling his earlier craving. Everyone gathers, intrigued about the unknown provisions from another world. Under those circumstances, the sandwich's soft texture surprises the girls as they examine it inquisitively. Under those circumstances, a cautious bite leads to immediate shock. Its flavor and softness exceed expectations. In the meantime, one maiden savors every bite with glowing admiration, overwhelmed by the taste. Under those circumstances, between bites, curiosity grows about the ingredients hidden within the sandwich. With a grateful smile, she clutches the remaining sandwiches tightly as the youth presents more. Under those circumstances, novel treats appear, drawing curiosity with their sweet aroma and unusual appearance. In the meantime, the cat meows impatiently until it's fed, eagerly devouring its portion. Amused, his companions watch as the cat demands even more attention and provisions. At that moment, a companion carries a hesitant bite of a novel sandwich, unsure of what to expect. At that moment, a burst of sweetness stuns her as she marvels at the taste, asking in awe what it remains. In the meantime, following tasting the whipped cream, Karina lights up in delight, praising its sweet flavor. Under those circumstances, presented further, she hesitates, but his calm assurance convinces her. Grateful, she accepts wearing a smile, touched by his kind words and generosity. As the girls continue enjoying the treats, he silently acknowledges how effortlessly he swayed too. In the meantime, when questioned about the cost, he simply brushes it off, prioritizing their happiness over expense. Karina then glares silently, whereas continuing to eat, unimpressed by his shallow charm. The boy reflects on their past moments before presenting another dessert wearing a smile. The man presents the treat to the girls, who eagerly accept as their cat observes closely. Elsewhere, a nobleman reacts in astonishment following hearing someone kick the king ape. The woman steadily defends her account, until the nobleman concedes, realizing her magical awareness proved accurate. The nobleman pays attention, overwhelmed. As Karina finishes recounting the clash's events involving Asakura, she clarifies his restrained strength battling with only a knife suggesting hidden strength and enchanted gear. Doubt turns into awe as he acknowledges no one was able to rival Asakura's non-elemental sorcery. The party reflect on his lack of martial ability, but impressive magical talent hinting at a mystery. In the meantime, regardless of appearing untrained, Asakura's behavior and knowledge suggest experience learned from skilled mentors. At this point, speculation arises about Asakura's origins, with noble lineage from additional continent being weighed. Karina then verifies his importance and remains instructed to keep his identity confidential. Under those circumstances, she is assigned to protect him and ensure others won't uncover his secrets prior to reaching Karam. The woman approves the task with quiet awe, likening him to a hero from a fairy tale. Under those circumstances, returning with cake, Asakura's cheerful presence interrupts her instant of reflection. In a quiet settlement lined with shops, novel clothes remain laid out for inspection. In the meantime, Asakura emerges in a simple outfit, seeking approval from his companions. Under those circumstances, unsure, he notes it doesn't feel like his usual style, and his companions agree. He weighs further stylish options, but is cautioned not to draw attention if traveling. In the meantime, settling on practical attire, he creates his purchase, whereas charming the shopkeeper effortlessly. At that moment, Asakura playfully flatters the shopkeeper, joking about her youthful glances. At that moment, his charm earns him a discount, with Karina noting how smoothly he negotiates. The man surprises everyone by offering to pay not in coins, but with something peculiar. In the meantime, a gleaming silver bar stuns the party, its value far beyond what's expected. At this point, Karina then rushes in, throwing coins instead, determined to avoid a financial disaster. Karina then scolds Asakura for nearly overpaying anew, suspecting it seemed intentional. Asakura lightly proposes visiting another store, but Karina insists otherwise. She redirects the party to the guildmaster instead, grabbing Asakura before he can object. Dragged away, Asakura approves his fate as the party follows Karina's determined lead. Goblin sightings. The settlement was already in ruins by the period help arrived. At this point, although adventurers seemed dispatched, the mission failed due to unclear objectives and missing leadership. Karina clarified that failing a lord's request not only cost gold, but tarnished the explorer's reputation. Daichi pondered whether several adventurers and bandits were secretly working together, hinting the settlement could be targeted next. Intrigued about his weapon, he asked his companions to follow him somewhere private for a test. The man desired Karina's opinion on its performance, wondering how it compared to a goblin general. Without pausing, Karina verified goblin generals were even stronger than king apes. Daichi proposed the grasslands as a test site, where Alika verified she could use several physical enhancement. Karina consented, permitting the strategy as long as they remained within sight of the convoy. Whereas rushing forward, Daichi collided with a hostile man who swiftly became confrontational. Under those circumstances, a crowd gathered, tension stood, and the man falsely accused Daichi of provoking him. Close by, two hooded figures observed the scene silently, their interest clearly piqued. Under those circumstances, crude voices jeered, demanding coin and ladies, amused by their supposed luck. At this point, one step closer, and Karina's tone sharpened. Any further might mean consequences. Mockery proceeded, but Daichi's gaze shifted, irritation brewing, as he weighed testing his secret arm. In the meantime, a calm suggestion trailed, cripple them, but no need to go too far. In the meantime, killing, however, came with a financial penalty. Under those circumstances, to Daichi, that cost on death felt disturbingly normal. Under those circumstances, facing armed adventurers, he chose to go easy, just enough force to make them back off. Arms drawn, the opponents charged, despite warnings. At that moment, with calm certainty, he verified he was able to strike hard without consequence. In the meantime, approval trailed swiftly. Under those circumstances, confidence surged. Surrounded by companions, he moved ahead, ready to demonstrate a decisive gap in strength. A party of adventurers stood their ground at the settlement outskirts, facing off against a gang of armed troublemakers. The leader advanced ahead, shielding his allies while preparing to fight. He reached out, activating a special ability that permitted him to summon modern products through a unique trading ability. Combining pocket dimension storage, physique enhancement, and non-elemental sorcery, he readied a counterattack without pausing. He unleashed a formidable strike. At that moment, the ruffians crashed to the ground, overwhelmed by the force. Daichi moved ahead, his presence silencing the opposition. Under those circumstances, his palm stood, signaling something unseen but commanding. At that moment, one man screamed as his leg collapsed, blood soaking the ground beneath him. Under those circumstances, additional foe reeled back, yelping in shock. At this point, Daichi's gaze remained steady, unfazed by the chaos. In the meantime, from the side, Karina accompanied the fray, moving with lethal precision. At this point, her blade cut swiftly. Under those circumstances, with calm resolve, she verified the task. At that moment, every dominant arm tendon seemed severed swift, clean, and effective. Karina stood resolutely before the defeated men, making it clear they were no longer welcome near the settlement. Close by, villagers watched in astonishment, slowly realizing the confrontation was over and the outsiders had prevailed. Noticing that the little cat possessed slept across the entire disturbance, Alicia advanced ahead, holding the cat protectively while scolding the offenders for their careless behavior. Aunt's calm came back. Karina checked on Alicia, ensuring she was unharmed as the party prepared to move on, commanded resolutely by Alicia. The trembling fighters groveled before the cat, shouting apologies with panic in their voices. Under those circumstances, everyone observed as Alicia cuddled Nike, praising her mercy. At this point, Karina, however, questioned the earlier violence. Under those circumstances, Daichi then lightly scratched his head, unsure how to justify his overkill. Where his cut tendons could be healed with basic sorcery, regenerating limbs was additional matter entirely. Daichi then recognized the cost of healing seemed high. In the meantime, fortunately, Nike's sorcery might help if she felt like it. At that moment, injuries might delay any retaliation, making ambushes further likely than open conflict. At this point, that outcome seemed fully intentional. At that moment, concerns shifted towards accommodations, as inns likely wouldn't welcome such a disheveled party. At this point, suspicion stood over the brutal assault. At this point, that level of damage couldn't come from basic sorcery alone. Steadily, he clarified it wasn't ordinary. It was the uncommon exclusive skill no one else could use at that moment, whereas uncommon, abilities like his weren't unheard of. In the meantime, both worlds possessed their exceptions. Learning that solely one person on the continent gripped a unique ability came as a surprise. At this point, so much for a few. Pressed for the reality, he acknowledged to being exiled because of his uncommon ability. Under those circumstances haunted by betrayal, he recalled how indeed his family turned on him. At this point, talking about it remained difficult. In the meantime, regardless of discomfort, he consented to explain just among trusted company. In the meantime, in his palm, a bullet formed. Flame-powered acceleration completed the lethal ability. At this point, lifting a larger bullet, he clarified its force. In the meantime, bigger meant further damage. At that moment, a single shot possessed taken a leg. Following the explanation, he questioned for thoughts on its combat value, intrigued to hear honest impressions. Although hesitant, he shoved to test further ideas. At that moment, not everyone shared his enthusiasm at this point. To lighten the mood, he presented snacks. At that moment, choices included sweet and salty. With a gentle smile, Karina chose sweets, relaxing for the first time. Under those circumstances, plans for a post-experiment snack seemed sealed with cheerful agreement. At that moment, sweets possessed plainly won Karina's heart. Prior to setting up, the party scouted a safe place. At that moment, open ground seemed preferred, but deep woodland risks forced them to stop early. In the meantime, Nike seemed handed over for safekeeping, prompting Alicia's eager delight. At that moment, snuggles and snacks trailed. At this point, the bond between maiden and cat possessed become an obvious, unspoken alliance. In the meantime, eventually, indeed Alicia possessed to call out Nike's overzealous affection. At that moment, admiring Nike's adorable display, he swiftly shifted back into focus, ready to demonstrate grave firepower. At that moment, from the pocket dimension, he summoned the Desert Eagle, a modern arm, capable of immense damage. Under those circumstances, a reflected triggered draw activated the pistol. Under those circumstances, no palm movement required. Under those circumstances, the gun emerged in his palm, ready to flame. At this point, one shot ripped across a thick tree trunk. At that moment, bark exploded, leaving stunned silence in its wake. At that moment, awe spread throughout both confronts. Under those circumstances, such force wasn't ordinary. Under those circumstances, praise trailed instantly. At that moment, confirmation trailed that the destructive force truly came from a single hunk of lead. At that moment, no magical chant, no casting delay. Under those circumstances, speed, not repetition, seemed the real challenge. At this point, indeed, seasoned sorcerers couldn't match it. At this point, comparison to a pistol emphasized the hazard. Sorcery users, indeed at low ranks, possessed terrifying potential among non-magical folk. The ability alone created someone perilous regardless of ability tier. Under those circumstances, confronted with the inquiry, he didn't hesitate. Under those circumstances, offensive sorcery trumped all. Alicia clarified that only those ranked F or higher in the Sorcerer Guild were officially summoned. Sorcerer's adventurer ranks were separate. Whereas snacks were expected, the main course turned out to be additional arm test. The man cautioned them to watch closely. Under those circumstances, an enormous shot blasted across the target zone, leaving everyone stunned by the raw force. Despite the outcome, he acknowledged his aim required work for reference. Indeed, high-ranking sorcerers would struggle to pierce such a huge tree. Bringing down a tree wasn't impossible, Karina noted, but piercing it cleanly seemed far tougher. Indeed, with advanced sorcery. Alicia then lightly listed a few capable Earth users, hinting she had further in mind if accuracy wasn't a concern. In this world, Nike's liquid bullet rivaled high-ranking sorcerer spells regardless of seeming average by Isekai standards. Under those circumstances, reassured, Karina joked about her fears he'd go further. In the meantime, the man smiled. Under those circumstances, that level of strength, under those circumstances, reserved for his trump card, Nike's spirit sorcery. With the sun high, the party paused for a snack, enjoying an uncommon moment of peace. While his companions ate, he shifted the topic, hinting at a concept forming in his mind. He declared his scheme to open a shop in the settlement, using his abilities in a new way. In a quiet settlement, Daichi resolved to launch a novel experiment, setting up his first store using his unique ability. As he shared his concept, intrigued adventurers gathered, intrigued by the possibility of something novel. Reactions varied, some displayed excitement, others wary anticipation, wondering what unusual tools he'd produce this period. He sought opinions from Alicia, an expert in magic tools, before approaching the guildmaster for approval. He disclosed modern tools unknown to the world, questioning if such products existed in this land. The unknown tools left the party puzzled. They had never seen such objects before, and couldn't guess their purpose. In the meantime, Daichi then demonstrated their use, striking a match and lighting a flame without any chant or sorcery circle. The man clarified they weren't magical artifacts, anyone was able to use them regardless of magical ability. He clarified the science at rear them, noting how even a single match could spark a proper flame. In the meantime, Alicia then seemed stunned. These simple products could effortlessly replace complex fire, starting sorcery tools. Daichi disclosed his scheme to sell modern tools to individuals without magic, opening access to practical alternatives. The man expressed his desire to improve their lives, regardless of the market's tendency to ignore such customers. To counter that, he chose to cost the items low enough for even the poor to afford. In the meantime, although aware of how it might seem, he remained honest about his intentions. Under those circumstances, the man proposed dividing his business efforts between the rich and poor to serve both without bias. Under those circumstances, concerns arose about supply and credibility if demand surged, but Daichi assured them of ample stock. The man verified he could manufacture replacements effortlessly, removing doubt about production capacity. Despite needing approval, he was determined to pitch his plan to the guildmaster with full confidence. With his companions satisfied, the discussion lightened as dessert emerged cheesecake, marking a break in tension. Under those circumstances, conversation shifted to sorcery, with Daichi asking about the elemental abilities the girls was able to use. Alicia disclosed her uncommon ability to use all elemental sorcery, surprising Daichi with her exceptional potential. In the meantime, Karina then urged secrecy, cautioning him not to pry deeper into matters that might be sensitive. At that moment, intrigued, Daichi questioned about their ranks. Both ladies verified they were B-rank sorcerers in the guild. Karina clarified her rank stemmed from her mastery of air and non-elemental sorcery, despite using a sword. Daichi then pondered if she now wielded stronger enchanted gear than during her conflict with the king apes. Karina clarified she had done her finest against the king apes, but lacked period to prepare her gear or enhancements. In the meantime, Daichi then presented a treat, easing the tension as they shifted back to lighter conversation over dessert. Alicia then acknowledged her lack of conflict experience, having frozen in fear during the earlier confrontation. She disclosed her natural talent for enchantment sorcery, leaning towards crafting tools rather than combat roles. Alicia then described how enchantment infused elemental sorcery into compatible materials, forming practical tools like flame starters. Alicia clarified that enchanted tools permitted those with minor magic to use elements they lacked. Daichi then proposed multi-element tools, but the party clarified the complexity and limits of such creations. At this point, advanced tools with adjustable output and safety features existed but seemed costly and difficult to make. Karina clarified that sorcery, including enchantment, was innate, something one had to be born with. Realizing his own limitations, Daichi acknowledged defeat in crafting sorcery tools regardless of their technological appeal. Under those circumstances, Daichi then reflected on Nike's growing usefulness, noting her potential in reconnaissance and water-based assaults. He questioned Karina to demonstrate her air sorcery scouting, hoping Nike could learn by observing. Regardless of air sorcery being invisible, Daichi insisted on seeing the process, eager to understand its use. At this point, Karina then activated her spell, and a visible disturbance rippled across the air, drawing everyone's attention. Nike's sharp reaction verified her awareness, signaling that she understood the nature of the sorcery. At that moment, Karina then sensed movement close, by possibly human. Alarmed, she suspected it was able to be bandits hiding deeper in the woods. In the meantime, Alicia then verified the count. 8 individuals. Her precise detection astonished his companions with its clarity. Daichi then commenced realizing Alicia wasn't as gentle and simple as she seemed. There was further hidden beneath. He noted others, including the guildmaster, were likely concealing key details about Alicia's true nature. Whereas Dichi weighed the intruders might be adventurers, Karina readied her arm, uncertain of their intent. Karina chose to keep the unknown party within scouting range, tracking their movement from a distance. At this point, Daichi then acknowledged his lack of combat readiness, but recognized his overall ability in this world. They debated approaching, but Karina cautioned against reckless action without knowing the opposition's capabilities. At this point, Nike reacted sharply, heightening suspicions that the party might indeed be hostile bandits. Daichi readied for conflict, summoning heavy firepower ready to show no mercy if the settlement was threatened. Karina then sensed a troubling shift. The party's numbers had grown, prompting concern. Under those circumstances, with the count now at 20, Daichi weighed the implications and guessed their base must be close. In the meantime, Alicia then presented to assist, but Karina declined, suggesting they report the matter to the guild leadership. The party delivered their findings, prompting the guild master to forward the alert to Captain Jeffrey. In the meantime, whereas waiting for the captain, Daichi proposed discussing a separate issue, hoping to use the period wisely. Daichi proposed opening a store in the settlement, showcasing 2 unknown items to the guild officer to demonstrate. He hit a match, igniting it without any sorcery, leaving the observer astonished. The man clarified the matches were single, use and short-lived, meant to be discarded following each ignition. At that moment, when questioned about affordability, Daichi emphasized his goal to support non-magic users with accessible pricing. The man resolutely set the cost at 2 silver coins, enough for value, yet nevertheless within reach, stating it was business, not charity. Daichi disclosed he would sell a box of flame starters for 1 silver coin, shocking the captain with the low cost. The man clarified they were just flammable scraps, cheap, disposable, and usually bundled with matches anyway. In the meantime, following demonstrating one, the captain tested it himself, effortlessly igniting the material with a basic tool. Realizing its simplicity, Daichi reconsidered his scheme. Perhaps focusing on flame starters was a superior strategy. Despite a suggestion to raise the cost, Alicia quickly and firmly rejected the idea without pausing. Regardless of the suggestion, Daichi remained firm. He might sell the flame starters for 1 silver coin. The man swiftly recognized the guild's interest in him, knowing he had to act wisely without exposing his true worth. With negotiations shifting, he presented exclusive luxury merchandise to the nobles, holding back his finest items. Captain Jeffrey accepted the proposal wearing a smile, suggesting they continue talks after stabilizing the situation. Abruptly, a man stepped in the tent, bringing a novel presence that shifted the atmosphere entirely. The party was questioned about the forest incident and the suspicious figures hiding near the settlement. Torino settlement was assaulted by bandits, and reports described suspicious figures hiding in the close by woods while crime increased. Inside the tent, the party gathered, and the young merchant pushed for investigating the figures seen near the woods. The recent raid and route robberies firmly proposed the figures were bandits. The party hesitated, concerned about dividing their limited manpower. A cautious scheme was chosen, and Karina was selected to join the wood search. At this point, Asakura and Alicia volunteered to join the search, aiming to reduce the strain on the convoy's watchmen. The guildmaster, however, refused, not wanting to risk the safety of his guests. Karina then stepped in, pointing out their past achievements and powerful magical capabilities in conflict. Alicia supported the assessment, noting Asakura's formidable flame sorcery and ability to retreat if needed. The party resolved Alicia could assist from afar with range support if necessary. At that moment, Asakura suspected Alicia gripped noble status, judging by others' reactions, and acknowledged the importance of returning safely. Leadership roles seemed assigned. Karina might head the search squad, Jeffrey would remain on standby, and recruitment was delegated. Karina ready to lead, arranging escorts while noting Asakura's sorcery might be disclosed during the mission. In the meantime, Asakura approved, but seemed advised not to reveal his full capabilities. Karina then cautioned him softly his trusting nature could be risky. Karina proposed disguising Asakura's ability, prompting him to consider melee or bow arms, settling on a Japanese sword. At this point, meanwhile, 2 individuals, Dennis and Frida, seemed summoned for a novel assignment. In the meantime, intrigued about the urgency, the pair questioned the task awaiting them. The party were informed of a suspicious party in the woods and invited to assist in the investigation. At that moment, regardless of their casual attitude, Asakura observed their exchange and noted their underlying combat readiness. As the party headed out, one questioned about the 2 guests, prompting a vague but deliberate reply. In the meantime, Karina then organized the squad's formation, assigning herself and Asakura to the vanguard. Alicia then carried the midguard, whereas Dennis and Frida were placed in the rear guard to cover all sides. In the meantime, Asakura hesitantly acknowledged his limited combat experience regardless of recent success. At that moment, Dennis playfully dismissed the concern, praising Asakura's victory over King Apes as proof of real ability. Under those circumstances, Asakura questioned to drop formalities, preferring to be summoned by his name instead of titles. While walking, Dennis questioned whether Asakura planned to open a store in Karam. Asakura clarified that Karam was his next stop, although he hadn't chosen a permanent location yet. Dennis had expected something grander, but Asakura clarified he solely intended to set up a little booth for now. In the meantime, intrigued, Frida questioned what he planned to sell. At that moment, Asakura displayed waterproof matches to Dennis and Frida, amazing them with fire-starting tools that didn't use sorcery. At that moment, Karina then signaled the squad to prepare as they neared the location of 8 detected individuals. Movement in the woods prompted her to advise caution while scouting the area forward. Dennis remained relaxed and confident, declaring his readiness whereas his companions stayed alert. At that moment, abruptly, Asakura's cat reacted sharply, sensing an approaching presence in the woods. Asakura sensed peril from the right side through Nike's wind magic and alerted the party quietly. Alicia then verified a party of 3 located 5 kilometers away, prompting Karina to stay sharp. Asakura employed binoculars to scout ahead, surprising his companions with the unfamiliar device. Under those circumstances, Dennis tried them and seemed impressed, reacting loudly to the magnified view. Asakura pointed out a glowing presence in the woods, spotted just following Nike's initial signal. Karina detected a party moving less than 2 kilometers away, although details were nevertheless unclear at that distance. Alicia then was praised for her contribution, and the party placed further trust in her sensory abilities. Karina activated physical enhancement magic and ordered the party to ready for combat. At this point, Frida handed out equipment, reminding Asakura to ready his guard. Asakura disclosed an enormous guard, amusing some while others questioned its practicality. At that moment, Alicia then informed the squad about a cave located 2 kilometers away, prompting a quiet discussion. She sensed a huge presence within possibly demi, humans estimating over 50, maybe indeed 60 individuals. The party exchanged tense glances, realizing the cave likely gripped serious trouble. At that moment, with enough intelligence gathered, Karina summoned for a retreat, deciding not to rush into the unknown. Asakura noted their cautious approach, acknowledging the squad's strategic awareness in handling the circumstances. At that moment, concern spread as the party discussed humans realizing they'd likely been detected by scent. Dennis stated their finest move seemed to gather detailed intel in return, noting the worst case seemed going missing. At that moment, Frida remarked that just identifying the hideout and its numbers seemed commendable enough to earn praise. At that moment, Asakura consented, albeit uneasily, trying to stay composed under pressure. Under those circumstances, Dennis reminded him that obedient clients remain a guard's favorite, hinting he should follow instructions closely. Asakura accepted the advice wearing a smile, recalling the wild stories he had shared to gain trust. At this point, Karina then announced the retreat, teasing Asakura as others playfully praised his obedient attitude. The party moved back through the woods, alert and watchful, as Asakura discreetly activated a device. At that moment, upon return, Asakura seemed stunned to find the camp completely abandoned. Nothing remained. Karina verified the movement. The entire party had shifted into the close, by village unnoticed. The townspeople grew uneasy, and Asakura worried about spies among them, possibly compromising the strategy. Karina then clarified their aim wasn't to battle, but to appear vigilant and powerful enough to deter action. A messenger had been dispatched to the Knights Guild while the party stayed behind to delay the opposition. The party debated sharing intel with villagers, worried about trust and the larger-than-expected foe force. Ultimately, they chose to camp outdoors the settlement to maintain defense and gain cooperation. Karina came back with good news. The settlement chief agreed to cooperate with their efforts. Frida noted that indeed, with their own defense force, the townspeople's support was a fortunate outcome. Karina offered orders for the night, then casually used Asakura's first name, drawing reactions from the party. Embarrassed, she swiftly attempted to explain that Asakura had asked for informality earlier. His companions teased her, guessing she possessed been hiding her familiarity during the mission. In the meantime, Asakura dismissed the teasing, accusing them of setting him up for rejection and playing it off. Frida dragged Karina close for maiden talk, whereas Karina resisted the embarrassing interrogation. At that moment, the teasing escalated, with Frida openly asking Daichi if he discovered Karina cute. Asakura offered a soft response, admitting Karina was cute when nervous and indeed more so now. At this point, Karina then froze in shock, overwhelmed by the abrupt praise and everyone's joyful reactions. Asakura announced he seemed setting up his booth, prompting teasing cheers towards Karina, who panicked over the misunderstanding. The party entered the village marketplace, deciding to observe how the townspeople responded within the next 2 hours. Karina was questioned whether something had happened, but she uneasily denied it. In the meantime, Alicia then pressed further, sensing her reaction, whereas Karina struggled to deflect suspicion. In the meantime, Asakura waved them off, reminding them of the period limit and focusing on the booth setup. Daichi greeted the ladies as he readied his booth. The man clarified he was solely testing things out today. At this point, as one lady unpacked merchandise from her item box, Daichi expressed quiet envy. The woman and her companion joked that envy grows stronger with age, especially towards those with item boxes at that moment. Daichi then paid attention silently. The man then questioned how they normally lit fires, prompting a simple response, Flint. One lady acknowledged she could use a bit of sorcery, though magical tools were far too expensive. Daichi then introduces a novel tool that can start fires without sorcery. He poses an inquiry to the ladies close. The man carries one of the woman's palms and demonstrates the tool a box of waterproof matches. At this point, the lady lights the match successfully, her expression filled with shock and amazement. Under those circumstances, the surrounding villagers remain equally astonished. At this point, as they recognize its practicality, Daichi feels a sense of accomplishment. At this point, Daichi then stood under the market roof, drawing attention as he promoted his latest product, waterproof matches. Intrigued villagers gathered in excitement, eager to try the unusual fire-starting products that needed no magic. The man clarified how the matches worked, demonstrating how effortlessly they lit up firewood with just one use. At this point, a volunteer neared, cautiously striking a match and placing it among the dry wood. At that moment, the flame caught instantly, amazing the onlookers as flames danced effortlessly over the stack kindling. Daichi assuredly clarified how the waterproof matches and flame starters made fire, building effortless, even without magic. The man disclosed the pricing: 25 matches for 2 silver coins and 60 flame starters for 1 silver. In the meantime, the onlookers hesitated. The man reminded them both products were single use. Regardless of that, the values seemed to impress the townspeople. A bold customer moved ahead and chose to buy both products without pausing. Daichi approved the coins and presented to showcase even more of his modern merchandise. In the meantime, following completing the sale, Daichi presented a bonus to show appreciation for the customer's purchase. He reached into his pack, pulling out a portable grill, placing it over the flame as intrigued gaze watched. In the meantime, with a confident motion, he arranged rows of skewered chicken throughout the hot grill, smoke rising swiftly. He clarified the cooking process while the meat sizzled and started to brown over the flames. The mouth-watering scent spread through the onlookers, stirring hunger in those who hadn't eaten all date. At this point, Daichi then summoned out to the earlier customer, offering her a grilled chicken skewer as a thank you gift. She approved it with surprise and carried a bite, while others around her observed in silence. At that moment, her gaze widened in shock as she savored the taste, overwhelmed by how flavorful it seemed. At that moment, curiosity spread. Further villagers questioned about the sauce and whether the skewers seemed for sale. Daichi announced he'd include grilled chicken with any item purchase, drawing indeed more interest from the onlookers. Crowds hurried to Daichi's booth, eager to purchase merchandise and grilled skewers, overwhelming his small setup. Regardless of the chaos, he thanked a close-by vendor for sharing space and presented skewers in gratitude. At this point, alone and overworked, he proceeded grilling and selling, balancing both roles in his one-man operation. As closing period neared, Daichi invited customers to make their final purchases prior to he shut down. A party of intimidating fighters emerged, demanding free food, unaware that the chicken was already gone. At that moment, the rowdy party grew aggressive, accusing Daichi of lying about the grilled chicken's availability. Remaining calm, Daichi clarified that the store had closed, inviting them to return the next day. At this point, unwilling to back down, the fighters threatened him, claiming he owed them superior treatment as customers. At this point, just as tension stood, a confident swordswoman stepped in, unafraid of their intimidation. Under those circumstances, the fighters hesitated as her rank tag gleamed. Revealing her status as a capable B-rank sorcerer, the swordswoman resolutely declared she seemed protecting Daichi, staring down the hostile fighters without flinching. Regardless of being outnumbered, she cautioned them that underestimating her might bring regret. Faced with her confidence, the party quickly backed off, pretending the circumstances no longer concerned them. Abruptly, another party emerged, this time familiar faces who recognized the trouble brewing. One of them presented support, asking if backup seemed required, and received a grateful nod in return. Daichi lightly announced their departure, but a hazard swiftly followed, targeting the swordswoman who stood beside him. At this point, angered by her attitude, the fighters shouted, blaming Daichi for mocking them and vowing to retaliate. At this point, Daichi then acknowledged his joke, unintentionally adding fuel to their rage with a playful tone. Furious and fed up, the party declared him a dead man and moved ahead aggressively, prior to anything escalated. Another party emerged, their presence shifting the atmosphere with silent intimidation. A novel challenger stepped in, mocking the circumstances, while another girl cheered Daichi on from afar. The furious man attempted to justify his actions, claiming they only meant to teach a lesson. At that moment, their party laughed off the confrontation, taunting Daichi and his companion as powerless. One of the fighters shouted a warning. She wasn't just any maiden, but a B-rank sorcerer. Realizing the hazard was real, the loud party grew cautious, their expressions swiftly shifting to unease. As tension stood, another ally moved ahead, revealing that the swordswoman wasn't the only mage present. The opposition gang, undeterred, drew their arms and charged forward with aggressive intent. Daichi and Karina held his ground, quickly identifying the assailants' likely magical capabilities and preparing for battle. Karina questioned Daichi to handle part of the fight, placing her trust in him without pausing. Daichi then approved without pause, bracing himself to counter with swift action and concentrated resolve. Daichi readied for the battle, claiming he could handle both enemies, but Karina advised restraint. Despite her warning, The assailants rushed forward with weapons drawn and confidence high. Moments later, they seemed overcame and departed crawling in pain on the ground, completely overpowered. Karina then reminded them of her earlier warning, whereas the remaining thugs uneasily pretended they had forgotten. Daichi neared steadily, questioning their purpose and confirming they were in city to handle goblins. One man claimed his party officially approved the goblin hunting appeal, though others nearby had not. Daichi then questioned them further, asking exactly how numerous goblins they possessed taken down. One by one, the fighters acknowledged their parties had slain none at all. Additional party had claimed 11 slays, which raised suspicion in Daichi's mind. The man pressed them for confirmation, and the response came, yes, they were sure it was 11. Daichi then questioned for details about the party that claimed to have overcame 11 goblins. The man shifted the inquiry to additional bystander when the first hesitated to respond. The man clarified the party's roles, including liquid, healing, and offensive sorcery. The man added that 2 wore enchanted gear, whereas additional specialized in offensive spells. Daichi then acknowledged the squad's balance, noting their success was believable, yet nevertheless felt suspicious. Daichi questioned who had approved the goblin subjugation appeal for Torreno Village. One party moved ahead. They claimed they discovered no goblins for 10 days and left unharmed, despite the settlement being attacked. Daichi noted their luck, while the sorcerer's party confirmed they had arrived days before the assault. The man questioned the scale of their conflict, eager to uncover further about the operation. The sorcerer explained they had searched deeper into the woods, suspecting the goblins had relocated. Daichi questioned whether any goblins had actually emerged during the mage party's forest search. At that moment, the response seemed a calm and clear no, which caused Daichi and Karina to grow suspicious. In the meantime, wondering what to do next, they weighed releasing the parties if they expressed genuine remorse. The explorers swiftly apologized in unison, desperate to avoid further consequences. In the meantime, with a sigh, Daichi chose to report everything to guild leader Klaus and Captain Jeffrey. At that moment, Daichi then analyzed the sorcerer's story. Under those circumstances, the logic seemed valid, but doubt lingered in his mind like a warning. In the meantime, suspicion deepened. At this point, the sorcerer's overly casual behavior raised concern. Karina informed the guildmaster that 2 parties involved in the goblin clearing had stayed in Torreno before the bandit attack. At this point, the leader questioned her opinion. Under those circumstances, Karina then expressed doubt, warning that the sorcerers might be coordinating false accounts. In the meantime, the leader consented, stressing caution with all involved. They identified Lord Asakura as the one who uncovered the intelligence, possibly through the booth he had unsealed. At that moment, the leader acknowledged he planned to investigate later, but seemed outpaced. At this point, Karina then regretted not stopping Asakura. The party pondered if adventurers spotted. In the meantime, his tactic possessed fooled everyone. Suspicion stirred as Asakura's inquiries hinted they were readied for route ambushes, not just village defense. At this point, nevertheless, as long as no one questioned too deeply, their intentions remained hidden. The guildmaster asked about Asakura's capabilities. In the meantime, the response seemed direct. His potential seemed limitless. There seemed no doubt he gripped knowledge and education far beyond ordinary reach. Not just as a sorcerer, but in wisdom. At moment, his quick mental calculations, done without tools, departed a lasting impression. At that moment, indeed complex contracts posed no challenge. In the meantime, as a merchant, he displayed unmatched precision. While practicing magic in the forest, Daichi began by writing equations and calculating distances, catching the guildmaster's attention. At that moment, Karina then acknowledged she couldn't understand or recall the formulas. His method seemed triangulation, and regardless of rough data, he clarified like a professor. At this point, eventually, Daichi employed an unusual high-tech tool to measure precisely. The guildmaster noted its efficiency. At that moment, impressed, he speculated Daichi might be of noble or royal descent, noting his composed manner. Nevertheless, Karina observed that Daichi possessed a habit of treating grave matters lightly, which puzzled the leader. At this point, Karina then reflected on Asakura's behavior, noting how he often acted impulsively, forcing others to manage the consequences under those circumstances regardless of this. She proposed they elevate their treatment of him perhaps as royalty in disguise or an air of significance. The woman pointed to his item box, containing uncommon and astonishing merchandise. At that moment, in their country solely the elite possessed such sorcery. At this point, his ability to adapt, solve problems, and display refined knowledge proposed deep sophistication beyond ordinary means, under those circumstances. Yet, if his tools seemed carelessly released, they was able to disrupt the country's balance entirely. Karina then speculated that if Asakura seemed truly foreign royalty with superior sorcery, his influence would be beyond measure. The guildmaster teased her, suggesting her noble lineage might push her to secure his favor at any cost. Shocked, Karina lashed out, demanding an explanation. While the guildmaster calmly sipped his drink, the woman reminded him sternly that her kingdom's current instability seemed no laughing matter. The guildmaster retracted, claiming it was only a joke. Nevertheless, he acknowledged that Asakura's inventions alone was able to stir both political factions to chase him. Karina cautioned that whichever faction secured Asakura would gain immense strength, but an even greater hazard would be if a foreign nation claimed him first. Hearing this, the guildmaster resolved they must treat Asakura with the utmost respect and honor. Elsewhere, Asakura spotted two companions following him anew and questioned their presence lightly. One teased him flirtatiously, saying it's superior to be around recognizable confronts. Under those circumstances, Asakura relaxed, realizing her intent seemed simple. She joked about replacing Dennis if required, while he uneasily objected to being presented up so easily. In the meantime, Asakura assured them he seemed fine with Dennis joining, brushing off the joke about choosing someone prettier. Karina clarified the strategy to ambush bandits by pretending to be drunk. In the meantime, with Asakura's blessing, Dennis was able to drink freely, much to his delight. Karina then noted that both Dennis and Frida seemed B-rank sorcerers, skilled in both ranged and close combat, placing them on par with her. At that moment, Asakura guessed they might surpass her in offensive sorcery, especially if they employed fire-based spells. In the meantime, Frida and Dennis responded humbly, noting Beltram's watchmen seemed mostly higher than D-rank, so they didn't feel particularly special. In the meantime, Asakura questioned the strength of Beltram's watchmen. Dennis acknowledged they seemed average, but had further ability than expected. Karina joked that Dennis could distract foes with area sorcery, allowing the rest to escape safely if required. Under those circumstances, Asakura recognized Dennis's role seemed essentially a decoy. At this point, Dennis and Frida laughed, fully embracing the concept. At this point, as they neared the tavern, Karina concluded the banter. Under those circumstances, Nike, the cat, let out a loud meow from Asakura's shoulder. Worried, a girl questioned whether Nike disliked taverns at this point. Asakura, astonished, turned his attention to the restless feline. Asakura suspected Nike had sensed something peculiar in the tavern, perhaps the shady fighters from prior. To Karina then verified it seemed just her instincts. Dennis assuredly led the party inside. Karina then remarked that if it seemed solely those adventurers, they had nothing to fear. Under those circumstances within the tavern, noisy laughter filled the air. Individuals ate and drank, unaware of the party's cautious arrival. Scanning the onlookers, Karina moved ahead with narrowed eyes, immediately surveying the room with purpose. The woman swiftly located their targets, confirming the presence of the suspicious party they were hoping to find. Under those circumstances, Nike seemed praised for detecting the wounded party. Under those circumstances, their visible injuries verified they hadn't fully recovered, making them easy targets. Asakura questioned the delay in their healing, recalling they had a liquid sorcerer capable of restoring wounds in minutes. Yet they remained wounded. Realizing the strategy to fake drinking was no longer necessary, the party dropped the act. In the meantime, Dennis, disappointed, mourned the absence of actual booze. The man was encouraged to buy several and wait outdoors. Instead, at this point, spirits lifted slightly, but his craving lingered. The party watched quietly as the suspicious adventurers exited the settlement and disappeared into the woods. Karina pointed out that if the party was just meeting a contact, there was no motive to go deep into the woods. The party could have exchanged letters or met at the edge of the woods. Something didn't add up. From at rear cover, the party observed while Karina used wind magic to search. The opposition would likely report the escort's unforeseen strength. Under those circumstances, abruptly, Frida sensed movement. She alerted the party to individuals hiding in the grass nearby. With tension rising, they crept closer, hoping to overhear the opposition's plans prior to it was too late. Listening carefully, the party learned the hidden men had overheard details about the settlement watch's movements. Under those circumstances, Dennis and Frida clarified it seemed common for such adventurers to interact with the watch when dealing with goblins. The party clarified that goblins solely became a hazard when grouped. Under those circumstances, as long as elites weren't involved, low-ranking adventurers seemed enough. At that moment, Asakura suspected the circumstances wasn't that simple. A larger force might be required if further goblins emerged. He recognized a recognizable pattern, frail threats employed to lower defenses just like what had happened in Torreno. A diagram revealed the raiders' strategy: lure goblins, stir panic, infiltrate adventurer groups, and assess the settlement before attacking. Asakura and the party realized the raiders were advised to avoid the Beltram convoy and instead hit the opposite side. Karina then clarified that the opposition wasn't aware of the trap, they were just proceeding cautiously to avoid suspicion. Asakura's appeal, Frida employed sorcery to amplify nearby voices. The man paid attention cautiously, straining to catch pieces of conversation. The eavesdrop dialogue disclosed their unease. Beltram's convoy wasn't moving, and the settlement watch had started acting strangely. Asakura suggested Alicia use wind magic to eavesdrop on the raiders, who were puzzled by the Beltram convoy's presence in the settlement. The raiders speculated the convoy was spooked by the assault on Torreno, a village they had previously raided. In the meantime, with a smug expression, one of them recalled how they slaughtered everyone during that ambush without resistance. Under those circumstances, frustration grew as the convoy remained stationary. One questioned for a scheme, while another cautioned things could get complicated if Beltram didn't leave. Surprisingly, they saw an opportunity instead if the guildmaster was present. This raid could surpass their last. The party paid attention, and as some bandits debated the threat level, one insisted the settlement's defenses were too powerful. Regardless of warnings, others mocked the concern, noting only two foes had shown strength, one being a B-rank sorcerer Confident stood as they disclosed their side gripped 5 B-rank mages, causing visible concern among the listeners. In the meantime, Karina then acknowledged the balance of strength. Under those circumstances, a clash against equally skilled opponents now seemed inevitable. Tension spread through the party as 5 formidable B-rank mages approached. Daichi silently assessed the circumstances, recognizing the party's overconfidence. Under those circumstances, cautious, a scarred man advised holding back. At this point, their foes seemed too unpredictable. Under those circumstances, indeed from afar, their presence stirred unease in seasoned fighters. Recollecting a past encounter, the man recalled the unusual abilities employed. One fighter possessed cast unknown sorcery that defied explanation. Regardless of assuming it was simple earth sorcery, he recognized he'd been shot with condensed lead, a technique he'd never seen before. In the meantime, indeed, with enchanted gear, the shot pierced across. Such overwhelming strength was uncommon, and Daichi's smug confidence disclosed he recognized exactly who was behind it. The party recalled past injuries, mocking how others underestimated the same youth. At that moment, multiple victims possessed previously lost limbs because of him. Despite the bravado, they recognized a pattern. The assailants in the settlement were clearly low-ranked. Under those circumstances, commands seemed issued to regroup and contact reinforcements in the cave. Under those circumstances, their leader dismissed the circumstances with indifference, setting a deadline for the next move. Under those circumstances, at rear the laughter, tension remained. In the meantime, close by, 2 hidden companions observed silently. At that moment, with a signal, they withdrew from the tall grass, preparing for what seemed next. At this point, the woods grew quiet. In the meantime, the cave loomed forward, concealed among dense trees, waiting for the next confrontation to begin. In the meantime, within the cave, a gathering of mercenaries and warriors formed surrounding the cracked stone wall, their tension unspoken but clear. At this point, doubt grew as reports spread Alan's squad possessed failed miserably. At this point, the brat and his guard ally possessed shattered their confidence. Only the young woman had a visible mage ID, but those present knew the youth was the real threat. Indeed, Alan's fighters feared him more than a B-rank sorcerer. With uncertainty hanging in the air, the party awaited Joseph's choice. At this point, silence lingered prior to anyone dared to speak. In the meantime, concerns about the Beltram company seemed raised, but others insisted their numbers seemed enough to win if overconfidence didn't doom them first. At that moment, a heated exchange broke out. Concerns over the opposition's B-rank sorcerer were met with prideful defiance. At this point, tension among the party grew. At this point, the leader eventually snapped, silencing the bickering with a sharp command. Discipline came. Back, if solely for the instant. Elsewhere, a strategist steadily assessed the circumstances. At this point, the movement of the settlement watch hinted at greater involvement, possibly drawing the Beltram company's attention. At that moment, the possibility of a trap started to surface. At that moment, the leader paid attention, piecing together the implications at rear the calm warning. With the guildmaster's convoy nearby, and the target's reputation for justice, a coordinated ambush seemed not only likely but already in place. As strategic positions were discussed, the opposition noted the Beltram company's camp near the south gate, while the settlement watch focused on the north. The party planned to assault from the north, baiting the Beltram forces into a reaction just as Alan's party had assumed would happen. Whereas some proposed looting swiftly, others debated eliminating the watch entirely to maximize their plunder, even if it meant risking more. One man, thinking forward, warned of possible reinforcements and traps, suspecting the opposition had already planned for a confrontation. At this point, driven by greed, others pressed to take everything: individuals, merchandise, and convoy cargo all in one bold strike, unaware of the dangers waiting. Under those circumstances, doubt crept into the chamber. The mention of a B-rank sorcerer and the strength of the Beltram convoy stirred concern among the party. Their leader confronted Peter, demanding his judgment while others questioned the shaken reports from Alan's squad. At that moment, Peter advised against direct confrontation. Under those circumstances, acknowledging their foe's strength, he emphasized minimizing losses and avoiding reckless engagement. He proposed a tactic: if an assault was necessary, it must be swift and unforeseen. Under those circumstances, the element of surprise might be their edge. With calm confidence, he detailed the strategy: strike the north side first, eliminate the settlement watch quickly, and open the path forward. At that moment, the party debated scenarios. If the watch defended the settlement directly, they'd be distracted an opportunity to strike where it harmed most. In the meantime, Peter cautioned them not to assume favorable reactions. The settlement watch seemed cautious and likely to secure the civilians early. At that moment, others insisted they'd nevertheless have to deal with the convoy afterward, thinking a divided defense might be easier to exploit. Under those circumstances, Peter dismissed that logic, calling them foolish. He recognized the opposition wouldn't split forces carelessly. Instead, their defense might buy period enough for the Beltram convoy to respond and complicate any assault. Several proposed a quick raid, steal valuables, and escape prior to the Beltram convoy reached, avoiding direct conflict entirely. Under those circumstances, Peter sighed. The issue wasn't the strategy, it was the people. The man recognized several would get greedy and linger too long. At that moment, overconfident, others laughed it off and planned a southern ambush. Convinced they was able to erase all traces and strike unnoticed, Peter cautioned that facing the convoy head on from the south would be tougher than any fight with the settlement watch. The man emphasized once further, a direct battle would be suicide. In the meantime, if anything, they required a surprise, no confrontation, just a precise strike. Peter brightly declared they'd reached the same ambush tactic, catching others off guard with his abrupt enthusiasm. The man laid out assumptions foe units would likely defend both the South and Settlement Center, requiring cautious coordination. Their true objective seemed to break the Settlement Watch's morale. Under those circumstances, a Northgate assault supported from within might leave villagers vulnerable. With the Beltram unit distracted or overcame, looting the settlement would become effortless before reinforcements could arrive. In simple terms, Peter made it clear the strategy's core was to eliminate the Settlement Watch swiftly and completely. Joseph abruptly recognized the entire scheme they'd been discussing was a fabrication. At that moment, Peter verified with a grin it seemed all leaked on purpose. The chamber dropped silent as Peter readied to reveal the true strategy. Under those circumstances, intrigued, Joseph and his companions urged him to continue. At this point, meanwhile, a meeting unfolded elsewhere. Urgency gripped the city hall as fists hit tables, and decisions seemed forced into motion. Reports detailed the raiders' assault on Terreno Village, prompting officials to coordinate efforts with the Takara Town Hall for a united defense. The agenda concentrated on 2 points: strengthening defenses before the Knights reached, and establishing superior intelligence gathering moving forward. Over a casual meal, the party confirmed the city had accepted their proposed plan. In the meantime, defenses seemed set, with the Beltram Company guarding the south and adventurers at the north. Strategically, the main force would remain near the settlement center, ready to respond from either direction or scale the walls if required. At that moment, the Beltram Company additionally advised relocating southern villagers to safety. In the meantime, suspicious adventurers seemed placed with a watch to monitor them discreetly. Reassured, the leaders committed to the tactic prepared to shoulder the burden of frontline combat. With no superior alternative from the Settlement Council, they took charge, knowing their strategy was now the only line of defense. With preparations finalized, the party stood from their meeting. Their next stop was with the Guildmaster to confirm the operation. Guild leader Klaus reviewed their scheme and offered the command everything would proceed as discussed without delay. At that moment, Dichi then outlined the tactic. At that moment, he, along with Alicia, Karina, Dennis, and Frida, might lead the southern assault under Klaus's command. Meanwhile, the greatest mobile unit, led by Captain Jeffrey, would remain at the settlement center, ready for a swift counterattack. Under those circumstances, alone at camp, Daichi examined his arm. He doubted if indeed a Desert Eagle could break through the opponent's magical defenses. Daichi then reviewed his options, knowing he couldn't identify the B-rank sorcerers effortlessly. At this point, randomly attacking wouldn't work. The man weighed alternate tactics assault rifles and sedative gas. At this point, anti-material rifles might deal with tougher foes from a distance. In the meantime, whereas testing equipment, Daichi received a transmission. Stunned, he recognized the earlier tactic had been a decoy. At this point, the true foe seemed the Beltram Company. Daichi shoved aside distractions, now focused on uncovering and stopping the opposition's hidden plan. At that moment, Daichi then paid attention to the intercepted message. The opposition's words revealed the settlement attack was a decoy. At that moment, their real objective seemed hidden. At this point, the party aimed to strike the Beltram convoy. With its forces split, this rare opportunity allowed them to seize valuable cargo and capture the Guildmaster among the party. A few confirmed they had seen the Guildmaster before. Under those circumstances, identification during the operation wouldn't be a problem. To mislead the defenders, they planted a fake scheme about attacking the settlement watch, ensuring it would reach the right ears. Under those circumstances, the opposition calculated correctly. Reinforcements might focus on the settlement center, leaving the convoy exposed and vulnerable. The party anticipated powerful resistance. The opposition's elite troops were stationed near the convoy, close to the Guildmaster skilled in both tactics and one-on-one combat. At that moment, regardless of the odds, the infiltrators remained confident. In the meantime, with a calm gaze and unified resolve, they assured each other they was able to handle the operation, including confronting the boss himself. At this point, as tension built, they exchanged sharp remarks, half joking but fully alert. They recognized this mission would test their strength further than any previous battle. At this point, their opponents, seeing solely 5 fighters, underestimated them. At that moment, confidence surged among the defenders, believing the numbers favored them. But the infiltrators disclosed their true edge. They were hardly ordinary fighters. The party seemed trained, disciplined, and lethal, active-duty military. At this point, as an extra precaution, the strategists chose to deploy additional members to strengthen their odds. The party gathered silently in a hidden chamber, readied for the signal. In the meantime, shadows advanced with quiet anticipation. Under those circumstances, the party debated whether to unleash their trump card early. Under those circumstances, choosing safety over hesitation, they resolved not to take chances. At this point, a scheme seemed finalized. A false message might be dispatched to Alan's squad, claiming a midnight assault at the north entrance. The decoy seemed readied with detailed intelligence. With everything in place, they set the operation period tomorrow evening. The real strike might begin. Daichi then received a transmission confirming the opposition's approach. The settlement would be assaulted soon. Just as anticipated, a companion reached with urgent news. Captain Jeffrey Possessed obtained intelligence about the assault. Daichi was ordered to report to the Guildmaster immediately. Within the command tent, a letter Possessed previously been delivered. Under those circumstances, its contents might determine their next move. With a firm voice, the guildmaster declared that the raiders would launch their attack that very night. Everyone readied for conflict. Under those circumstances, the letter disclosed critical intel. Captured adventurers had carried messages to foe infiltrators, exposing the settlement's defensive placement. The guildmaster revealed the opposition's main objective: destroy the village watch with full force from the north. It became clear that the raiders intended to eliminate threats one at a period. Following the settlement watch, their next target would be the main camp. Daichi and his companions questioned the opposition's precision. In the meantime, the tactics seemed too structured further, like trained military tactics, than those of ordinary bandits. At that moment, without delay, commands seemed issued. The mobile unit might reinforce the settlement watch. Daichi's squad seemed dispatched to the north to strike back. Whereas several advanced to the front lines, others remained to protect the guild, determined to hold their ground. The guildmaster reassured everyone that the guild had capable personnel who could defend themselves if necessary. A proposal seemed created to leave Karina at rear for extra protection. With her guarding the guild, his companions could focus on reinforcing the settlement. Daichi then recognized this seemed a mistake. Intelligence disclosed that 5B rank mages were among the opposition, and holding Karina back would weaken their main force. Under those circumstances, urgently, Daichi hurried to alert guild leader Klaus. In the meantime, the risk of splitting their strength seemed too great to ignore. The man cautioned that leaving the south undefended could lead to disaster. At that moment, the circumstances required immediate reconsideration. Daichi then declared that everything happening was part of the opposition's design. At this point, the man activated a recording device on the table, grabbing everyone's attention. The playback disclosed a shocking truth. The opposition had intentionally leaked the false plan to bait the Beltram company into a trap. As the voices played, the guildmaster and others finally understood. Daichi's evidence proved the opposition's deception seemed deeper than expected. Under those circumstances, the recording likely exposed the real tactic. Some paid attention steadily, while others braced themselves, realizing the hazard was far more organized. Though confused by the device, the guildmaster focused on what mattered: the urgent need to act before it was too late. Daichi disclosed that the opposition's conversation had taken place recently. The raiders were already approaching from the forest south of the settlement. In the meantime, alarmed by the urgency, he shouted a warning. The opposition had reached. Under those circumstances, reports came in swiftly. Conflict possessed erupted at the north gate. A signal flare verified the opposition's aggressive move. With tension rising, Daichi gripped his ground. While others hesitated, he declared he had a scheme to counter the assault. His tactic was simple: turn the opposition's tactics against them. Under those circumstances, a direct response using their own deception might shift the tide. The strategy was to strike the raiders from both flanks during their approach from the south. To succeed, they had to appear as if nevertheless following the opposition's expectations. A decoy party of watchmen and disguised civilians would move towards the north gate, drawing attention away from the real move. Meanwhile, the guildmaster would remain visible in the square, serving as bait to maintain the illusion. Daichi's squad of 5 would leave silently and set up an ambush, ready to launch a surprise attack from the rear. Even if their attack failed, it would still buy the guildmaster time to retreat safely. As the raiders advanced, the squad debated whether to recall troops from the north. Daichi then reminded them no scheme seemed without risk. Even with the opposition's sorcerers, the Beltram forces could likely hold, if needed. They could intercept the opposition at the settlement center, buying time for support. At that moment, confidence sparked. But the suggestion didn't convince everyone. At this point, not all concerns seemed tactical. Some doubted the guildmaster would agree. Others felt the tactic overlooked deeper implications beyond combat. Daichi then clarified, letting bandits into the center unchecked might shift their goal from assault to abduction. Daichi warned that letting the raiders enter would risk more than just the guildmaster. They might take remaining villagers as hostages. When questioned about their chances against the opposition's main force, Daichi calmly responded that he had a secret weapon. Under those circumstances, skepticism trailed. In the meantime, was able to his hidden asset truly defeat 60 bandits and multiple B-rank sorcerers? With assurance, Daichi declared he would neutralize every foe and capture them alive, shocking everyone in the room. At that moment, regardless of his certainty, concern grew. His comrades believed he was underestimating the hazard and taking the circumstances too lightly. In the meantime, his companions remained skeptical. In the meantime, capturing bandits alive sounded indeed further unrealistic than defeating them outright. In the meantime, proof seemed demanded. Daichi acknowledged he couldn't demonstrate it instantly, but disclosed his trump card, a concealed secret weapon. Later, as the squad regrouped outdoors the settlement, Daichi noted how guild leader Klaus had hesitated to include Alicia in the strike team. But Alicia reasoned logically her destructive sorcery was finest employed away from civilians. In the meantime, her calm argument won Klaus over. At this point, as evening neared, Daichi grew cautious, judging from others' reactions. Alicia's assault sorcery had a wide and formidable range. Daichi clarified his backup plan. If rendering the opposition powerless failed, he would use an assault rifle. He told his companions to retreat if things became too perilous. In the meantime, Alicia, smiling, volunteered to stay at rear and help with the mowing down, showing no hesitation. Karina then declined to retreat either, insisting she'd stay until backup was required and would drag Daichi out herself if necessary. Though Daichi acted relaxed, His companions reminded him that sorcery skill wasn't enough. Under those circumstances, experience and caution seemed equally crucial. Karina emphasized the hard reality. Overconfidence had concluded many talented sorcerers at this point. Daichi then possessed to stay sharp. Daichi quoted an aged saying from his world: knowing both yourself and the opposition removes fear from any number of battles. At this point, although several struggled to grasp the meaning, others admired his insight. The man clarified, with accurate knowledge of both sides, indeed constant conflict could be endured. At that moment, their scheme relied on that extremely principle. By using the opposition's tactic against them, they could achieve swift capture. In the meantime, regardless of understanding his logic, Karina summoned him out. His scheme, although clever, nevertheless reeked of recklessness. At that moment, Daichi then sensed their doubt. At that moment, lacking experience, he feared they witnessed him as just a knave, privileged outsider. Under those circumstances, Daichi then felt no fear. Although inexperienced in real combat, his knowledge from books and tactic guides offered him confidence. As the opposition neared, the team prepared. Karina commanded Alicia to strengthen herself with sorcery as they shut in. Under those circumstances, Daichi then observed the distance. The opponent seemed almost in range, but something felt wrong. There were beyond expectations. At this point, from the shadows, 6 enormous king apes emerged, joining the advancing bandits, complicating the planned ambush. Daichi's party gripped his ground as a mob of armed bandits surged forward, beasts snarling behind them. Tension stood as masked foes rushed with overwhelming numbers. At this point, in the midst of chaos, Daichi and his companions exchanged sharp glances. The hazard wasn't just fighters, it was the king apes that concerned them. At that moment, one maiden sensed the reality: 66 bandits and 6 controlled beasts. Daichi then recognized this wasn't just a random assault, it was a tactical assault. At moment, Klaus urged retreat, gauging the opposition's strength. At that moment, the sheer count possessed shaken their confidence. But Daichi advanced ahead, charged with resolve. The man had a scheme, and he would hold the line. Daichi stayed composed, confident in his scheme. He declared that further foes simply meant he'd use further firepower. In the meantime, his optimism startled his companions. Alicia astonished the party by stepping forward. She chose to stay with Daichi, catching his companions off guard with her choice. She clarified her magic was limited near the settlement, but her physical enhancements were enough to fight. In the meantime, her cheerful tone clashed with the tense instant. Karina attempted to reassert control, but Alicia's quick calculation of the opposition's distance left no room for delay. Under those circumstances, with retreat no longer possible, Karina commanded the squad into formation. They readied to face the opposition head. Dennis and Frida approved the strategy. In the meantime, with blades ready, they acknowledged their trust in Daichi's judgment without pausing. Daichi held his ground and optimistic, signaling the opposition's approach distance. At this point, the gap shut 600 meters. Under those circumstances, the countdown possessed begun. At this point, at 500 meters, Daichi offered the next signal. At that moment, everyone locked gaze, tension mounting. Alicia then and his companions readied their positions. At this point, Daichi then knelt and concentrated. Under those circumstances, the man lifted 4 fingers, his calm gestures masking the storm about to unfold. Under those circumstances, the squad stood by, alert. At that moment, the opposition drew nearer. Under those circumstances, Daichi then lowered a finger. Under those circumstances, 3. The raiders were in sight, and the clash was moments away from erupting. As the raiders shut to 200 meters, Daichi's nerves spiked. The man questioned whether his timing would hold if his tactic failed. Without pausing, he triggered the strategy. Under those circumstances, a volley of stun grenades launched skyward, scattering above the opposition ranks. At that moment, a blinding flash burst throughout the field. At this point, the explosion of light and sound disrupted the advancing force, halting their momentum instantly. Daichi then observed cautiously, peeking from cover. At this point, confident the impact possessed landed, he reached for his next move, staying composed. At this point, on the combat field, chaos erupted. Under those circumstances, foes clutched their gaze and ears, disoriented. The tactic had worked. Daichi's trap struck first. At that moment, the dust settled. At this point, bandits lay incapacitated throughout the field. Daichi then raised his palm slightly, uncertain if it seemed truly over. As his companions confirmed the fallen enemies, Karina looked toward Daichi in astonishment. His actions departed even his squad puzzled. Without fuss, Daichi lightly instructed them to secure the raiders. Under those circumstances, his composure clashed with the astonishment in their gaze. To ensure no one escaped, Daichi readied additional device this period, a net. The squad observed as he steadily initiated the next step. At this point, but prior to he was able to finish, a loud roar shook the air. Under those circumstances, a monstrous king ape lunged from at rear. Daichi's instant of peace vanished instantly. In the meantime, the king ape rushed furiously, smashing across debris with wild force. Daichi then barely reacted in period as its enormous frame loomed closer. Karina then and his companions shouted for Daichi to retreat. Under those circumstances, the hazard seemed too close, and they weren't ready to risk his safety. In the meantime, indeed, Alicia urged him to fall back as the ape's rampage grew further erratic. At that moment, confusion spread. The beast didn't indeed seem to recognize companion from foe, but Daichi gripped his ground. He signaled he was fine and confronted face the beast directly, his eyes locked with resolve. Under those circumstances, with flame in his grasp, additional ally stepped in, launching an explosive counter. At this point, the king ape seemed engulfed in flames mid-charge. Under those circumstances, Karina then slashed fiercely at the king ape, her blade cutting deep. In the meantime, the beast reeled but gripped its ground with unnatural endurance. The squad realized the threat these apes were wearing enchanted gear. At this point, indeed, flames couldn't pierce their defenses. At that moment, Frida missed her strike, leaving Daichi directly in the monster's path. With no period departed, the ape rushed again. Daichi then stayed composed. He advanced ahead and declared he'd handle it, activating a hidden device with precision. In the meantime, in an instant, Daichi unleashed his strength. At this point, the beast stumbled under the force, halted mid-charge as Daichi stood unshaken. Daichi then verified the anti-material rifle's strength. It could kill the king apes. Under those circumstances, without pausing, he vowed to handle the rest himself. As additional ape rushed, Daichi readied. At this point, Karina then stood ready, watching him closely as the monster shut the distance. In the meantime, a well-placed shot tore into the ape's chest. At that moment, the enchanted armor failed to protect it. In the meantime, shock filled its wide gaze. In the meantime, everyone paused. At this point, one shot possessed been enough. Karina stared in astonishment as Daichi reloaded steadily, eyes sharp and focused. At this point, additional beast emerged in the distance. But now, they recognized Daichi seemed further than ready. Daichi then remained composed as additional king ape dropped. In the meantime, with solely 3 departed, his focus sharpened. The man assessed the circumstances. The enchanted gear was tougher than expected. Solely direct shots across the mouth possessed any effect. In the meantime, adjusting his aim, he fired precisely. Additional beasts staggered from the impact, collapsing under the concentrated assault. In the meantime, Alicia then observed in awe, stunned by Daichi's calm efficiency. Whereas others hesitated, he displayed no hesitation in eliminating the hazard. At that moment, Daichi then announced 2 foes remained. In the midst of chaos, he remained collected, commanding his companions to secure the raiders while he handled the rest. Daichi then steadily readied his final move. At this point, the last king ape growled, its blurry vision locking onto him from a distance. The man verified it was the last target. As the beast clutched a fallen fighter, Daichi moved ahead with assurance. In the meantime, an abrupt magical burst erupted. Under those circumstances. Multiple fireballs exploded surrounding him, catching everyone off guard. At that moment, one blast hit Daichi directly. Shock and panic spread through the party as he collapsed, wounded in the final instant. Daichi carried a direct hit to the chest, sending him crashing to the ground as his companions observed in shock. The opposition's abrupt attack had caught them off guard. At that moment, wounded Daichi gritted his teeth and attempted to rise. Sorcery ropes fired from behind him, forcing the opposition to retreat momentarily. At that moment, the defenders braced themselves. One ally realized the threat escalating fast, panic rising with each step the opponents advanced. Alicia advanced ahead, fire magic swirling in both hands. In the meantime, Daichi then sensed her intent from the ground, warning bells going off in his mind. At this point, desperate, he shouted to stop her, knowing the cost. Alicia pushed forward without pausing, shielding Daichi as he attempted to recover. Determined, she confronted the threat head, ons sharp with resolve. As the circumstances worsened, an ally summoned for retreat. Daichi, still injured, was pulled back with Alicia, the party escaping the combat field together. At that moment, once at a safe distance, Daichi checked on Alicia. The woman reassured him, her enchanted gear having guarded her from harm during the clash. Meanwhile, additional fighter recognized a critical error. He possessed forgotten to enchant his own gear, frustrated at his own lapse in awareness. Regardless of his wounds, Daichi insisted on helping his companions. Alicia pleaded for him to rest, but he declined, concentrated on stopping the hazard. In the meantime, Alicia then leaned over Daichi, determined to treat his injury. In the meantime, her grave expression silenced his protests as she commenced healing him. Daichi sat up in astonishment, noticing the injury was completely gone. In the meantime, puzzled, he questioned how it healed so swiftly. He recognized it was Nike, his little companion, who had cast high-level liquid magic. The cat's strength was able to mend indeed severe injuries instantly. Under those circumstances, Alicia then seemed stunned by the revelation. She hadn't expected Daichi's ally to possess such uncommon, formidable sorcery. At that moment, Daichi then remained modest, downplaying his skills, but urgency came. Back, the battle with the raiders wasn't over yet. Daichi then observed as Karina and Frida launched a coordinated strike, pushing the opposition forces back with precision. Despite impairments, the opposition sorcerers used magic to track their targets. Their reaction period displayed they were B-rank combatants, skilled and perilous. Daichi regrouped with his companions, calling out to his companions and assuring them he'd handle what remained. The man sprinted forward without pausing. Worried for his condition, his companions shouted after him. Daichi failed to stop, fully concentrated on the hazard ahead. Under those circumstances, facing a desperate attacker, Daichi countered without mercy, striking fast and hard to end the battle. One of the assailants was hurled across the combat field, screaming as a vortex spell launched him skyward with brutal force. In response, 2 foe sorcerers formed a barrage of flame spells. Under those circumstances, the ground shattered under the pressure of their concentrated assault. Daichi rushed forward, steadily activating his storage ability midair. Magical debris flew surrounding him as he shoved across the chaos. In the meantime, with precise timing, he hit both foes in close quarters. At this point, his blows landed swiftly, giving them no chance to counter. At this point, standing tall, Daichi stared down the last opponents. In the meantime, his arms glinted, ready for the final confrontation. Under those circumstances, the ground trembled as a formidable spell detonated. One foe was blasted backward, whereas another readied a retaliatory strike with growing tension. Daichi advanced ahead with a precise stance. At this point, a phantom image mirrored his movements, channeling energy for a concentrated magical assault. The man unleashed the incantation at close range. The opposition's expression twisted in shock as strength surged toward him without warning. In the meantime, the blast hit its mark. Under those circumstances, the force knocked the opponent off his feet, ending the clash. In the meantime, observers stared in astonishment at Daichi's decisive blow. At this point, afterward, Daichi assured his companions he seemed fine. With liquid sorcery, he had previously healed his wound. At this point, the battle seemed over for now. In the meantime, Karina then softly checked Daichi's wound, astonished to find it completely healed. At that moment, the effectiveness of his sorcery departed her speechless. Additional ally questioned whether Alicia had done the healing, only to learn Daichi had restored himself. At this point, the man downplayed it with a casual smile. Under those circumstances, abruptly, Karina erupted, yelling at Daichi for worrying her so much. At this point, embarrassed, he was able to solely apologize. Under those circumstances, Frida interrupted the instant, reminding them to restrain the remaining bandits. Daichi then consented, prioritizing the task at Palmen. The meantime, as the squad regrouped, Karina insisted on having a grave talk later. The clash was over, but emotions still rushed high. Alicia then stepped beside Daichi, silently expressing that she too seemed upset. Under those circumstances, her tone carried further weight than he expected. At that moment, facing him directly, she acknowledged her frustration. Daichi, stunned, recognized the depth of her concern during the clash. The woman pleaded with him not to scare her anew. Under those circumstances, Daichi then apologized, promising to be further careful from now on. In the meantime, as Karina restrained the captured bandits, Daichi reflected on his mistakes. The man had spoken assuredly prior to but lacked full understanding. At this point, the man acknowledged his failure, forgetting to enchant his gear, underestimating the opposition. His recklessness possessed nearly cost everything. Daichi then reflected on the instant the fireball hit him. The sheer shock of it, nevertheless, dispatched chills down his spine. A reminder of how close he came to peril. His teammates surrounded him with excitement, impressed at how he possessed neutralized the enchanted foes. The party praised his quick thinking and strength. In the meantime, Daichi then acknowledged his flaws. The man got carried away, failed to pace himself, and underestimated the King Ape's strength and the B-rank sorcerers. Despite his humility, the party proceeded praising him, impressed by how he regained control in a critical moment. In the meantime, overwhelmed by the attention, Daichi blushed awkwardly. Under those circumstances, Alicia then beamed and cheered him on, urging him to keep improving. Under those circumstances, Karina then acknowledged Daichi's strength, but reminded him he acted recklessly. At that moment, additional teammate joked that his heroics seemed almost romantic. At this point, Daichi then cradled Nike, admitting he owed his survival to the cat. The man carried full responsibility for his carelessness. In the meantime, others chimed in, defending his actions. They noted adventurers often conceal their full abilities and praised his magical restraint, despite the hazard. At that moment, Daichi then apologized for hiding his strength, but Karina forgave him. The raiders possessed been successfully restrained, and the crisis was under control. Karina carried command, announcing they would escort the captives to the South Settlement Square with their little 5-member team. At this point, Karina then cautioned the captured bandits against resistance, her sharp gaze silencing them instantly. Under those circumstances, none dared to argue as they nodded in fear. With the hazard contained, the party rested. Under those circumstances, the knights might arrive in 4 days to process the arrests. Until then, the settlement watch commenced interrogations. The raiders possessed staged the scene to look like a goblin infestation. Several prisoners seemed disclosed to be foreigners. Under those circumstances, regardless of suspicions of military ties, no solid evidence linked them to any feudal lord. Guild leader Klaus proposed the assailants were foreign operatives sent to destabilize the border, not common criminals. As the convoy resumed travel, the party departed behind tense borderlands. At that moment, villagers waved them off with relief, although unease lingered in the air. Daichi then yawned. Whereas riding, glad for the promise of an inn that evening, Alicia then informed him that Karam seemed just forward. The man peeked from the carriage to see a city in the distance, intrigued about their destination, Karam. The second largest city near the border seemed a prime hub for novel merchants. At that moment, 20 days east lay the commercial city of Byron. At that moment, Karina then announced their schedule. At this point, they'd remain in Karam for 10 days prior to departing for the royal capital. A long journey nevertheless awaited them. Karina questioned whether Daichi had created up his mind. Although Klaus presented to take him to the capital, Alicia possessed invited him to stay. Under those circumstances, Daichi then smiled, choosing to follow his original scheme. The man would open a store in Karam, just as he envisioned. At that moment, Alicia then reminded him of his dream to trade with multiple countries. At that moment, Karam, at the border, seemed the perfect place. Daichi then acknowledged her remarks, realizing how far he possessed come. At that moment, his dream seemed beginning to take shape. Under those circumstances, Karina, supportive as ever, encouraged him warmly. At that moment, Daichi's journey seemed solely just beginning. Under those circumstances, Daichi then shared his scheme to start as a humble street vendor. Karina raised an eyebrow, intrigued what peculiar products he planned to sell. the man promised to solely offer approved merchandise. In the meantime, Karina then remained suspicious, teasing him about her lack of trust. At that moment, jokingly, they compared him to a child. Alicia agreed, wearing a smile, noting how unpredictable he could be. At this point, their playful teasing proceeded. Daichi acknowledged he was reckless, while his companions insisted even kids had more restraint. Under those circumstances, undeterred, Daichi invited them to help him and Alicia set up store, hoping for guidance and support. Karina consented to help set up the store, but only if Daichi bought her sweets. Alicia swiftly accompanied in, smiling brightly at the concept. The party proceeded through town, chatting cheerfully as Karina rode beside the carriage. At this point, excitement built as they neared their destination. The party reached at a bustling city street near an inn. Daichi then stepped out and surveyed the area, taking in the vibrant surroundings. At that moment, following a fine stretch, he felt fully recharged. In the meantime, with Nike perched on his shoulder, he declared himself ready to begin. In the meantime, elsewhere, a mysterious message on a desk caught someone's attention, hinting at incidents yet to unfold. At that moment, a cheerful maiden bursts onto the scene, sensing the presence of a novel customer. At this point, her enthusiasm fills the air instantly. Daichi extended his palm, sealing a deal that marked the beginning of his journey in a novel city. The merchant resolutely came, backed the handshake, confident that Daichi's modern products might thrive in the royal capital's market. After 10 days in Karam, the Beltram convoy departed, leaving at recognizable confronts and mixed emotions among the townspeople. A local woman warmly wished Daichi success as he prepared to establish his stall, offering support, wearing a smile and a handshake. At this point, Daichi, looking forward, planned to gain experience here prior to expanding to the capital, determined to grow step by step. As Daichi pondered his next steps, someone lightly suggested Piran, stirring curiosity and concern among the party. In the meantime, the city of Piran, bustling with commerce and controlling key trade routes, stood as the second largest in the kingdom. Daichi weighed the concept gravely. Although Piran seemed promising, he acknowledged the strategy was still far off and bid farewell with a cheerful tone. In the meantime, Karina, watching him go, voiced her worry. The woman recognized his ambitions but feared he might take reckless risks without support. Regardless of her concerns, Daichi remained unfazed, recognizing the reality in her remarks, yet determined to keep moving forward. At that moment, Karina then recalled past incidents where Daichi acted recklessly, reminding him of his carelessness with bandits and settlement punks. Daichi attempted to lighten the mood, asking for forgiveness, whereas playfully holding up his cat to ease the tension. Regardless of her teasing, Karina cautioned him to stay alert, acknowledging his skills but reminding him that this world remained unknown. Confident, Daichi promised to grow stronger and further dependable, assuring them he might prove his reliability when they met anew. At that moment, as Karina readied to escort the convoy, she planned for future trade, expecting success from Daichi's products and a swift return. Under those circumstances, Karina then presented a firm handshake, reminding Daichi that she expected him to grow capable in her absence. Prior to parting, he handed her a bag containing cake, advising her to eat it swiftly prior to it spoiled. At this point, the sweet gift drew attention from others close, by prompting Daichi to assure them he possessed enough to share. Pleased by the treat, the party suggested adding cake to the product lineup, imagining strong demand across the capital. At that moment, regardless of the enthusiasm, Daichi hesitated, knowing poor storage was able to risk illness and damage his business's reputation. Under those circumstances, concerns about provision safety lingered. Everyone consented that indeed one noble falling ill was able to cause chaos and suspicion. At this point, with a teasing grin, one of the watchmen hinted Karina might need to return soon, not just for trade. At moment, abruptly, their departure seemed announced, catching Karina off guard as she scrambled to prepare. Under those circumstances, the woman climbed into the carriage without delay. Under those circumstances, the wheels commenced turning, signaling the convoy's journey possessed officially begun. In the meantime, waving goodbye, Karina promised to return in 2 months. In the meantime, Daichi, smiling assuredly, vowed to become someone unrecognizable by then. With a gentle smile, Karina expressed her anticipation, her horse already in motion as she rode off. Daichi then observed the convoy disappear prior to turning back to his tasks, ready to begin his solo venture in Karam. In the meantime, days passed swiftly. Alicia went off on her own errands, whereas Daichi finalized the store property with the Merchant Guild. At this point, excited, he promised his cat Nike a cozy novel home edition, completely forgetting the little one's meows of impatience. At that moment, thanks to product deposits and bounty rewards, he possessed enough funds to settle the property and live comfortably for now. Daichi then beamed with joy, thinking how much his life possessed changed from being jobless to thriving in an additional world. Where he's exploring the city, he admired the open plaza, moving forward with excitement and spring in his step. The man reached at the Merchant Guild, confident in their reliable support as he readied to formalize the property deal. At this point, entering the guild structure, he greeted everyone within with energy, his cat meowing softly beside him. Under those circumstances, Melissa, the sales rep, welcomed him warmly. The woman guided him upstairs and questioned to go over a few final details. Melissa delivered up troubling rumors of someone recklessly firing offensive magic in Lint Forest, near the city's south gate. She clarified the woods was frequented by beginners and locals, making such behavior dangerous and disruptive. Then, with a knowing smirk, she disclosed Daichi possessed been seen in the area at the period of the incidents. Taken by surprise, Daichi admitted to practicing magic, but insisted he had chosen a remote spot to avoid civilians. He swiftly added that another person, a maiden using air magic, had also been there, possibly the real cause of suspicion. Melissa hinted that if the offender possessed been a frail sorcerer, no one would have cared. At that moment, her pointed look stated otherwise. In the meantime, the real complaint described a blast like thunder and trees being toppled, plainly beyond beginner-level sorcery. Daichi abruptly remembered he had tested his M32 grenade launcher in the woods, causing the very destruction they mentioned. Under those circumstances, surprisingly, Melissa didn't scold him. She solely advised caution, although she suspected he wielded strength well beyond a novice, prior to he could relax. She dragged out another document. The next issue involved selling monster parts and sorcery stones. Daichi questioned for confirmation on selling monster materials and sorcery stones, lightly noting they were just small batches. Melissa exploded with disbelief following reviewing his inventory sheet, plainly unconvinced by his definition of little. Under those circumstances, the product list labeled everything as a lot, from fangs to fluids, leaving her demanding an explanation. The woman clarified that bulk materials must go across the Adventurers Guild, not from street level vendors like him. Indeed, with his novel store, the rules stood. Daichi then acknowledged he skimmed the contract, stunned to learn he'd broken protocol. Daichi then questioned for clarification on what little amounts meant, realizing he might have misunderstood the local standards. Melissa clarified that it referred to minor leftovers from casual hunting trips, barely enough for trading following feeding one's family. Under those circumstances, understanding hit him hard. In the meantime, compared to that, his supply seemed plainly overkill. Prior to he could recover, she delivered up his failure to register with the Sorcerers Guild, catching him completely off guard. In the meantime, his excuse dropped flat. At that moment, Melissa shouted in frustration, correcting his false assumption that joining one guild excluded all others. In the meantime, Melissa burst into tears, begging Daichi to ask questions next period, instead of acting on his own. In the meantime, panicking, he swiftly promised to consult her prior to making decisions, pleading with her to stop crying. She sniffled and wiped her expression, gradually calming down while Daichi observed nervously. Abruptly, she muttered about the Sorcerers Guild with glazed gaze, overwhelmed and barely coherent. Under those circumstances, realizing the urgency, Daichi presented to register instantly. At this point, Melissa weakly insisted they go together. Nevertheless, recovering from her meltdown, prior to finalizing the property, Melissa insisted they stop by the Sorcerers Guild, nevertheless wiping away her tears. Walking across the streets, she softly scolded Daichi, reminding him that being from additional country didn't excuse carelessness. Under those circumstances, Karina then chimed in resolutely, urging him to speak up when unsure. Daichi then consented, promising to be further communicative. In the meantime, Melissa threw herself into a dramatic apology, demanding a proper promise. In the meantime, flustered, Daichi offered his word. At this point, realizing she'd assumed too much about his experience, Melissa carried responsibility for the confusion, ready to support him properly. Now, Melissa struggled to carry Daichi in embarrassment, insisting they both reflect and escape. The onlookers stared swiftly. At this point, once hidden in an alley, she checked the surroundings. Under those circumstances, Daichi then sensed something seemed off but stayed quiet as told. With a soft laugh, she acknowledged it seemed tough walking, whereas everyone was watching them. At this point, now she felt superior. At that moment, abruptly, Daichi handed her a huge lollipop, catching her off guard as she blinked in confusion. The man proudly clarified it was candy from his homeland. Under those circumstances, Melissa, stunned by the size, questioned if that truly counted as candy. At this point, Daichi then demonstrated how to eat the candy by licking it, shocking Melissa, who discovered the act too indecent for public. The man enjoyed the sweetness without shame, savoring the taste, whereas she hesitated to follow his lead. Eventually, giving in, Melissa seemed overwhelmed by the flavor, impressed at how refined and delicious it seemed compared to local sweets. Embarrassed but impressed, she silently questioned how much it would cost, unsure if it was indeed affordable. At this point, Daichi then declined payment, telling her it seemed a gift, just something between the two of them. At this point, Melissa reached out for a handshake, accepting Daichi's offer of friendship just as he handed her a pile of candy. At this point, blushing, she hesitated, unsure if it seemed a bribe. Daichi then simply questioned her to teach him further from now on. Reassured and smiling, Melissa gratefully approved, hugging the candy with sparkling gaze as Daichi nodded proudly. At this point, internally, he chuckled to himself. In the meantime, winning her over with sweets possessed been indeed easier than expected. With Melissa content, Daichi felt confident anew, although he plainly hadn't learned his lesson just yet. Melissa questioned whether the youth had been entering Lint Forest alone. He confirmed it without pausing, licking the candy she had just tasted initially. The woman concluded that it created sense. At that moment, possessed he gone with someone from the Beltram Company. He wouldn't have caused such a stir. Under those circumstances, memories of past incidents flashed in her mind. The youth weighed his options. At that moment, the man didn't know anyone else besides Alicia and Melissa. The man promised he would go with someone next period, although unsure who. Under those circumstances, Melissa proposed they check with the Sorcerers Guild. Escort services were often available across the Adventurers Guild for those gathering materials in the woods. The woman cautioned that greatest escorts were low-ranking. The youth expected as much but seemed determined to find someone. The party resumed walking, candy nevertheless in palm. The youth assured Melissa that even low-ranking adventurers could handle the shallow areas of the Lint woodland. She acknowledged she hadn't concerned about it much prior to either. Curious, he questioned whether anything strange had occurred in the woods recently. Melissa, following a pause, verified something unsettling possessed indeed happened. Under those circumstances, prior to she was able to elaborate. A loud noise echoed from the street market, grabbing their attention instantly, reacting swiftly. The youth rushed forward toward the source, determined. In the meantime, Melissa hesitated, astonished by his abrupt burst of action. Realizing she was departed at rear, Melissa sprinted after him, lollipop still in palm. Daichi spotted an abrupt shift in the air as footsteps echoed across the narrow street. He dragged the young woman beside him to safety, while a group of rough men blocked the path ahead. As they neared the market, the onlookers thickened. A tense atmosphere hung surrounding them, with unknown confronts eyeing them cautiously. Within the onlookers, Daichi spotted an elderly lady. The man recognized her instantly and advanced towards her. The woman greeted him lightly, recalling the days their stalls stood side by side. At this point, her presence grounded the instant. In the meantime, regardless of her calmness, tensions remained. The market square possessed changed. Daichi lightly declared a day off, grinning as the old merchant woman watched closely, unimpressed by his carefree attitude. Under those circumstances, the man proudly announced his recent success, claiming he'd earned enough to rest for the entire month without concern. His remarks caught the attention of close-by fighters. In the meantime, their smirks hinted at envy as they mocked his success and hinted at taking advantage. In the meantime, recognizing their type, Daichi drew their focus intentionally. Under those circumstances, intrigued murmurs spread, questioning the newcomer's presence. At that moment, the lady clarified they weren't merchants, just thugs demanding protection funds. Daichi's scheme possessed plainly backfired. The ruffians mocked the aged woman, turning their attention toward Daichi with veiled threats and smirks. At that moment, Daichi then responded with exaggerated confidence, brushing them off with a grin, unfazed by their intimidation. Under those circumstances, his remarks agitated them. One advanced ahead, shoving his companion aside and grabbing Daichi's clothes, anger rising. At this point, the man leaned in, tone low and perilous, warning Daichi that his safety now hung in the balance. Under those circumstances, without pausing, he drew a blade to Daichi's chest. In the meantime, the onlookers froze, tension erupting into stunned gasps and fear. Under those circumstances, Daichi then smiled steadily, agreeing that the outcome rested on him. At this point, his unforeseen composure unsettled his opponent. Tension grew as Daichi spotted the townspeople watching. He recognized the circumstances needed to shift before panic spread further. Under those circumstances, with steady resolve, he tightened his grip and summoned out, challenging the thug's earlier hazard. Without pausing, Daichi hit first. At that moment, his fist landed squarely on the attacker's jaw, knocking him off balance. Under those circumstances, gasps trailed the abrupt impact. Daichi gripped his ground, his clenched fist raised, signaling the confrontation was far from over. Daichi's blow dispatched multiple attackers crashing backward, their bodies collapsing one following additional onto the cobblestones. He faced regroup, but a sharp cry from behind snapped his attention toward the young woman, warning him. Abrupt hazard was launched toward them, but Daichi observed as an unexpected figure intervened with force. Alicia advanced ahead, with unwavering focus, her presence halting the chaos momentarily as Daichi called her name. At that moment, with confident steps, Alicia assessed the scene. The onlookers admired her poise, and Daichi's actions possessed earned their praise. Daichi held his ground, glaring down at the ruffians, while Alicia stood behind him. In the meantime, his challenge silenced their bravado instantly. Under those circumstances, cornered by his confidence, the lead thug denied everything, trembling under the gaze of close by merchants and villagers. The aged merchant praised Daichi's ability, astonished by the true extent of his abilities, her voice filled with approval. Alicia then abruptly cried out, running to the older lady and revealing their connection in front of the stunned crowd. Under those circumstances, worried, Alicia scolded her grandmother, who swiftly turned the lecture back on her, refusing to be treated like a child. Daichi then seemed stunned to learn that Alicia wasn't just related to the aged merchant, she was her great-granddaughter. In the meantime, amused, Daichi joked about the coincidence, but Alicia turned it on him, teasing him for his earlier actions. The woman questioned his habit of getting into peril alone. At this point, Daichi then hesitated, trying to explain away his recklessness. Prior to he could reply, another maiden emerged, calling out his name. Alicia observed curiously as Daichi faced to greet her. With heavy stomps and fierce determination, the novel maiden rushed forward, unaware she was already drawing attention. At that moment, a guild member reached breathless, apologizing and reminding everyone the market seemed under guild protection. At this point, Daichi then nodded in understanding. At this point, the aged lady thanked him warmly, promising to visit later. At that moment, Daichi then modestly insisted it wasn't necessary. Alicia then whispered that once her great-grandmother resolved something, no one was able to change her mind under those circumstances. Daichi then approved it with a sigh. When questioned about his plans, Daichi clarified that he and Melissa were heading to the Mages Guild for business. In the meantime, as they strolled, both girls smiling beside him, Daichi pondered silently why things never seemed to go normally for him. Alicia then clarified that troublemakers posing as adventurers had been increasing over the past month, disrupting peace in the area. Daichi acknowledged he assumed that kind of behavior was normal, whereas Melissa verified the issue had grown noticeable. They learned the issue wasn't limited to frail adventurers, many intermediate and foreign ones were also involved, blending into the flow of refugees. Daichi understood that if danger struck, these unreliable escorts would abandon clients without pausing. Worse still, Alicia cautioned that some might even join the raiders themselves, turning minor threats into serious problems. Daichi then recognized the guild's growing reliance on shady adventurers could threaten its extremely reputation and stability. He weighed retreating to solo work in the woods, but Alicia warned there were even more serious issues. As they strolled, she clarified that disappearances had become more frequent, lately dozens of cases reported. The greatest alarming detail seemed that the missing individuals were mostly children. 10 reported just within the last 2 weeks. At that moment, Alicia then lowered her tone. At this point, the pattern seemed clear. At this point, these weren't accidents. At that moment, the children seemed being kidnapped. Melissa clarified that the 10 reported kidnappings likely underrepresented the reality cases in slums or orphanages could double that number. At that moment, Daichi then seemed reminded of his status: wealthy, connected, and highly visible, making him a potential target as well. The woman added that being a foreigner without family solely increased his vulnerability in the current climate. Daichi then attempted to lighten the mood, proudly declaring his strength. At this point, but deep down he grasped their concern. Both girls scolded him together, emphasizing that even strong people fall when taken by surprise. At this point, the man shouldn't be alone. Daichi then assured the girls he grasped the risks and promised to be careful, although they remained wary. He mentioned needing to visit the Sorcerers Guild before heading into the woods. Alicia clarified that bodyguards should be trusted sorcerers. Daichi then recognized how selective the Sorcerers Guild was. Unlike the Adventurers Guild, it didn't accept just anyone. The party verified that all legitimate sorcerers must be registered. At this point, Alicia then excused herself, flustered by Daichi's stare, saying she possessed errands to handle. Under those circumstances, Daichi then questioned who introduced him to the guild. At that moment, it turned out to be Karina Kirsha, not who he expected. Daichi was stunned to hear Karina. The gluttonous maiden he recognized was actually a noble and a rank B mage. The man processed the revelation silently, his expression shifting from disbelief to quiet resignation. His shock came back full force. How could that identical food-obsessed maiden be a count's daughter? Arriving at the Sorcerers Guild, Alicia clarified that Karina's status meant Daichi's request for a guard would likely be accepted. Under those circumstances, the trio stepped within, greeted by a quiet interior. At this point, Alicia then brightly announced their arrival to the staff within. Daichi stepped in the guild hall, astonished by how modest it glanced. Alicia clarified that the Sorcerers Guild valued function over form. The woman hinted at what lay forward, leaving Daichi uncertain at that moment. Whatever awaited, he'd soon see for himself. Daichi then reached at the Sorcerers Guild, escorted by his companions. In the meantime, the receptionist greeted them as they requested his registration. At this point, during the process, the guild staff questioned for a letter of recommendation. In the meantime, Daichi then glanced puzzled, unsure what they meant. In the meantime, following a brief pause, he recalled the sealed envelope. The man possessed carelessly stored it in his item box and forgotten about it. At that moment, the receptionist unsealed the letter and froze in shock. It disclosed that Lady Karina Kirsha possessed written the recommendation. Daichi stayed composed, while others reacted in astonishment. At that moment, Karina's name carried unforeseen weight. Another letters surfaced, this time not official, but from the guildmaster of the prestigious Beltram Company, causing raised eyebrows. In the meantime, the guild clerk reeled in shock upon hearing the name, overwhelmed as further documents seemed handed over. In the meantime, additional letters emerged, each signed by respected B-rank sorcerers at this point. One indeed came directly from the warrior himself, confirming Daichi's growing support. At that moment, the clerk scanned everything uneasily. At this point, a noble's daughter, a formidable merchant guild, and 3 seasoned sorcerers, all backing one newcomer. At that moment, curiosity spread. With whispers rising, the clerk leaned closer and silently questioned the youth's identity. Under those circumstances, the clerk leaned in, asking about Daichi's identity in the meantime. His companion simply deflected the inquiry, keeping things vague. Daichi then neared the counter and hesitated, whereas filling out the form. Under those circumstances, with help from his companions, he departed several parts blank. At this point, once completed, he handed the form back. At that moment, the clerk, rushing to check it, stumbled dramatically, whereas trying to remain composed. Recovering swiftly, the clerk apologized for the delay and courteously thanked Daichi for his patience, whereas reviewing the details. Under those circumstances, just then, a fluffy cat emerged. The clerk stared in awe, puzzled by the peculiar breed and its abrupt presence. At this point, the fluffy cat sat silently, its presence oddly intense. The clerk, plainly unsettled, summoned it adorable but was unable to shake the tension. Nevertheless, flipping across paperwork, the clerk was anew startled. The circumstances seemed becoming increasingly confusing. The cat started to float midair, drawing skeptical glances. Daichi then lightly dismissed the behavior, insisting it seemed just a normal kitty. His companion whispered a logical explanation. No formidable party might travel with a monster. Under those circumstances, the clerk, convinced, nodded in agreement. In the meantime, trying to refocus, the clerk came back to Daichi's application at this point. But now, he hesitated, unsure what he seemed truly dealing with. At that moment, the clerk examined the form. Under those circumstances, it seemed barely filled solely a name, age, and a mention of the cat. Daichi then claimed inconvenient details were finest departed out. At this point, trying to remain polite, Daichi submitted the form. His companion glanced irritated, whereas the clerk sighed deeply and approved it. At this point, whispers stirred at rear the counter. In the meantime, questions arose about Daichi's missing nationality and birthplace, which indeed travelers usually disclosed. At this point, pressed for replies. His companion deflected the interrogation, suggesting they ask Daichi directly. At that moment, the clerk hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Overwhelmed by Daichi's high-profile endorsements, the clerk eventually snapped. There seemed no way he could inquiry someone with that kind of backing. In the meantime, frustrated, Daichi's companion snapped at the clerk, demanding he stop nitpicking and just accept the registration. Unwillingly overcame, the clerk consented. In the meantime, the registration might be processed as it stood, and confetti marked the instant's end. As Daichi confronted request the transfer of the store, the clerk interrupted in surprise, wondering if things were truly concluded. With a nervous smile, the clerk questioned whether he might witness Daichi's sorcery just once as part of the process. Daichi then consented, and the clerk directed him to the courtyard, expecting to observe a display of non-elemental sorcery firsthand. Daichi then questioned whether his companions could join. With a casual nod, the clerk consented, and the party eagerly headed out together. In the meantime, as they stepped into the courtyard, its sheer size departed Daichi stunned. In the meantime, the vast space seemed further than he expected. Looking surrounding in awe, Daichi started to understand the practicality of the area. It seemed plainly built for sorcery demonstrations. Although one companion had never seen the place herself, she excitedly acknowledged she had only overheard tales until now. The clerk clarified the process forward, first testing gear enchantments, trailed by a light spar to assess Daichi's physical enhancement. Alan, the examiner, advanced ahead, sword in hand, ready for the spar. At this point, the party observed from above. In the meantime, Daichi then questioned if his opponent seemed a swordsman. The clerk clarified Alan employed non-elemental sorcery like Daichi, regardless of appearances. At that moment, Alan greeted Daichi warmly. Although confident, Daichi acknowledged he had no experience with swords and was solely equipped for formality. At that moment, the two exchanged names. Daichi requested a light touch, whereas Alan encouraged him to come at full strength without pausing. At that moment, the clerk praised Alan's achievements, reaching B rank solely with non-elemental sorcery. At this point, whereas impressive to others, Daichi remained unfazed by the revelation. Daichi then was handed a longsword and instructed to slice across several wooden pillars, using solely his gear enchantment. He carried the armament in hand. At this point, the clerk reassured him that success wasn't mandatory. He just required to try his finest. In the meantime, cheered on by his companions, Daichi stood ready. Concentrated and calm, he readied for the first strike. At that moment, Alan and the clerk signaled him to begin. At that moment, Daichi's target seemed clear the wooden pillar to his departed. At this point, channeling physical enhancement, Daichi dashed forward with intensity. His gaze locked in, his physique advanced with sharpened precision. At that moment, Daichi's blade sliced clean across the pillar. Both Alan and the clerk observed closely in shock at his sharp precision. At that moment, the onlookers erupted in cheers. In the meantime, his companions shouted in excitement, thrilled by his unforeseen ability. At this point, without pausing, Daichi launched into the next strike. In the meantime, his form tightened, movements fluid slicing across the second pillar with ease. At that moment, as wood flew, his squad observed with admiration. In the meantime, each swing seemed stronger and faster, drawing wide-eyed amazement. Under those circumstances, finishing his run, Daichi climbed atop a column and dropped into a formidable finishing blow. At this point, the ground rumbled as the pillar shattered beneath him. At that moment, Daichi then glanced satisfied as the final pillar collapsed. His training with Karina and his companions had plainly paid off. At this point, his companions celebrated excitedly. They praised his strength, impressed that even a wooden blade could slice with such force. Daichi lightly faced the clerk, announcing his completion. Under those circumstances, Alan and the clerk stood speechless, processing what they possessed seen. In the meantime, the clerk snapped out of it and demanded an explanation, stunned by the destruction. In the meantime, Daichi then obliterated all the pillars. In the meantime, Daichi then shrugged. He clarified that he was solely following instructions and may have gotten a little carried away. The clerk panicked upon realizing Daichi cut indeed the iron pillar with a wooden blade. Under those circumstances, Daichi then replied lightly, saying he just added a vertical cut for fun. At this point, the clerk yelled in frustration. In the meantime, Daichi then insisted he seemed just following instructions, and his companions backed him up with teasing agreement. In the meantime, the clerk clarified each pillar possessed a designated blade. At that moment, Daichi, holding the wooden one, remained unfazed by the mistake. Under those circumstances, Daichi then pointed out that he nevertheless succeeded. With no real issue to resolve, he questioned whether the sparring match seemed next. At this point, Alan informed Daichi that the examiner retreated to cry, overwhelmed. The party watched closely, half amused, half sympathetic. In the meantime, Daichi then questioned what came next. At that moment, the clerk was able to barely respond, overwhelmed by everything that just happened. In the meantime, Alan abruptly roared out Daichi's rank. His tone seemed loud, final, and departed little chamber for questions. Although astonished, Daichi approved it. At this point, the man reasoned that being underestimated at C rank might work to his advantage. Under those circumstances, the clerk scrambled to formalize it, uneasily declaring they might proceed with registering him as C rank right away. In the meantime, as Daichi neared, the clerk fidgeted. In the meantime, when Nike the cat came close, he collapsed in fear. In the meantime, embarrassed, he acknowledged weakness at the knees. Under those circumstances, Daichi then received his official C rank tag, holding it with a mix of reflection and uncertainty. Under those circumstances, his stomach growled, and he acknowledged the process possessed taken far longer than expected. Under those circumstances, Melissa blushed at the suggestion of provisions. With the period previously past noon, they consented to delay the property handover. Led by his companions, Daichi hurried toward a close-by store. The party chose to eat first prior to resuming anything official. At that moment, the bustling market overflowed with fresh produce, grilled meat, and eager customers. Among them, Daichi inspected the merchandise cautiously, selecting high-quality products. At that moment, later, his companions beamed with delight, savoring their meal. Under those circumstances, the rich flavors delivered wide smiles. Each bite met with silent approval. The party strolled across the crowded stalls, chewing happily. Under those circumstances, vendors summoned out offering fruits, bread, and skewers. Daichi led the way, guiding them towards novel discovers. Palms full. They shared provisions whereas walking. In the meantime, every bite delivered further satisfaction, the lively atmosphere enhancing their enjoyment. As they paused, one maiden proposed visiting one last store. Daichi then nodded, previously anticipating additional tasty discovery. The party neared a corner of the market where an outdoor stall was managed by orphans under the guidance of a local church. Under those circumstances, Fiona pointed it out brightly. In the meantime, spotting a recognizable figure, she dashed forward excitedly, calling out. In the meantime, a nun turned gradually, revealing her name, Marissa. At this point, the conversation shifted to introductions and curiosity. Daichi then questioned about the nun. Learning that Fiona recognized her well, they reached just following lunch had concluded. Under those circumstances, joking remarks stirred playful chatter among the children. At this point, Fiona teased about Marissa possibly having a lover. The nun attempted to keep her composure, whereas the kids laughed around her. In the meantime, regardless of their teasing, she responded steadily, hiding a faint smile. Daichi attempted to greet the children courteously, but teasing and laughter broke out. At that moment, the party joked about Marissa being dumped. Marissa resolutely denied the rumors, stating she neither possessed a lover nor seemed played. At that moment, the woman bowed apologetically for the children's remarks. Fiona swiftly clarified to Daichi that the noisy party were orphans raised at the church. Under those circumstances, the children greeted him with cheerful energy. At this point, introductions trailed. In the meantime, Daichi then seemed identified as a merchant and guest of the guild. Under those circumstances, his companion, Arya, seemed noted as a skilled magician. Eventually, Marissa seemed introduced as a childhood companion and current priestess. In the meantime, Fiona beamed beside her, clinging proudly, whereas Marissa reacted with mild embarrassment. In the meantime, Daichi then introduced himself formally to Fiona and Alicia. At that moment, as he extended his palm, Fiona abruptly yanked away, flustered. Under those circumstances, Marissa hesitated, overwhelmed by the handshake. Following a tense pause, she grasped Daichi's palm tightly, then requested to purchase all remaining merchandise at once. Under those circumstances, the appeal astonished everyone. In the meantime, the close-by children whispered among themselves, amused. At this point, Marissa's palms trembled slightly as Daichi stood puzzled. At that moment, Fiona hurried in, embarrassed, explaining that Marissa seemed extremely shy and prone to overreacting in social situations. Without waiting for clarification, the party dragged Daichi away, leaving his protest behind as they continued their walk. Under those circumstances, Fiona slumped in frustration, blaming herself for hastily pulling Daichi away prior to he was able to properly interact. Marissa silently clarified that Fiona's reaction stemmed from a painful past. She had developed a fear of men after being persistently pursued. In the meantime, Daichi, realizing the circumstances, stood up and respectfully acknowledged the boundaries, promising not to act impulsively. The man proposed they return and clear things up, expressing his regret for frightening Fiona and wanting to sincerely apologize. At this point, Fiona hesitated, then nodded. With encouragement from his companions, she consented to trust him and slowly move forward. Under those circumstances, as Daichi ready to act, the atmosphere shifted at that moment. A child cried close, by drawing everyone's attention. At this point, at the booth, several rough-looking fighters mocked the orphans, questioning their competence. At that moment, Fiona observed, enraged. Realizing the children were in danger, Daichi moved ahead, moving quickly through the onlookers. Under those circumstances, the man questioned the frequency of thugs like them. Fiona verified they possessed been appearing further often in recent months, spreading like pests. Under those circumstances, a huge influx of adventurers possessed poured in from neighboring towns. At that moment, numerous, lacking discipline and status, roamed the streets unchecked, creating a growing problem. Daichi then closely observed the ruffians. At this point, their gear seemed cheap and poorly maintained, confirming their lack of discipline. The man recalled his arrival in city, noting the abrupt rise in questionable adventurers with shoddy equipment. Under those circumstances, Fiona reminded him not to judge by appearance alone. At this point, acknowledging her point, Daichi consented not to jump to conclusions, although he remained cautious. At this point, the man suspected Marissa viewed him as carefree and overly optimistic. In the meantime, turning to his feline companion Nike, He offered a light pat, acknowledging the potential for upcoming conflict. At this point, with Nike resting steadily on his shoulder, Daichi regained focus, confident in the strength of his greatest trusted partner. One of the older children stood protectively in front of the booth, shouting at the ruffians to leave. At this point, his defiance solely provoked them further. Elsewhere, shady fighters casually discussed the city's rising number of missing orphan children, implying a darker trade hidden beneath the surface. At this point, Marissa apologized formally for the children's outburst, requesting forgiveness. Under those circumstances, her calm tone masked growing tension. Under those circumstances, the ruffians grew louder. Under those circumstances, terrified children clung together, crying. Under those circumstances, Marissa attempted to comfort them, urging them not to panic. Just as a thug reached toward Marissa, she dragged a child away in period, her gaze blazing with fierce resolve. In the meantime, Daichi then seized the thug's arm mid-motion, stopping him cold. Under those circumstances, with calm fury, he twisted it upward, restraining him. In the meantime, Marissa gasped as Daichi smiled softly, apologizing for the fear his abrupt action may have caused, yet never loosening his grip. Under those circumstances, overwhelmed, Marissa teared up silently. Behind her, his companions held his ground, Daichi still holding the attacker in place. In the meantime, the thug cried out in pain as Daichi applied further pressure, threatening to snap the arm if required. The man coldly reflected that, whereas this man preyed on children, he now begged like one. In the meantime, Daichi then possessed no sympathy. In the meantime, the ruffians lashed out verbally, accusing Daichi of assault. The party threatened to call the watchman, claiming innocence. Daichi then stared in astonishment, questioning how these aggressors could claim the moral high ground. Fiona advanced ahead with authority, declaring she saw everything. As a merchant guild official, she presented her testimony without pausing. Voices from the onlookers accompanied in. Several witnesses confirmed the ruffians were the ones who initiated the assault against the nun. Under those circumstances, enraged, the lead thug swore revenge. He cautioned everyone to remember his face, promising retribution once the watchman arrived. At this point, the thug pressed closer to Fiona, mocking her connection to the merchant guild and demanding her name with a sneer. Close by, Daichi was warned that revealing his name might cause trouble when the watchman arrived. The man displayed no concern. Without pausing, Daichi broke the thug's arm, the sickening crack silencing the onlookers. As the thug screamed, Daichi observed the shifting crowd and recognized they had ties to the city's guard. The circumstances was further complicated. Daichi moved ahead, voice steady, daring them to believe they'd remain unharmed until the watchman actually showed up. The ruffians, puzzled by Daichi's calm threat, mocked him and questioned his sanity as he advanced with quiet intensity. Marissa advanced ahead and pleaded with Daichi not to escalate further. In the meantime, the woman feared jeopardizing the orphanage. Daichi introduced himself steadily and suggested they wait for the watchman. At that moment, Marissa, nevertheless, tense, consented with visible unease. At that moment, the children urged Daichi to listen to the nun. Fiona additionally encouraged him to pause, reminding him the ruffian's bluff about guard connections might be false. With a gentle smile, Alicia reassured Daichi, telling him to leave the rest to her. Under those circumstances, surrounded by an intrigued crowd, Daichi became the center of attention. In the meantime, the ruffians mocked his silence, mistaking it for fear. Without emotion, Daichi pinched his nose and summoned out the source the ruffians stank. At this point, laughter erupted from the onlookers. Daichi then questioned whether the fighters ever bathed, prompting indeed bystanders to mock them. He mocked their false bravado, accusing them of using the watchman authority to threaten ladies and children at this point. To him, they reeked of cowardice. At this point, the thug shouted angrily. But Daichi interrupted, drawing a blade and declaring the next move seemed his. A gang of enraged fighters storms in, yelling as they threaten the individuals inside. Under those circumstances, panic spreads among the ladies and children as the intruders close in. Daichi then steps forward, silently positioning himself between the assailants and the orphanage. At that moment, his focus sharpens as he readies to act. In the meantime, in a flash, a machine emerges from thin air. The opponents pause, startled by the abrupt arrival of unfamiliar technology. Barrels flame, launching canisters that strike the ruffians directly. Under those circumstances, they're knocked back with force, unable to react. Daichi then stands steadily, peril now neutralized. The onlookers observes in shock as Daichi confronts the remaining thugs. One of the girls summons out his name, whereas others react to the abrupt clash unfolding before them. At this point, Daichi then spins and lands a solid strike on one foe, knocking him back with force. The assault remains swift and clean, catching everyone off guard. Pain spreads across the ruffians as they grab their heads, overwhelmed. At this point, their leader shouts in frustration, realizing things aren't going their way. Daichi holds his ground, facing the party. The assailants hesitate, wounded and confused, as he quietly delivers his warning. At this point, one of the fighters clenches his fist in rage, unable to accept defeat, his frustration boiling over. At this point, Daichi then blocks the thug's incoming punch and counters with a formidable strike of his own. In the meantime, his expression remains concentrated as his fist connects cleanly. At moment, the impact dispatches the attacker flying backward into the street. Under those circumstances, others close, by flinch as their ally collapses beside them, groaning in pain. At this point, further foes rush forward, shouting in anger. At that moment, one of them draws a blade, escalating the hazard with lethal intent. Daichi reacts instantly, landing a devastating punch to additional man's stomach, forcing the armament from his grip as he doubles over. In the meantime, the combat field clears at this point. Bodies lie on the ground, trembling. Daichi grips his ground, showing no hesitation. At moment, one thug loses balance as Daichi swiftly steps forward. Under those circumstances, the ground beneath shifts, catching the man off guard as he stumbles. Daichi then seizes the instant and delivers a formidable upward kick to the man's chest, lifting him off his feet with full force. At this point, the thug lands awkwardly stunned, but nevertheless standing. Under those circumstances, for a brief second, he freezes, trying to regain control. Under those circumstances, without delay, Daichi finishes him with a clean blow. At this point, the man collapses among the other overcame attackers, motionless. In the meantime, onlookers stare in awe. Some whisper in amazement as Daichi steadily turns away, the battle already resolved. At that moment, the townspeople gather, stunned by what they just witnessed. Whispers of awe ripple across the onlookers as they try to make sense of Daichi's strength. In the meantime, Daichi then turns to Alicia, who silently observes him. She provides a small nod, signaling her relief now that the threat has passed. At that moment, with a calm smile, Daichi thanks her. At that moment, Alicia then responds with trust in her gaze, saying she believed in him from the start. Abruptly, the onlooker shifts. At this point, watchmen push across, shouting for space as they move with urgency. Under those circumstances, from above, armored troops flood the street. Their arrival delivers silence as the circumstances escalates once more. The watchmen observe the aftermath, surprised by how one person defeated the party so completely. Under those circumstances, one wounded thug weakly points towards Daichi. Under those circumstances, Daichi then stands nevertheless, his expression calm. Alicia then observes silently from at rear, uncertain of what will happen next. The troops, misunderstanding the circumstances, accuse Daichi of excessive violence. At that moment, their tone sharpens as they prepare to act. Under those circumstances, prior to they advance. The nun steps forward, explaining that Daichi rescued them. At that moment, her tone remains shaky but firm. In the meantime, overwhelmed with emotion, she trembles. Daichi then glances at her softly, sensing her sincerity and relief in. The meantime, the children raise their voices, shouting in Daichi's defense. Their remarks echo across the street, drawing the attention of everyone close. Under those circumstances, others in the onlookers join in, backing the children. They explain that the assailants acted first, and Daichi was solely defending them. Under those circumstances, a guard barks in command, telling everyone to stay out of it. Under those circumstances, the nun flinches as she's harshly scolded, her expression turning anxious. Daichi steps forward steadily and cautions the guard not to threaten ladies or children. At this point, his tone remains firm and unwavering. Among the troops, doubt stands. In the meantime, 2 watchmen in particular remain eyed suspiciously by their peers, their actions now under scrutiny. In the meantime, one guard glares at Daichi, accusing him of siding with the wrong individuals. Daichi then stays composed, unmoved by the provocation at that moment. Alicia then steps between them, insisting there's a misunderstanding. The woman spreads her arms to guard Daichi from the growing tension. At this point, Marissa from the Merchant Guild talks up, stating she witnessed everything. The woman clarifies Daichi's actions were purely in self-defense. The onlooker starts to voice support for Daichi, but one guard yells for silence, trying to regain control of the situation. At that moment, abruptly, a high-ranking officer reaches. He commands the wounded to be treated and summons for a magic healer. The officer urgently questions whether anyone can use liquid magic to stabilize the wounded. In the meantime, a few onlookers hesitate, unsure of their abilities. At moment, the nun steps forward timidly. Although uncertain, she presents to help with minor healing until professional sorcerers arrive. The woman clarifies her limits, but the officer nods in approval. At that moment, her willingness remains enough, and he questions her to proceed. Under those circumstances, introducing himself as Aaron, the officer carries charge. The man nears Daichi directly, signaling a shift in authority. Puzzled by the scene, Aaron requests a full explanation. Finally ready to assess the circumstances for himself, Aaron stares at Daichi, stunned by the aftermath, and questions whether he truly handled everything alone. Under those circumstances, Daichi then remains silent, gaze steady. At that moment, Marissa steps forward and reminds Daichi to show his guild identification. He drags it from his pocket without pausing. In the meantime, Aaron's expression changes as he reads the credentials. His confidence wavers, gaze wide in astonishment at what he's seeing. Under those circumstances, Daichi then stands composed, waiting. At that moment, the officer struggles to understand who he's really dealing with. The young merchant calmly presented a merchant guild permit, stunning the armored man before him under those circumstances. The tension in the air grew as the paper's significance became clear. At this point, reassured recognition trailed. Under those circumstances, the older man lightened up, realizing the youth wasn't a hazard but a merchant. Under those circumstances, a cheerful atmosphere replaced the earlier tension. Under those circumstances, their companion reacted with shock. She scolded the young merchant for producing the wrong guild permit at a critical moment, flustering him. At that moment, trying to explain, he mentioned the Magician Guild's credibility. Under those circumstances, nevertheless unconvinced, she pressed him with skepticism. At that moment, eventually, curiosity led her to examine the issue date. Under those circumstances, her smirk faded into surprise. The youth steadily explained his sudden registration, revealing he had already been certified as a C rank. Under those circumstances, the surrounding crowd reacted with stunned disbelief. Under those circumstances, as murmurs spread among the gathered individuals, the armored man smiled slightly, amused by the unforeseen revelation. He laughed boldly, declaring that deceiving a C-rank magician would indeed be unwise, showing respect toward the young merchant's unexpected status, turning grave. The man cautioned the overcame thugs to be grateful they were still alive, his tone firm and commanding. Under those circumstances, a soldier intervened, clarifying that the armored man possessed not acted out of aggression, but in justified defense. The armored man spoke firmly, distinguishing the young merchant from others. The man acknowledged the circumstances wasn't a mere dispute. He pointed out how the explorers had attempted to overpower others, relying on strength and reputation alone, justifying his counterattack. Assessing both sides, he noted the aggressors plainly possessed the upper palm in numbers and confidence, expecting an easy victory. Under those circumstances, watching from the side, the youth admired the man's fairness. It was uncommon to see someone with integrity among the watchmen. Under those circumstances, later, surrounded by companions, he reflected that their actions may have seemed excessive, but under the circumstances, they seemed justified. In the meantime, the armored man requested the party accompany him to the station for further questioning. At that moment, the youthful merchant consented, showing no resistance. Under those circumstances, concerned. One companion whispered that things might turn poor at the station. In the meantime, her dramatic reaction added tension. Abruptly, she announced that the youth had backing from both a powerful merchant guild president and a noble family. At that moment, his startled expression stated it all. His companions were stunned. The party hadn't recognized such powerful figures supported him. Under those circumstances, the youth advised caution when mentioning such affiliations. The armored man weighed this gravely, asking what the consequences would be if such strength were mishandled. The young merchant deflected attention by gesturing toward the unconscious troublemakers, hinting they might have useful answers. Under those circumstances, the armored man remarked on the youth's boldness. Steadily, the youth replied that as long as one handled things correctly, there'd be no issue. To reinforce his position, the youth disclosed a formal introduction letter, bearing a seal, a reference from a powerful noble. The man questioned that, if they ever met anew, they pass along his apologies for any trouble caused by his actions. The armored man, now smiling awkwardly, pondered just who this mysterious youthful merchant really seemed. At this point, the youth clarified that presenting the document wasn't meant as an excuse, but as a necessary formality. He clarified his busy schedule, which included delivering merchandise and visiting several institutions prior to heading to the station. At that moment, the armored man consented to the terms. He assured the youth that the detained adventurers would be gripped until the investigation ended. The youth created one more request to delay any questioning of the orphanage and church staff until his side was resolved. Under those circumstances, respecting the plea, the armored man nodded. At that moment, their cooperation possessed earned trust, and arrangements commenced swiftly. Although the situation was momentarily resolved, concerns remained about the ruffians' deeper ties to the watchmen and criminal networks. Upon visiting the orphanage, the youth spotted a need to investigate further, sensing unresolved issues beneath the surface. Abruptly, a huge tray of provisions tumbled forward, catching everyone's attention, a feast too large for one person. Under those circumstances, with a bright smile, he gripped up a rice ball and invited the children to help him finish the meal. At that moment, cheers erupted from the kids, thrilled by the unforeseen invitation and excited to dig in alongside their generous guest. At this point, laughter and joy filled the air as the children enjoyed their meal. At that moment, the youthful merchant stood at the center, happily sharing provisions with them. At that moment. Later, he seemed shown a recommended property, a stone-built structure tucked among sturdier buildings in the area. Impressed by its solid construction, he paid attention as his companion clarified the previous owner seemed known for being rather eccentric. Reassured that the structure was reliable, he asked about someone missing from the party, learning they had left for another errand. In the meantime, looking over the detailed floor scheme, he silently evaluated the space. Regardless of several oddities, the residence seemed like a perfect fit. Intrigued about the home's short occupancy, the youth asked what became of the previous owner. At this point, the realtor swiftly retrieved the records. The party disclosed he was a noble's fifth son, now a university researcher and professor in the capital's academic circles. Impressed, the youth noted the solid craftsmanship of the residence, built with top-grade materials by skilled hands. Close by, he observed a well-built structure next door, and his companion verified it seemed just as sturdy. The woman added that the neighbor was a top-ranked sorcery tool craftsman. The youth discovered that surprisingly intriguing. As they strolled between buildings, the youth expressed a strong interest in magical tools, piquing the realtor's curiosity. He reflected on his unique ability to summon modern merchandise, realizing a partnership with a local sorcery tool craftsman could unlock vast potential. The woman reminded him that Arisha additionally aspired to become a sorcery tool artisan, a detail he'd nearly forgotten but planned to revisit. Within the spacious interior, she clarified the store's layout was ideal for both pharmacy and general merchandise, suiting his ambitions well. At this point, eventually, they reached the workshop. At that moment, as he stepped in, he noted how dark it seemed and flicked on a flashlight to explore further. Abruptly, the youth pushed the door open, letting light flood into the dim workshop. Under those circumstances, his companion trailed, startled but intrigued. They discussed potential merchandise for the store, focusing on products with low visibility in the capital. Under those circumstances, lighting tools became the first topic. The man questioned whether the guild could handle renovations. She verified it with assurance, then led him to the storage area. Although the youth remarked the space was narrow, she assured him it was more than enough for store operations. She playfully proposed converting the unused workshop into extra storage, striking a triumphant pose while he watched closely, mildly exasperated. The youth clarified he originally planned to turn the workshop into the main store, adapting the layout to his needs. Surprising his companion, he disclosed that thanks to his item box, there was no need for a huge warehouse at all. The party then proceeded upstairs, ready to inspect the second floor of the structure. Under those circumstances, as they stepped into a spacious chamber, she pointed out various features with professional confidence. At that moment, eventually, she led him to the balcony, proudly showing off the view, and his impressed reaction stated it all. While standing on the balcony, the youth spotted a recognizable girl across the way, both recognizing each other immediately. As they observed each other, an elderly woman appeared beside the girl, also noticing the boy initially. Under those circumstances, the lady identified him as the individual planning to purchase the neighboring property and verified her suspicions. The youth, slightly hesitant, acknowledged the circumstances while the woman inquired about his final decision on the purchase. He verified the transaction and informed them of upcoming renovations, courteously signaling the start of their novel relationship as neighbors. The young woman smiled brightly, accepting the circumstances with joy. The woman welcomed the novel neighbor, ready to begin a shared life. Under those circumstances, a cheerful beast-eared maiden presented several documents pointing out where the forms required to be signed. The youth received the stack, pen in palm, sighing at the volume. Indeed, an additional world, paperwork seemed unavoidable. After confirming his signatures, the youthful woman neatly aligned the papers. The woman verified his eligibility to visit the orphanage and church next, however. She proposed visiting the watchman office first. The woman presented to accompany him, ensuring all steps were handled properly. Though hesitant, the youth approved. The man acknowledged her efforts, but she insisted resolutely he wasn't going alone. The girl attempted to justify her presence during the earlier incident, insisting she played a role in verifying the youth's identity. Abruptly overwhelmed, she became dizzy, suspecting a deeper motive behind only the youth being summoned for questioning. The youth approved her explanation and agreed to let her accompany him again, but added one condition. He desired permission from the guild before heading to the watchman, ensuring the guild tracked their movements for safety. The woman consented but swiftly changed direction, insisting they prioritize visiting the orphanage and church instead. Under those circumstances, rather than rushing to the guard station, they consented the church visit should come first. In the meantime, the youth assured her it wouldn't be a problem. As they exited, an older lady in sunglasses appeared unexpectedly and called out to the youth. At that moment, with a smirk, the lady invited both of them to join her for tea, plainly in no hurry. The youth, puzzled but compliant, followed. The young woman urged him to go along with the sudden detour, claiming it was all part of the strategy. Where he is walking, she whispered that the lady was Cecilia Hartland, arguably the most influential person in city. The older lady walked ahead with assurance, revealing herself to be one of the nation's top alchemists and a skilled magic tool artisan. The youth was stunned. The friendly shopkeeper next door turned out to be someone far more crucial than expected. Grateful for the guidance, he approved her offer and trailed her to a novel destination, trailed by his feline companion. Soon, they reached at a cozy tea chamber where a cheerful maiden named Alicia warmly welcomed him by name. At that moment, the elder observed silently, amused, deciding not to interfere in the affairs of the younger pair. In the meantime, at the tea table, the conversation shifted to housing. Alicia disclosed she had already signed a novel contract earlier that date. While sipping tea, the youth lightly offered a suggestion, and his companion thanked him with a relaxed smile. Moments later, a huge tray of baked sweets was disclosed, freshly readied and inviting. In the meantime, guests seemed encouraged to eat freely, and the cheerful mood at the table grew as everyone reached for the treats. At this point, taking a bite, the youth reflected that his broad interests happened to match the role perfectly, almost by design. The elder clarified that the underground lab seemed designed with potential explosions in mind, making it incredibly sturdy and not something a merchant would usually require. At this point, praising the hidden workshop, she disclosed her admiration and her intent to someday replicate such a formidable facility. The youth, surprised, repeated the words aloud in astonishment, causing a stir among the group. Puzzled, he questioned whether such a place truly existed. The youthful woman beside him strongly denied any knowledge of it. With assurance, the elder confirmed its existence, stating that the youth had unknowingly assisted with potion refinement there. A sudden realization hit the youth, causing him to freeze, while the others watched closely in concern. The man swiftly proposed rechecking the structure plans. Excited, the youthful woman agreed, thinking something might have been overlooked. Under those circumstances together, they examined the layout, debating the purpose of a huge space beneath the kitchen floor. Under those circumstances, the elder pointed directly at a hidden staircase, revealing it led to the secret underground workshop. At this point, suspicion grew possessed the guild failed to inspect the property properly prior to selling it. At this point, their expressions tightened with doubt. The youth slumped over in astonishment, recalling that the original homeowner resided in the royal capital. The youthful woman quickly confirmed that the responsible guild staff should still be in the local branch. At this point, with energy, They both shouted in agreement those two officials should be gripped accountable. Sipping steadily, the elder disclosed she had built the hidden staircase herself and presented to guide them personally. Surprised, the party questioned whether she really constructed it, to which she proudly admitted it was a product of her devotion. Grinning, the girl looked forward to seeing it, while the youth quietly attempted to interrupt the rising excitement. Alicia uneasily questioned whether the previous owner, a noble pharmacist, had used the hidden workshop for suspicious activities. The beast-eared maiden brightly claimed the former owner seemed talented enough to be invited to the capital's top university. Recalling the eccentric nature of most alchemists, the youth imagined shady experiments and concluded the secret staircase created sense. After an instant of reflection, he pondered aloud if inspecting the underground lab had abruptly become the top priority. Without pausing, his companion corrected him, reminding him that visiting the guard post should nevertheless come first. Alicia offered to accompany the party to the guard station, but his companions politely declined, creating an awkward moment. The beast-eared maiden proposed it was period to return to the guild and summon the responsible officials. While sipping tea, the youth verified he'd stay behind. The woman clarified that he'd remain seated, whereas she handled the guild visit. Curious, she questioned whether he could join her afterward, as she wanted him to explain some details before visiting the watchman. Playfully, she presented to help respond questions herself, if he possessed anything pressing in mind. Within the city, cases of missing persons and child abductions possessed reportedly been increasing, particularly targeting orphans. The youth raised the issue, prompting the elder to ask what he planned to do with such troubling intelligence. In the meantime, in response, he mentioned hearing about additional disturbance involving adventurers causing a scene near the market. Rumors proposed several adventurers seemed involved in illegal dealings, hiding children among crowds to smuggle them out unnoticed. He speculated further, if the explorers were tied to the abductions, they might additionally be trafficking the kidnapped children. Rather than seeking justice, the elder pondered aloud if curiosity or personal reasons were driving the youth's concern. At that moment, from the cat's perspective, the motive wasn't admirable, it seemed simply convenient and self-serving. Under those circumstances, smiling, arms raised, he clarified that his goal seemed to make this city easier for both of them to live in. At that moment, unexpectedly, that honest reasoning earned quiet approval. Under those circumstances, pragmatism, not idealism, felt further reliable. In the meantime, with a slight nod, the elder presented full cooperation, admitting that he too seemed acting on personal convenience. Alicia expressed her desire to make the city a superior place, hoping it could become more livable for everyone staying there. Under those circumstances, the elder, seeing an opportunity, encouraged her to take advantage of the current situation. Whereas subtly hinting at a deeper motive, shrugging off hesitation, the youth acknowledged he didn't mind that kind of thinking and asked to be taught more. As plans formed, the youthful woman prepared to leave for the guild, only to be told that a courier could go instead. At that moment prior to leaving, she reminded everyone that what seemed discussed must remain secret and not be shared elsewhere. A firm response departed. No doubt he consented with the elder's conclusion and seemed ready to act. In the meantime, over the past year, incidents involving abductions and missing children possessed sharply increased, especially among orphans. Additional reports disclosed indeed children from regular families, and several adults had also vanished during that same period. At that moment, the timing matched exactly with a rise in drifter adventurers entering the area, raising suspicions. Feet shifted under the table as someone silently questioned whether this was the real issue behind everything, hinting at a deeper agenda. At this point, speculation arose that greatest wandering adventurers might actually be connected to the Tarnate Kingdom. Confirmation trailed without pausing. At that moment, suspicion deepened. Military units from Tarnate seemed likely backing these adventurers from the shadows. When questioned where such intel came from, the elder lightly attributed it to reports from the Night Command. In the meantime, doubt spread fast. Under those circumstances, questions emerged about how Knights possessed access to such sensitive foreign intelligence. At this point, a past incident involving pirates and the Night Order's secret intervention seemed delivered up as justification, tying recent movements to deeper investigations. A cloaked figure met with the aged man, exchanging intelligence for a dose of white powder the man possessed secretly manufactured. In the meantime, it seemed a risky transaction, but one done prior to. Suspicion grew when it seemed disclosed the buyer wasn't ordinary. It was a commander from the Knight's command, suggesting something deeper at play. Although the drug seemed banned, officials of that rank was able to obtain it with little resistance, making their involvement harder to expose. 5 fighters who carried the drug were reduced to empty shells, completely broken after just one evening. Processing the reality, the youth sat stunned, realizing the implications were far greater than he imagined. In the meantime, disappearances possessed increased drastically within a year. Orphans seemed greatest affected, but indeed ordinary citizens were vanishing. Under those circumstances, records displayed a clear rise in such cases. In the meantime, timing of these incidents matched when adventurers from the Tarnate Kingdom commenced arriving. In the meantime, connections between them and the missing individuals grew stronger. Peace in the city seemed a lie. At that moment, everything pointed to a hidden turmoil threatening its core. Under those circumstances, responsibility shifted towards those enabling the Knights. Perilous substances seemed being supplied, and action possessed to be taken. In the meantime, one mystery seemed solved. Under those circumstances, a little sense of relief trailed. A concern lingered as he pondered if the residence he'd bought seemed tied to the string of disappearances. Additional tone accompanied in admitting to similar worries, linking the disappearances to the absence of a shady pharmacist. Under those circumstances, coincidence deep in timing matched when a neighboring residence became vacant, and the incident surged. In the meantime, tension filled the air as doubt crept in, prompting a forced smile to dismiss the ominous speculation. Abruptly, someone peeked through the curtain and disclosed that visitors from the trade guild had just arrived. At that moment, news of the official's arrival startled the party. At this point, shock intensified upon learning he bore full responsibility for previous incidents. At that moment, with newfound resolve, the party turned their attention to justice. At this point, no longer passive, they readied to confront those responsible. In the meantime, within the tavern, a beastkin maiden gathered everyone to begin introductions. The youthful merchant stood silently, observing the individuals summoned for the meeting. Two fighters moved ahead: Richard, a stern guild officer, and Edward, a nervous property manager. In the meantime, both seemed tied to the estate and inquiry. They clarified they reached following seeing Cecilia's name. At this point, suspicion grew as they questioned the contents of the letter she possessed dispatched. In the meantime, the letter mentioned a hidden basement, a pattern of disappearances and involvement from unknown parties linked to the merchant guild. At that moment, it concluded with Cecilia's name, someone deeply connected to past alchemical and magical guild leadership. Under those circumstances, the man pondered the letter's intent, wondering if it carried a deeper warning or perhaps a final message. The older lady dismissed assumptions, stating they required to verify the reality themselves before drawing conclusions. In the meantime, the man proposed there might have been a misunderstanding regarding the property, although his doubt lingered. In the meantime, recalling the construction process, the elder verified the existence of a hidden workshop and secret stairs beneath the residence. She clarified that, at the neighbor's appeal, she built walls embedded with magical tools that couldn't be easily detected. A grim reflected hit if the workshop hadn't been destroyed. Remnants of it might nevertheless exist beneath the structure. Under those circumstances, regardless of the urgency, Edward claimed ignorance. In the meantime, neither the hidden stairs nor the underground chamber emerged in the original blueprints. At this point, casting suspicion, Richard pressed further, suggesting that the construction squad must have known something. In the meantime, although he acknowledged hearing rumors, Edward insisted nothing solid possessed ever surfaced. In the meantime, indeed, the workers possessed remained silent about Cecilia's ties. Convinced they required proof, the party agreed to stop speculating and conduct a proper investigation at the site itself. The party stepped in the house and followed the elder toward the workshop located on the first floor. Under those circumstances, at the end of the hallway, she halted and pointed at a specific spot on the wooden floor. Regardless of the guidance, nothing emerged peculiar, just a plain surface stretching before them. The elder clarified the hidden stairway wouldn't be so effortlessly disclosed. He commenced suspecting Cecilia's involvement again. Without delay, the young merchant knelt and pressed his palm to the floor, channeling magic through it as instructed. In the meantime, abrupt vibration shook the floorboards, startling everyone as the hidden mechanism activated beneath their feet. Under those circumstances, panels slid apart with a deep rumble, revealing a dark staircase stretching downward into the unknown. No one possessed expected such a response. Just a touch of sorcery possessed triggered the concealed passage to emerge. The party stared in awe, some shocked, others thrilled, while the elder confidently moved ahead, urging them to follow. Before descending, the youth summoned out, asking them to wait. Caution was necessary until they knew what awaited below. In the meantime, amused by his caution, the elder teased him, calling him kind for worrying about everyone's safety in a stranger's home. Taking the lead, the youth instructed his companions to follow carefully as he descended the hidden stairs. Under those circumstances, down in the underground space, they commenced exploring the passage lit by flickering lantern light and silent anticipation. Holding up the lamp, he advanced gradually while his companions remained close behind, wary but curious. At first glance, nothing seemed off until an unknown wall caught the elder's attention, something she didn't recognize being there prior. To the party halted in front of an unknown wall, the elder denied structure it, stirring confusion among the party. The woman clarified that her work involved solely magical enhancements, not constructing barriers. At this point, the wall wasn't part of her original design. Outraged, the youth recognized the added magic. Not only masked the wall, but also silenced movement and sent classic concealment tactics. The youthful woman burst out, furious that the elder had accepted such shady work without question, shocked by the implications. At that moment, pressing her palms to the surface, she concentrated. At this point, the elder questioned her to identify the enchantment hidden within the wall. As she examined the wall, the youthful woman noticed something odd. The craftsmanship felt sloppy and unrefined compared to her grandmother's work. The elder verified her suspicion, criticizing the poor execution of the sorcery and lamenting the wasted potential behind the technique. When questioned what she would have done differently, the young woman explained the ideal sequence: defensive layers, odor masking, and reinforcement spells. At that moment, realizing her earlier outburst seemed harsh, she presented a quiet apology, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Looking back, the elder verified the wall hadn't existed during her last visit, strengthening the mystery surrounding its abrupt appearance. Under those circumstances, the elder pointed beyond the wall, recalling that a magically enhanced section should exist just at rear it. Thinking aloud, the youth deduced that the visible structure might solely be a reinforced cover, hiding the original wall a few meters further. Under those circumstances, with growing realization, he envisioned the space layout it possessed to be a secret chamber hidden between walls. His conclusion drew knowing expressions from the party, their sarcastic stares confirming the obvious. Yes, it was plainly a hidden chamber. At this point upon touch, the poorly built wall cracked slightly, drawing criticism for its careless construction and frail craftsmanship. In the meantime, the wall rumbled as bricks shifted away, gradually revealing a shadowed corridor concealed at rear, the false structure. At that moment, everyone leaned in, gaze wide with disbelief, as the hidden space eventually came into view. At that moment, within lay rows of prison, like cells. At that moment, an empty provisions bowl and cold iron bars hinted at past confinement. In the meantime, suspicion deepened. The youth muttered or reflected aloud someone had clearly used this space for twisted experimentation. Staring through the bars, he questioned what his companions thought. The solely response seemed a nervous guess. Maybe under those circumstances, a storage chamber. Following an instant of hesitation, she corrected herself the area wasn't a storage chamber. Under those circumstances, it seemed unmistakably a prison. At this point, panic spread throughout the officials' confronts. The party possessed no explanation for why such a facility existed beneath the property. At this point, peering across the bars, the elder remained silent. At this point, within a rat scurried past a moldy dish evidence of recent use. At that moment, judging by the remains, they estimated the provisions wasn't older than 2 weeks. In the meantime, something possessed been happening here extremely recently. Realizing it was beyond their ability to handle, the party agreed it was time to call the watchman. Following observing the prison, the elder resolved watchmen weren't enough. The circumstances now required the authority of the night command. Under those circumstances, close by, Edward trembled uncontrollably, overwhelmed by fear and confusion as the consequences of the discovery sank in. Without pausing, the elder hit him with her cane and ordered him to notify the knights immediately. At this point, leaning in close, she clarified. It wasn't just a message. The man possessed to bring them back in person. In the meantime, motivated by panic, Edward bolted away at full speed. The party observed, unsure if he'd actually return. The beast-skin maiden lightly guessed the worst, whereas the older man stood frozen, unable to deny the possibility. In the meantime, turning sharply, the elder cautioned him if things went south, he'd bear the full weight of responsibility alone. At that moment, as tempers flared, she scolded her granddaughter for lacking seriousness. Under those circumstances, the youth, meanwhile, noted the elder's dark sense of humor. Realizing the circumstances had spiraled, they consented to leave the investigation to the night order. There seemed nothing further they was able to do here, with tension at rear them. The youth smiled and suggested they return upstairs for tea before diving deeper into the mystery. Within a cozy chamber, the youthful merchant revealed a covered table to his curious companions. Under those circumstances, their gaze trailed his every movement. In the meantime, an elder, impressed by the merchant's preparedness, acknowledged the presence of a complete tea set stored in the magical item box. Under those circumstances, without delay, the merchant unveiled a tray of vibrant modern pastries, each one unknown to this world. Under those circumstances, the guests stared in amazement. Under those circumstances, the party leaned forward, drawn to the soft textures and sweet scent. In the meantime, one pointed at the fluffy white cream with fascination. At this point, a noblewoman observed with interest, noting the rarity of these desserts. At this point, few in the kingdom possessed ever tasted such treats, encouraged by the merchant. Additional guest hesitantly approved the invitation to taste the unknown dessert. The woman unsealed wide, unsure of what to expect. At this point, the first bite dispatched a shock across her senses. Under those circumstances, her expression shifted from surprise to sheer delight, unable to hide the overwhelming flavor. Anather Maiden trailed, already recognizable with the treat, yet still smiling brightly as she confirmed its deliciousness with a satisfied nod. The merchant observed their reactions with a reassured smile, plainly pleased by their enjoyment. Under those circumstances, an elder, flustered, recalled their 5 days of past rivalry, subtly masking his admiration at rear stern remarks. In the meantime, the merchant questioned the elder's teasing, suggesting he seemed being treated like a soft-hearted fool smitten with cute girls. In the meantime, the elder smirked in agreement. Close by, one maiden silently observed, unsure how to react, her fork pausing midair as she paid attention. At that moment, the merchant reflected gravely, realizing the impression he offered off. At that moment, one maiden plainly didn't match the imagined type. The man swiftly denied any favoritism, insisting his behavior wasn't motivated by affection, although his expression betrayed mild frustration. Additional scene played out in his mind selling cakes in a crowded street might solely end in chaos and trouble. At this point, to prove his point, the merchant boldly unveiled a novel batch of colorful sweets. In the meantime, his determination seemed clear he wouldn't hold back anymore. At that moment, as the girls silently resumed eating, he spotted the atmosphere shift. At this point, one remained reserved, whereas the other happily devoured her dessert. At that moment, with a confident smile, he praised Arya's charm without pausing. In the meantime, the unforeseen compliment caught her off guard, gaze wide with surprise. At that moment, her expression turned red as she glanced down, embarrassed. Meanwhile, his companions proceeded enjoying the food, unaware of the tension. At that moment, requests swiftly trailed. In the meantime, one desired the white pastry next. Additional the yellow, the table anew, buzzed with sweet anticipation. The merchant cautioned the elder about consuming too much sugar, but the elder laughed it off. Confident he was able to craft medicine if required. Under those circumstances surrounding the table, the merchant's concern grew, but the elder teased that the merchant cared further for Arya's feelings than his own health. Despite having cried earlier, the youthful woman now seemed carefree. At this point, the merchant sighed, recognizing how effortlessly responsibility shifted once trust seemed formed. In the meantime, Arya steadily drank her tea, reflecting on a missed opportunity. Under those circumstances, the parties present softened her disappointment about losing the property deal. Under those circumstances, the elder approved the outcome with surprising warmth. In the meantime, the instant concluded with laughter, tea. The merchant stared in astonishment, stunned that everyone had forgotten the earlier chaos. Under those circumstances, the empty bowl solely deepened his confusion. Outdoors, a abrupt announcement echoed the nights had reached. Arya paused mid-sip, glancing towards the street as footsteps neared swiftly. At that moment, the elder frowned. Frustrated by the timing, the youthful woman still had cake in her mouth, unwilling to be rushed. At that moment, rising from the table, the merchant and the butler, ready to greet the arriving knights. In the meantime, their expressions turned grave. Together, they advanced ahead, waiting by the entrance as heavy armor drew closer. In the meantime, the atmosphere shifted from lighthearted to tense. At this point, introduced with formality and grace, the man disclosed himself as Henry Bradley, a sub-commander under Commander Hazel. In the meantime, his presence carried weight. At that moment, recognition trailed regardless. Of humble origins, Cecily's talents in blacksmithing and magical equipment earned her a noble title in a single generation. At that moment, warmly greeted, Henry received reassurance from the elder, who expressed relief over Hazel's connection. At that moment, at once, they advanced to proceed together. Heavy boots echoed across stone corridors as the party advanced. Under those circumstances, a low thud forward signaled a hidden mechanism activating beyond the wall. At that moment, in a shadowed alley, cloaked figures stood waiting. In the meantime, close by, a broken crate and glowing lantern hinted at quiet, deliberate preparation. While the knight lightly excused his delay, the party stood unimpressed. At that moment, their blank stares created it clear his excuse wasn't convincing. At this point, raising a point, the merchant reminded them of their current investigation. In the meantime, ignoring an assigned task now might make things worse. At that moment, suggestions trailed swiftly. Writing an explanation under Commander Bradley's name was able to help justify their presence. Supportive cheers verified the concept seemed solid. Under those circumstances, from a distance, Cecily offered her approval. At this point, her tone carried enough weight to settle the matter, drawing admiration from her companions, with relief. The merchant recognized she eventually grasped the importance of priorities. At that moment, nevertheless, Melissa remained lost in her own carefree thoughts. Melissa brushed off concerns, lightly reminding everyone she was nevertheless novel to the assignment. At this point, 2 weeks hadn't been enough to master everything. Under those circumstances, regardless of her excuse, she seemed suspiciously informed, commenting on night affairs, like an outsider pretending to be unaware. The woman abruptly questioned if Asakura had taken a liking to Fiona. At that moment, the bold remark threw him into a panic. Under those circumstances, teasing proceeded. Remarks about youthful fighters falling in love at first sight flew surrounding while Arya stared in silence, expression unreadable. In the meantime, coughing aside, Asakura denied any flirtation. In the meantime, instead, he shifted focus to rising local threats and the alarming disappearance of close by residents. Asakura disclosed the greatest troubling detail. Greatest of the victims were orphans. The party's expressions darkened as the weight of his remarks sank in. He clarified that visiting both the orphanage and church headquarters was simply to gather intelligence, nothing more. In the meantime, the elder smirked, suggesting that Asakura's deeper motives might involve impressing Fiona. Under those circumstances, although partially true, Asakura summoned a convenient justification. At that moment, Arya softly scolded him for acting on his own anew. At this point, regardless of her soft smile, her remarks carried honest frustration. Under those circumstances, Melissa interrupted, suggesting Fiona might not be the right person to ask next, an implication that departed Asakura puzzled. At this point, the elder recalled how disappearances among orphanage children possessed increased dramatically within the past year. Indeed, prior to that, signs had previously begun surfacing. Melissa interjected, asserting that speaking to someone further experienced than Fiona would yield superior replies. Under those circumstances, her tone departed no chamber for argument. At that moment, astonished, Asakura questioned the concept. He had believed Fiona was a lifelong resident, not someone who departed the city years earlier. Under those circumstances, with exaggerated flair, he approved the misdirection and jokingly turned his attention to finding an older sister figure to inquiry. Instead, at that moment, unbeknownst to him, Bradley possessed been listening. In the meantime, with a calm smile, he stepped in, claiming to have overheard the entire exchange. At this point, with the official appeal now written, Asakura felt confident. In the meantime, convincing a guard to accompany him seemed much further likely. At that moment, laughter eased the mood. At this point, Bradley's earlier eavesdropping possessed solely been out of curiosity, not suspicion. At that moment, presented with the offer, Asakura eagerly requested that Bradley join him in questioning the watchman. The knight consented without pausing, smiling softly. Bradley indeed volunteered to accompany him to the orphanage and church the next day as well. taken by surprise. Asakura accepted the offer. At that moment, what seemed meant to be a simple escort possessed turned into something far beyond expectation. In the meantime, teaming up with a charming knight wasn't exactly Asakura's concept of a reward. At this point, his over-top reaction painted the instant with comedic dread. At this point, meanwhile, Bradley presented sincere thanks for their cooperation, keeping the atmosphere light and diplomatic. Following some delay, he came, back with crucial news. Under those circumstances during the search, something previously believed to be missing possessed surfaced unexpectedly. At this point, at rear the storeroom on the first floor, a hidden door seemed discovered. At this point, it connected straight to a concealed underground passage. The two fighters assigned to patrol the area possessed missed the entrance, entirely an oversight that now raised grave concern. At this point, Bradley questioned Cecily about any suspicious behavior from close-by residents. In the meantime, the woman responded vaguely, promising to speak up if anything came to mind. Responsibility for the residents was verified to belong to Asakura, although control would now temporarily shift under Knight's supervision due to the investigation. Intrigued about the time frame, Asakura questioned how long he might be displaced. At this point, with uncertainty below, he couldn't stay comfortably. At this point, concern grew. If sinister activities had taken place underneath, living there anew might feel impossible, indeed with replies. Under those circumstances prior to panic settled in. Additional official promised swift relocation in the meantime. A novel property might be arranged, fully covered by the guild. Asakura questioned whether he could choose the inn himself, but the guild had previously taken care of the arrangements on his behalf. Reassured, he recognized the guild would ensure he stayed in the finest place available. At that moment, the elder verified it might be well suited. Though the official was hesitant, he unwillingly consented to prepare the finest chamber as promised. Under those circumstances, in exchange, the elder requested dinner once lodging seemed secured. At this point, Asakura approved, previously sensing the ulterior motive. Unfortunately, their earlier plans seemed derailed. Alicia, possessed, previously stepped in, blocking their intended arrangements. In the meantime, tears welled in Arya's gaze as she silently responded. Her remarks hit Asakura, who could solely watch her in silence. Under those circumstances, trying to shift focus, he proposed speaking with Cecily about the residence's upgrades. Under those circumstances, the elder misunderstood, hinting at cohabitation. At this point, Asakura clarified, explaining his current lodging possessed strict dining reservations. At that moment, Melissa caught on, astonished by the complexity. A whisper verified the reality. Asakura was staying at Comlef, the most luxurious inn in city. In the meantime, few accommodations ranked higher. At this point, realizing the value of the arrangement, he weighed extending his stay. At this point, Melissa consented, hinting it might be wise to remain. At this point, Edward bolted off at top speed following receiving urgent instructions to secure a private dinner reservation. In the meantime, his superior, visibly agitated, created it clear failure wasn't an option. With assurance, the merchant declared that all expenses for the current luxury stay might be covered by the guild, including previous costs. At that moment, responsibility shifted to Melissa, now appointed as the novel liaison. At this point, the woman stood beside the guest, a forced smile hiding her nerves. In the meantime, startled by the abrupt task, she voiced concern. At this point, nevertheless, her superior reassured her, praising her potential. In the meantime, instead of backing down, she demanded a promotion once the task seemed complete. An agreement seemed hit between the older man and the cat-eared maiden. In the meantime, the woman demanded a formal document to secure her promotion if the task succeeded. The woman yelled for the letter to be written instantly, waving it frantically once it was readied. At this point, up on the terrace, Asakura gazed throughout the city, lost and reflected. The aged man beside him cautioned him about the sly lady and noble. Looking Knight abruptly emerged at rear Asakura, startling him with a sly smile. At this point, talk shifted to corruption among knights. In the meantime, disgust filled Asakura's expression as reality set in. At this point, excited and ready, the cat girl cheers loudly. Her enthusiasm spreads swiftly as the young woman beside her jumps in, eager to join. Instructions are given steadily, urging the party forward. Under those circumstances, one participant gazed the speaker warily, unimpressed by the confident attitude. A fortified structure loomed as the party stepped within for an official meeting. Under those circumstances, plush furniture, a crest-marked table, and guarded expressions set the tone. At this point, silence filled the chamber. At this point, gaze locked as the seated man observed their confronts, fingers steepled in deep suspicion. At this point, curiosity sparked, whereas glancing at the surroundings refined, polished, yet strangely sterile in atmosphere. In the meantime, breaking the quiet, the man clarified this wasn't an interrogation chamber. At this point, according to him, it served as a reception chamber. In the meantime, brows furrowed. In the meantime, doubt surfaced instantly, but feigned innocence met with a stern command to stop pretending. Under those circumstances, a sealed letter floated into memory, as Captain Guise mentioned a previous encounter involving a formal introduction. Daichi then responded with a cheerful expression, clarifying the letter's purpose possessed been nothing further than a formality. Two watchmen stepped in the discussion, reminding everyone they possessed, once attempted to arrest Daichi without proper cause. At that moment, Gaisi narrowed his gaze, explaining those fighters acted on impulse, without considering the consequences of their actions. At this point, shifting blame, Gaise insisted those watchmen weren't his subordinates. According to him, they had solely coincidentally advanced together that date. At this point, stunned by the reasoning for his prior arrest, Daichi questioned the vague accusations thrown at him. Under those circumstances, his companions instantly voiced their protest. Outstretched palms presented a calm explanation, suggesting that stepping forward earlier had assisted guarantee Daichi's personal safety. Mia and Roa stood close, by while Guys acknowledged he had expected gratitude, noting the preparations Daichi had delivered. Under those circumstances, with a smirk, Daichi brushed it off as coincidence, making light of the assumption that he owed anything in return. Under those circumstances, standing gracefully, Mia responded courteously, identifying herself as a student under Heartland and Daichi's follower in training. Daichi delivered the meeting to a close, courteously thanking Eren for the discussion as Guys presented a calm nod in return. As the party faced leave, Guys mumbled an apology under his breath, watching them exit through the tall wooden doors. At that moment, whispers filled the air. In the meantime, doubts lingered about whether the reception chamber possessed been meant for diplomacy or quiet intimidation. At this point, sweat lined Guys' brow as he expressed regret, hoping worst-case scenarios wouldn't come to pass if tension stood anew. In the meantime, abruptly, the door burst open. At that moment, a loud shout filled the chamber as the enraged officer barged in, demanding replies from Eren. At that moment, storming into the chamber, Captain Boyd furiously slammed his foot, questioning why a supposed criminal possessed been treated so lightly. Without pausing, he pointed at Daichi, accusing him of mocking the watchman and promising to make him regret it. Boyd turned sharply towards additional soldier, ready to lash out when his authority seemed indirectly challenged by a calm rebuttal. In the meantime, an abrupt strike launched Boyd backward. Taken by surprise, he crashed violently across the floor, stunned and silenced. At this point, flailing on his back, he shouted threats about bringing Daichi to the Prime Minister. At this point, everyone else sat stunned, unsure how to react. With composure, a soldier clarified that Daichi's party were hardly criminals, citing a report that cleared them of wrongdoing. Tension stood anew as Guys pressed for replies, questioning the inconsistency in documentation, suspecting something had been bypassed. At this point, Boyd reflected briefly, then acknowledged the possibility that the patrol leader may have overstepped boundaries during the incident. In the meantime, additional tone interjected, accusing Boyd of hypocrisy of ignoring the actual criminal and failing to care for the wounded. At that moment, a sharp glare trailed. In the meantime, Boyd questioned if leniency towards a suspect who later reappeared wouldn't look suspicious to others. In the meantime, tension came back when one official questioned how Boyd wished to proceed. At this point, suggestions to detain someone escalated the pressure. Guys stayed composed, stating that permission for this room had been granted by the captain. At that moment, any interrogation was able to happen right there. At that moment, unwillingly, Boyd approved the explanation, unable to contest the authority backing Guys' claim. At moment, watching silently, Daichi commenced piecing things together. In the meantime, patterns and motives gradually surfaced as the chamber's dynamics shifted. Under those circumstances, whispers verified a hidden reality. Boyd wasn't malicious, just incompetent. At that moment, others possessed simply exploited that weakness to their advantage. Boyd's subordinates commenced sweating as they realized the circumstances had grown beyond what they had expected or planned for. On the side, Daichi observed steadily, intrigued by the way the exchange was unfolding prior to him under those circumstances with a pointed gesture. Gaze challenged Boyd to explain the exact rushes that justified the attempted arrest. At that moment, Boyd stumbled. At this point, the chamber's attention shifted to him as others pressed to hear the details that rear his accusation. The man eventually cited a prior report, claiming Daichi employed violence against defenseless adventurers during a dispute on the street. Under those circumstances, Boyd doubled down, citing testimony from Stone and Lever as confirmation that the report's claims seemed valid. At that moment, Guys steadily countered, noting Boyd's lack of judgment and stating that he himself handled the investigation directly. With assurance, Guys produced a novel report his own documenting the incident with clearer, first-hand detail. The man identified Daichi as the victim, with Arya and Melissa listed as eyewitnesses who had corroborated everything in that extremely chamber. At that moment, Boyd's expression froze. At that moment, shock carried over as the word victim echoed in his mind, unraveling his earlier accusations. Guys verified that Daichi seemed the victim, whereas the true aggressors were 5 adventurers now under scrutiny. In the meantime, details from the official report clarified that the incident occurred on the open market street, involving registered guild members. Further testimony disclosed the explorers had harassed both an orphanage, Runstall, and its attendant, escalating to criminal threats. Multiple bystanders additionally filed complaints, adding to the long list of offenses committed by the accused party that date. Ultimately, it was Daichi's defensive actions during his shopping that had halted the situation before it worsened. In the meantime, conflicted, Boyd struggled to accept that Daichi's retaliation possessed overpowered 5 trained adventurers during the incident. At moment, Guys corrected him, stating that it wasn't accidental. At that moment, all 5 possessed initiated the violence, backed by eyewitnesses. Boyd slammed his fist down, insisting the accused seemed B and C rank adventurers, 2 of whom seemed sorcerers. In response, Daichi lightly disclosed his own magical tool, implying he had abilities of his own regardless of appearances. Indeed, after learning Daichi was a sorcerer, Boyd couldn't accept the outcome, frustrated that it still created logical sense. In the meantime, Melissa raised her palm to speak, receiving a calm gesture from Guys, allowing her to continue. Without pausing, she declared that Daichi's sorcery capability likely ranked at a level shocking everyone in the room. When challenged, She mentioned the guild's rank examiner, known as one of the city's most reliable sorcery testers. With assurance, she disclosed that Daichi had completely overpowered that examiner during the test. Daichi verified it himself, explaining that he was registered that extremely date after defeating RN, the respected examiner. Daichi raised his palm softly towards Arya, cautioning her to stay calm as she vividly imagined an escalating brawl. Under those circumstances, silence gripped the chamber. In the meantime, Boyd, overwhelmed, attempted to maintain composure, but sweat betrayed his growing uncertainty. Under those circumstances, Gaze steadily placed a thick stack of testimonies on the table, revealing they possessed ample witness support. Under those circumstances, snapping towards his subordinates, Boyd demanded an explanation, fury now turning to desperation. They lowered their heads in defeat, admitting they hit first and failed to cause harm. Indeed, whereas outnumbering their target. Lever acknowledged they had trusted the wounded adventurer's claim too effortlessly, regardless of more compelling testimonies still remaining. Gaius pointed out they rushed in without confirming the circumstances, siding immediately with the explorers over verifying facts. In the meantime, a second soldier protested, insisting they solely attempted a temporary detainment to prevent Daichi from escaping amid the chaos. Under those circumstances, reviewing the report, Gaius acknowledged their reasoning, but his expression hardened as he readied to challenge their true intent. The man reminded them sharply he possessed been present. Their actions glanced far too biased, concentrated only on aiding their companions. The two troops lowered their heads, unable to respond to Gaius' pressing inquiry about their flawed judgment. At moment pressed further, one acknowledged they possessed been taking a late lunch at the market during the incident. As Daichi recalled, one of the explorers had spoken of selling off orphans, shocking the clothes, by guards. At this point, suspicion mounted. Melissa questioned if the troops might be tied to the city's ongoing abduction cases. At this point, panic surged. At that moment, one guard cried out in denial, visibly trembling as he insisted he recognized nothing about kidnappings. Tension exploded as Boyd abruptly charged and threw a punch, shouting in frustration toward the party. In the meantime, watchmen swiftly restrained him. Guys cautioned the troops to prepare themselves for questioning, noting their actions had consequences. From the side, a composed figure advanced ahead, revealing a chain insignia and requesting to join the interrogation at that moment. Recognition dawned he seemed from the Night Command. Under those circumstances, Gaius nodded, but clarified that the lead might remain with him. Steadily, the Knight announced the command might take custody of the accused tomorrow for further investigation on the kidnappings. At this point, Captain Gaius remained startled by the revelation that all guard reports must be compiled by morning. At this point, frustration builds in the chamber. Reed, a knight from the Royal Command, permits the release of several individuals, while Daichi and Luna remain at rear for questioning. Daichi steadily inquires about the previously detained adventurers, raising suspicion as the watchmen exchange uneasy glances. Under those circumstances, Sergeant Baldur recalls something alarming. At this point, the atmosphere tightens as everyone recognizes what might have happened. Baldur acknowledges the explorers were released. In the meantime, Gaius snaps, ordering immediate warrants. At that moment, chaos erupts as they scramble to regain control. At that moment, the castle bustled with urgency as watchmen shouted throughout the walls. Under those circumstances, a tense atmosphere gripped the stronghold. In the meantime, outdoors the walls, Daichi stretched his arms, plainly exhausted. Rinna and Melissa stood beside him, commenting on the circumstances' resolution and how things was able to have worsened. At that moment, Rinna announced she might return to the guild to file a report, leaving the other two with an intrigued look. Under those circumstances, Daichi then smiled and invited Melissa to a hotel dinner. In the meantime, Rinna silently observed their chemistry with mild exasperation. Daichi then froze in place as Karina abruptly hurried at him, her presence sharp and overwhelming. The man reacted too gradually. At this point, each swing from Karina dispatched shocks across his arms, forcing him back with every clash. At this point, a spinning kick landed squarely on his side, knocking him into the base of a wooden training post. Under those circumstances, Karina then didn't pause. Sitting overcame, Daichi paid attention as Karina lightly pointed out his lack of sword talent, contrasting it with his unique skill set. At this point, frustrated, Daichi slammed the ground. At this point, determined not to be underestimated, he vowed to one day surpass Karina's expectations. Daichi then attempted to teach a move, demonstrating it on a stunned volunteer, whereas Karina observed with suspicion at that moment. Additional teammate tried calming the subject, but Daichi's chaotic method failed to ease tension. Indeed, the cat stared in astonishment. In the meantime, the next day, Daichi challenged Karina to a baseball-style accuracy match, declaring victory conditions with exaggerated confidence. Under those circumstances, shouting their terms, both rushed into the game. Daichi then gloated early, convinced he possessed the upper palm. Karina then steadily hit her target dead. Her win seemed decisive, leaving Daichi stunned and speechless as stats verified her overwhelming ability. Under those circumstances, Daichi then regretted not checking Karina's stats beforehand. At that moment, her precise throw departed him overcame and flustered. Under those circumstances the next day, he challenged her to a novel competition shogi. In the meantime, confident this might play to his strengths, he proudly presented the board. At that moment, explaining complex rules from his homeland, Daichi boasted about mastering strategic board games. Certain victory seemed assured. At that moment, both dressed in traditional attire, they confronted off. Karina glanced annoyed but approved. Unaware Daichi was hiding full confidence at rear smirk. At this point, moments later, Karina declared victory. Daichi then stared blankly at the board, speechless, realizing he had been overcame yet anew. Daichi then sat stunned following his defeat in shogi, vowing to never lose anew. Under those circumstances, Karina then remained composed, previously moving on. The next date, Daichi burst in with a novel concept, this time, a cooking contest. Under those circumstances, fired up, he shouted the challenge with full enthusiasm. At this point, confident in his knowledge of modern recipes, he swore victory across science-backed gourmet techniques. In the meantime, Karina, unimpressed, lightly consented. At this point, Daichi then presented a sparkling seafood dish. At that moment, the judges seemed instantly won over, praising its taste. At this point, his expression lit up with hope under those circumstances. But Karina countered with a packed sandwich bursting with flavor. One bite in, the judges seemed departed speechless once further. Daichi observed in astonishment as the judges devoured Karina's sandwich, overwhelmed by its nostalgic flavor. Karina then seemed declared the winner anew. Daichi protested, calling her dish unfairly sole provisions, whereas she teased him about wasting period. Although others proposed he give up, Daichi declined. Under those circumstances, the man proposed one final contest, his last chance to claim victory. At that moment, the party sat at a table, facing a plate of fluffy pancakes. At this point, the challenge, resist eating the sweets, the longest. At that moment, Daichi then outlasted Karina at last. Under those circumstances, the man cried out in joy, savoring his first win. Under those circumstances, Karina, although overcame, smiled faintly at his determination. At this point, Bradley reaches with a smug smile, interrupting the tense instant. Daichi and his party react with confusion as Bradley greets them like an aged companion. At this point, Bradley lightly announces they remain headed to the church. Daichi glances annoyed, unsure when Bradley chose to join. At that moment, Bradley deflects the reaction, pretending nothing remains unusual. At that moment, regardless of the confusion, he insists on coming along, overriding any protest. At that moment, at the church entrance, Sister Fiona greets them. In the meantime, her calm but questioning tone halts the party's advance. At this point, Bradley introduces himself formally. At this point, Fiona bows courteously, recognizing him as a knight. Bradley presents thanks to Daichi for his cooperation the date prior. To his remarks sound polite, but Daichi silently questions the reality at rear them. Under those circumstances, Fiona proposes postponing the church visit. At that moment, Daichi then hesitates, but Bradley responds swiftly, brushing aside the concept. Under those circumstances, Bradley assuredly claims that his discussion with Daichi doesn't require the church's involvement. At this point, Fiona provides in, deferring to his lead. Two novel companions join the party at this point. With introductions settled, the entire party readies to depart together. In the meantime, whereas walking, Bradley whispers to Daichi, suggesting a private topic about the guard station. At this point, Daichi then seems worried by the subtle shift. At this point, Bradley requests that his status as a knight be maintained secret during the church visit. In the meantime, Daichi then and Fiona remain puzzled but agree. At this point, trying to appear formal, Bradley extends a palm towards Fiona with exaggerated politeness. She is taken by surprise but plays along reluctantly. In the meantime, Bradley abruptly drags Daichi aside. At this point, Daichi, irritated, questions why he's being dragged. At this point, Daichi then confronts Bradley with suspicion, recalling an earlier incident involving two fighters and a captain named Boyd. Bradley acknowledges the connection between those men and the explorers involved, revealing ties that Daichi didn't expect. At that moment, by accepting bribes, corrupt watchmen ignored the behavior of adventurers and presented them unchecked freedom. Under those circumstances, the practice emerged routine and unremarkable. Daichi then questioned whether solely two fighters were involved, prompting Bradley to reveal that over 10 individuals, including a squad leader, were implicated. At that moment, although the arrest count seemed high, Bradley's emotionless expression created the outcome feel strangely hollow to Daichi. Instead of the watchmen, it was the freed adventurers who gripped the real information. In the meantime, Bradley stated he concentrated his efforts on them. Under those circumstances, rather than just agreeing, Daichi proposed that Bradley take pride in exposing such hidden corruption and show it further plainly. Bradley jokingly questions whether Daichi remains pleased by his rise in status. Without pausing, Daichi resolutely denies any joy. The scale of the opposition's influence becomes clearer as Bradley clarifies how difficult it is to buy off so many guards without a powerful backer. Under those circumstances, the man speculates further, suggesting that an external force like the Tarlnot Kingdom's military might be involved. Indeed, if adventurers know further than watchmen, Bradley believes there is a deeper network. Under those circumstances, the man suspects a connection to the trafficking of orphans. Whereas Bradley discusses future cooperation, Daichi bluntly questions when he will get his residence back. At that moment, an innkeeper reminds Daichi that the guild remains covering expenses, easing his burden under those circumstances. Nevertheless, he acknowledges wanting his home and store back soon. Bradley praises the residence's value and location, noting it meets unique conditions and is able to be effortlessly replaced. At that moment, abruptly, Bradley mentions hearing something from Aaron. At this point, Daichi then reacts with suspicion, unsure what seemed discussed. At this point, according to the guard, Aaron assisted them multiple times. Daichi then brushes off the praise but pays attention cautiously. Bradley discloses Aaron is a top-tier sorcerer, even by national standards, and possesses exceptional sorcery abilities. Under those circumstances, Daichi then scratches his head and clarifies that overpowering his opponent seemed a misunderstanding, not an intentional feat. The man clarifies that Aaron witnessed him break iron pillars with ease, and without further testing deemed him fit for a C-rank sorcerer. Bradley leans in, recounting how Aaron possessed never indeed overheard rumors of someone destroying steel with a wooden blade. At moment, although Bradley claims ignorance, he questions if Daichi might be closer to a rank than he acknowledges. In the meantime, Daichi then silently reflects on that possibility. With a calm expression, Daichi recalls his homeland, where he rarely departed the residence and possessed little to compare himself with. Daichi then acknowledges he doesn't know where his abilities truly rank, leaving his companions in quiet reflected. At that moment, Bradley insists Daichi should understand his strength superior. At this point, the man turns to Arya, seeking her agreement on the matter. Taken by surprise, Arya nervously agrees, admitting she also has doubts about her own potential and avoids judging others. At that moment, Bradley teases her about the difficulty of the priestess test, but Daichi swiftly redirects the conversation back to himself. Prior to more as stated, one of the girls excitedly spots their destination in the distance. The church eventually comes into view. The party reaches at the church courtyard. At that moment, Fiona instructs them to greet the priest prior to visiting other orphanages. Daichi then silently comments on the structure's size. At that moment, period passes, and Daichi emerges exhausted. His expression rests in his palm as he mutters about how mentally draining the formalities seem. Where he is eating, the party discusses the state of orphanages. In the meantime, Daichi then expresses surprise at the harsh reality. In the meantime, the comparison between facilities remains delivered up. A narration clarifies that their city remains backed by a formidable economic hub, receiving the second highest orphanage funding in the country. At that moment, regardless of the allocated funds, the children's clothes reveal poverty, standing out indeed when compared to ordinary townspeople. In the meantime, Daichi then reflects on the orphanage conditions. Whereas the provisions emerge as sufficient, the reality seems less comforting. At this point, unlike the energetic children at Daisy Residence, others lack liveliness. At that moment, their disconnect from adults remains instantly apparent. At this point, indeed, the staff mirror the identical lifelessness. Daichi then spots that regardless of their jobs, the employees show little presence or engagement. Bradley clarifies he once suspected the orphanage staff seemed cooperating with watchmen in covering disappearances. But now he doubts that theory. In the meantime, Daichi then silently processes the change in perspective, and others agree such negligence hardly points to organized wrongdoing. At that moment, Daichi then hesitates, sensing it is too early to reach any firm conclusion. Under those circumstances, something nevertheless feels off. At that moment, the man clarifies to Arya that his doubts come from a lack of concrete evidence, not suspicion. The uniform presence of unmotivated staff and timid sisters at both orphanages hits the party as unnatural. Churches remain responsible for assigning personnel, and whereas numbers remain limited, proper distribution should prevent such imbalance. Under those circumstances, Daichi then weighs the possibility that someone deliberately concentrated unfit staff, creating vulnerabilities. Under those circumstances, if so, a collaborator within the church may be involved. At that moment, Marissa questions if the sisters from other orphanages seem truly incompetent or just following commands. At this point, Bradley adds that staff numbers seemed higher than expected, with daily presence noted and peculiar setup for any region. He clarifies that whereas things seem balanced, leadership from Donnelly's side ensured adequate funding and church oversight. Indeed, if execution lacked passion. Daichi then cautions himself not to judge too swiftly, knowing emotions can cloud motive. He reviews the circumstances cautiously while continuing his meal. As he eats, a disturbing pattern emerges. Missing persons remain increasing. Rumors spread, and the unusual basement beneath his novel home lingers in his mind. Daichi acknowledges the circumstances remains unclear. He questions when the documents regarding the explorers will be released. At that moment, in front of a wall of desired posters, Daichi weighs capturing the criminals himself, questioning the legality of such action. At this point, Bradley recommends registering with the guild. Under those circumstances, Daichi then groans, annoyed by yet additional guild-related matter. Under those circumstances, Daichi then and his companions sit together in a cozy tavern, discussing joining the Adventurers Guild and their plans. At this point, a waitress named She reaches, announcing that they have registered with both Merchant and Sorcerer Guilds. Leon inquisitively questions why they might join Adventurer Guilds instead of focusing solely on commerce. Akira assuredly clarifies how joining the guilds provides them a chance to navigate political power. Excitement fills the air as the party heads towards the guild headquarters, feeling the growing possibility of success. Akira and his companions discuss the registration with the Adventurers Guild, their scheme becoming clearer. At this point, inquisitively, Leon ponders if there's any connection to past issues related to the guild. At this point, Daichi then recalls the magical stone and materials sold at the store, realizing the potential problem. In the meantime, in response, Akira assures them that the guild's involvement doesn't cause any real issues. Daichi then glances restless. In the meantime, later, they receive instructions from the guild, with a dragon accepting the task and providing guidance. At this point, as they continue their journey, Daichi and Leon realize the value of magical stones for future guild missions. The party gathers surrounding, discussing how selling magical materials directly to the Adventurers Guild is prohibited due to the guild's regulations. Akira questions the motive behind their desire to avoid taxes, but his companions remain focused on the guild's purpose. Following hearing the strict rules, Leon points out that adhering to guild regulations remains necessary for their preceded success. In the meantime, excited, they reach the Adventurers Guild, impressed by its towering presence and the opportunity it presents. An old man with a beard enthusiastically recalls how the guild master built a grand hall 10 years ago. At this point, Daichi then remains taken aback by the sheer size of the guild and the luxury it represents. Intrigued, he questions about the guild's rules, unaware of the unforeseen situation unfolding inside. At this point, Akira spots a board filled with guild spots, signaling the increasing complexity of their mission. At that moment, Daichi, now enthusiastic, recalls the skills he learned back in the lab, knowing they'll be useful here. In the meantime, entering the Adventurers Guild, Daichi and Akira remain greeted by the guild's eccentric leader, who shares his excitement. A sign remains spotted by Akira, signaling the start of the guild's registration process, with the intrigued twist. At that moment, the friendly receptionist welcomes them warmly, offering assistance with their guild registration, ready to guide them. In an unforeseen instant, the receptionist recognizes she made a mistake, apologizing for the confusion caused. Daichi, amused by the circumstances, ponders if the guild environment will always be this lively, thinking about what comes next. In the meantime, a guild member recognizes Daichi, recalling how he sold magical stones without permission, creating tension. Daichi then steadily defends himself, explaining that they were merely following the guild's rules, regardless of conflict. At that moment, at the guild desk, Daichi verifies his registration, wondering if this procedure shall be simple. At this point, with a cheerful smile, Melissa requests the registration for two, leaving Daichi slightly puzzled by the choice. As Melissa weighs joining, Daichi and his companions discuss whether Melissa should register now or wait. Daichi excitedly welcomes Melissa into their squad, holding Nike, his cat, as they ready for the next step. Melissa remains pleased, asking if Daichi's cat remains a magical creature, unsure of its true nature. The registration form is eventually completed, but Daichi glances puzzled when questioned about personal details. Under those circumstances, upon reviewing their C-rank sorcery abilities, Daichi questions if basic spells truly qualify for such a rank. Melissa clarifies that C-rank sorcery is able to be impressive for someone with special abilities, revealing her own magical prowess. Under those circumstances, Melissa verifies her noble lineage, as Daichi excitedly introduces his cat companion. Daichi then and Melissa remain impressed by the prestigious title of Melissa's noble background, setting the tone. Under those circumstances, following several paperwork, Daichi questions the mistake in his registration, uncertain of the details. Under those circumstances, the receptionist hurries to fix the error, reassuring Daichi about the process for a successful registration. Under those circumstances, Melissa humorously points out that registering as a magician remains uncommon, especially at C rank, implying their growing potential. At that moment, Daichi then and Melissa discuss the E rank, magicians' registration requirements, aiming to improve their magical skills. Akira points out that indeed, if one remains in E rank, joining the guild is a step towards success. Daichi then remains shown a pyramid ranking structure, illustrating how magicians are categorized by ability level in the guild. At this point, wondering if there is a test for magicians, Daichi starts to feel the weight of the challenge forward. At this point, Melissa laughs, mentioning her lack of concern for warrior tests, suggesting a further manageable route. Melissa brightly describes how she fought foes in front lines, whereas trying to perfect her skills. Embarrassed, Melissa acknowledges that Daichi was the one who carried care of the battling duties. In the meantime, as Daichi finishes the registration form, Melissa starts to imagine further battles forward for both of them. Daichi then ponders if the guild will conduct mock battles to test their battling skills like they did for others. Under those circumstances, Melissa dismisses Daichi's concerns, suggesting mock battles shall offer much further than mere practice with opposing teams. Under those circumstances, a guild official impatiently questions where to go next, eager to discuss the registration process. Under those circumstances, the receptionist responds, explaining that they remain heading to the training grounds for a test. Daichi ponders if Melissa can handle the test, as they ready for a combat trial. At that moment, the receptionist hurriedly verifies that Daichi and Melissa remain selected for rank tests and need to act fast. At this point, with a confident smile, Daichi responds to the official, asking for a further flexible approach during the trial. Daichi then laughs, as he assuredly tells Melissa to take things lightly, sensing the challenge forward. The party are astonished to learn Melissa is somewhat anxious about the upcoming combat trial. Unsure of what to expect, the party arrive at the training grounds, where Daichi remains ready for the test. But Melissa hesitates a bit. Under those circumstances in their conversation, Daichi muses that he might be overthinking things, wondering about the guild's real challenges. Just as they prepare, a party of fighters emerges, hinting at the trials to come. Under those circumstances, Daichi then grows intrigued about their intentions. Daichi then stood puzzled as three challengers confronted him. In the meantime, the test seemed meant to be 2-on-1, and he seemed the lone participant. At this point, Nike protested the unfair setup, but Rhodey silenced her with a shout, dismissing any objections. Daichi's opponents taunted him, asking if he possessed any conflict experience, plainly underestimating him from the start. The man replied steadily, recalling solely minor combat during pirate arrests and scuffles with street thugs, nothing resembling real warfare. At this point, one opponent sneered, accusing him of watching from the sidelines. Under those circumstances, Daichi then stayed composed, letting their assumptions reveal their own ignorance. Daichi then steadily questioned why Rhodey grew so enraged over a simple merchant mistake. At that moment, Nike stood silently as he downplayed the issue, calling out the overreaction. In the meantime, Rhodey's anger swelled, but his fighters stepped in, trying to defuse the tension. In the meantime, one proposed using Daichi against monsters instead. Without pausing, Daichi mentioned defeating several king apes and other creatures while practicing magic in the woods. At that moment, the claim stunned those surrounding him. Under those circumstances, laughter erupted from the doubters, dismissing his story as ridiculous. They swiftly advanced to assault, no longer interested in words. At that moment, rather than panic, Daichi plucked a slender branch from a close-by tree and observed it, preparing for what came next. Daichi activated physique enhancement and sorcery reinforcement, splitting the thick tree trunk in one clean strike using solely a branch. While Nike observed in awe, he casually disclosed that he had used a real knife during his actual fights. At this point, shock spread among the observers. By onlookers clarified his background. Daichi was recognized by the Sorcery Guild and had connections to high-ranking members. At this point, the once boastful opponents froze, their confidence drained as tension carried over. With one of them collapsed and the rest wordless, Daichi glanced around and steadily questioned whether the mock battle was still going to proceed. At that moment, with Rhodey unconscious and twitching on the ground, Nike summoned off the mock conflict. At this point, Daichi then seemed now officially recognized as qualified.